This boy had always dreamed of becoming a legendary hero, much like the figures in the epic books he read, yet despite his grand ambitions, he lacked any natural talent or special abilities. That all changed the day a dragon descended upon his village. While others fled, he stood his ground as an ordinary person determined to protect his people. When the dragon unleashed a torrent of fire directly at him, his dormant power unexpectedly awakened. With a single devastating punch, he brought the mighty beast to its knees. Before I spoil too much of the fun, let's start the story. In a faraway mountain, a man named Rick Gladiardle was lying on the ground, wheezing and panting for air. The 4 people who had been teaching him commended his endurance of training for the past 2 years, and were pretty confident he would crush the test ground. Rick couldn't move from exhaustion, and said he still had a long way to go to catch up to them. The day of the examination came, and the city was getting crowded. The receptionist greeted him and asked for his guild registration card. She paused when she realized the man before her was Rick. The receptionist named Arisa greeted him. Rick was surprised to see her and asked if she got transferred to the Central. She nodded and said she was surprised that Rick suddenly quit and started working as an adventurer. Rick sighed and said there was nobody around his age because most of them were teens. He didn't think at the age of 32. He was an F-ranker when most of the teens passed through this rank at 20 years old. Arisa was about to talk, but a man called her asking if she had any plans after this. Rick gazed at him and was surprised to see a middle-aged applicant other than him. It somehow reassured him. Arisa tried to push him off, saying she was busy, but the man got mad, telling her to shut her mouth because women should just be quiet and follow. Rick sighed, breaking the man's grip off of her arm. The man glared, cursing him, but Rick noticed this orangutan reeks of alcohol. He couldn't believe this man drank before taking the test, but he knew what to do after being a clerk for 14 years. He tried to smile and talk to him, but he was greeted with a punch. Rick blinked and noticed this hard-headed man's fist was moving so slowly. He sighed and thought he would have been hit 92 times by now if he hadn't trained for 2 years. He tilted his head to the side to evade it. His fist moved and landed a punch on the man's abdomen. Rick's eyes widened as he didn't intentionally punch him. It was his reflex. The man dropped to the floor, drooling with his saliva. When he fell, Rick was confused because the man was down because of a bit of a push-through. Arisa thanked and commended him. Rick said the man was weak and slow, but she told him that she couldn't even see through it. She took the registration card she had prepared and handed his exam number. His face went gloomy because in Japanese it says "dai dai," as in "shine shine." He looked at the man and thought this man was an F-ranker like him. He sighed and thought their ranks were low due to their age. He turned around and heard someone calling his name. The woman named Lynette asked if he was done registering his name for the examination. Rick stared and found himself flushing at her presence. Lynette noticed his eyes staring at her, so she jokingly told him to stop staring at her melons and hurry to the exam seat because everybody was coming. She noticed his weird reaction, so Rick explained he was only surprised because everybody came to cheer him on, and he was worried because they attract trouble. He looked around as they walked, and the crowd made him sigh. He said that seeing the young ones makes him lose his self-confidence. Lynette asked if he had yet to notice any changes since he began as an adventurer 2 years ago. She added that she worried the other examinees would lose confidence because of him, so she told him to restrain himself. Rick thought that his teachers also said the same thing after training with them for the past 2 years, secluded deep in the mountains, so he hadn't seen how strong an average adventurer was. Lynette noticed he was still confused about the rankings and their strengths, so she enumerated the rankings from the lowest to highest and explained their capabilities. Upon hearing that, he thought that he should be strong enough for E rank. Lynette looked at him and told him to be confident because he was a member of the strongest party on the continent, Orichalcum Fist. Rick smiled, so he told himself to at least become an E rank in this examination. Back in the reception area, Arisa called a guard to drag the drunk man away. The guard asked what had happened, and she said an acquaintance of hers had saved her from this man's harassment earlier. He looked at the man's armor and gasped in shock after noticing the fist caved in. The guard said this man was a former A-ranker, Knight Tyranny Damarudo, and had been wanted for battery. Arisa was shocked upon realizing this man was an A-ranker. She told the guard his acquaintance had only started training 2 years ago and was an ordinary middle-aged clerk. The guard couldn't believe a middle-aged clerk would be able to beat an A-rank. After a few minutes, Rick was done with his physical examination, so his next test was an attack power measurement. He took the paper as his guide and saw the place where his second test would be held. When he got there, he went inside, and everyone was ordered to fall in a straight line because they were not gay. The woman in the front showed them the slime bag that would absorb their attacks. She instructed them to use any magic or physical attack on it, and they would be graded through it. Rick sighed because he had been training with this in the mountains. He remembered his teacher telling him that if he could destroy the slime bag with his fist, his body had already developed into one that he could trust. Rick said it could only break with someone with a power that could crush a dragon's teeth. His teacher gave a powerful blow to the slime bag that startled him. He told Rick to hit it 50,000 times a day to destroy it. He continued to train with the guidance of his teachers, making him think it was pure torture. In the examination, he looked at the slime bag and noticed it was green, which was the weakest bag. The first examinee, Frito Diramuto, was called, and a boastful grin flashed on his face. He flipped his hair because he had been waiting to display his power. The other examinees were surprised to see the 11-year-old second son of Diramuto, who was known to possess magic equal to a C rank. rank. Rick couldn't help but feel jealous again of the youth's skills, but this would be perfect to see his power and use it as a reference for him. Frito lifted his hand and started igniting his palm with burning flames. Rick was surprised that at his age, he could do a third-order binding. Seeing those flames brings him back to his magic training. He suddenly realized that it would be dangerous if they stayed there, because when that magic exploded in the mountains, it destroyed the area. He could defend against light magic attacks with his power, but if this boy used them in a sealed room, he thought they might turn into ashes. When the boy cast the flame, a fart of flame emerged and poofed on the slime bag. Rick's jaw dropped, and he thought it was 100 times smaller than he expected. My fart would have been stronger than that attack. When the fire collided with the bag, it swayed a little, making the other examinees gasp in amazement. Frito smirked and said he had made a mistake that was out of his control. Everyone dropped their jaws, but Rick was in disbelief, as it was too shabby for a prodigy. The professor commended Frito, and even called him a genius. After the other examinees, the professor called Rick to come up in front. The 4 examinees didn't even move the bag, making him wonder if his training was made to go on strange. Rick Gladiardel's name was called when he walked to the front. He thought of holding back, but when he heard everyone discriminating against him because of his age and rank, he frowned his eyebrows when the man asked if he really did start as an adventurer at 30. He said yes, but the man said his magic requirements were awful because the magical limit was only at the age of 20. He advised him to look for another job if he failed the exam. When he saw those eyes staring at him, Rick knew that these people were underestimating him for having a late start. He remembered the days when he had pushed his physical limits just to meet everyone's expectations. Despite starting late, he knew he wanted this. He stood before the bag and clenched his fist. He told himself that he shouldn't let anyone look down on him just because of his age. As he threw his fist, he wondered if he would fail if he held back. So he smashed the bag and its chain tore and broke through the wall. Everyone was dumbfounded and bathing with slime. Rick couldn't believe the bag had broken because he was used to using one that could absorb powerful attacks. He suddenly realized that he had been taught a lot in the past 2 years, and the only thing he wasn't taught was how to hold back. Let me guess, his training involved 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats, and a 10-kilometer run every day. After the physical and written examination, Rick was so glad he had a perfect score. Lynette commended him. Little did he know, Frito was glaring at his back, cursing the old man for getting on his way twice. He suddenly thought of getting revenge on the next exam because he specialized in defense. At the field, an explosion occurred after the collision. Frito was surprised after he witnessed how Rick blocked a 4th-order magic. The wizard was looking exhausted already, but he commended Rick. He told him to use a higher-level defense since he was about to raise the level to the 5th order, but Rick told him not to worry and that he could only use one defense. The wizard was shocked and said it would be dangerous if he continued these because the 1st order normally wouldn't block a 5th order. Rick told him not to worry and fire the spell without restraint, so the wizard nodded. He summoned his magic power to a whirling orb while chanting the magic words. Once it was big enough, he threw the shock cyclone in his direction. Everyone was so anxious because Rick wasn't moving an inch, but the moment the smoke subsided, Frito was crying in disbelief. The wizard who threw the cyclone was on the floor, drained, and they were confused about Rick's state. A man named Sylvester, a first-rank knight from the kingdom's chivalric order, came near the field and asked why the examination was taking so long, shocking the woman. When he looked around, he saw the situation. He realized that an F-ranker had destroyed the green slime bag, wall, and barrier with one punch. He even defended against a high-class wizard's 5th order with a 1st-order spell. He sighed and asked if it was a joke, but the woman said no, and that it was true. She added that the slime bag wasn't made of the lowest grade slimes because it was made from mid-grades, and that Rick used his spells with no chanting. Sylvester's eyes widened in shock, saying it was impossible because even he, a first-rank knight, couldn't do that. It was like Saitama came to their story. Maybe this is him before getting bald. He asked for the examinee's info, and when he saw the examinee was a 32-year-old F-ranker, he wondered what kind of life he had led. The moment he saw that Rick had worked as a clerk for 14 years, he rubbed his eyes. He asked if it was a title for somebody who subjugated a dragon. Outside the walls, Rick met with Lynette, and he couldn't believe he didn't have to hold back on the first exam. She explained that they only told him to hold back when he would go against another person. Rick sat on a chair and said he was worried over nothing. They suddenly heard a voice calling him a commoner, and Rick saw the prodigy sewn in the exam when he looked. Frito frowned his brows and nervously exclaimed his name, which was Frito Diramuto. Rick sighed and said he felt bad whenever he saw lost kids, so he told Lynette he would go look for Frodo's parents. Frito sobbed and said he was doing well in the exam when he got in his way. Rick gasped after seeing he was crying. He told him he didn't use any dirty trick and tried to explain, but a woman called him out for making her little brother cry. Rick looked at her and asked if she was Frito's sister. The woman said yes, and said she was Angelica, the firstborn daughter. Frito ran to his sister and started crying. He told her that this 40-year-old orangutan bullied him. Rick gasped and exclaimed he was still around his 30s. Angelica couldn't believe a 40-year-old could bully a kid. Rick scoffed and told her he was still around 30, but she ignored him. She called him an evil 40-year-old and pulled out her gloves. She threw her gloves at him and challenged him to a duel. He sighed because she kept calling him 40s, so he picked it up, saying doing laundry for a pure white was awful, and that she wouldn't understand since she's a noble. Lynette reminded him that if he picked that glove, that would mean he was agreeing to the duel, but it was all too late for him to realize it. Angelica chuckled and said both parties enemies may have one condition, and the condition was that the loser had to serve as the other's servant until they perished. She was pretty confident because she was a second-class knight in the kingdom's chivalric order. The two went to a battle arena. Frito kept cheering on his sister, so Angelica's pride was so fed up. Rick sighed and thought this turned into some trouble when he only wanted to take the exam. The kingdom's chivalric order was in charge of preserving the peace in the Philhane kingdom, and Angelica's class had a higher ranking. There was also a legendary knight, which only 13 people had achieved. It was known as the particular class. Lynette told him a second-class knight should be around a B-ranker adventurer, so he shouldn't worry. She reminded him to hold back, making Rick say that Angelica was in a way higher position than a newbie like him. He became worried about whether he would survive so he could return home safely. Lynette told him just to remember his training for the past 2 years, and chuckled awkwardly as the only thing that came to his mind was the terror and torture he went through. Lynette asked how he felt, and he replied that his spirit was crumbling. She told him he should feel less stressed by now, making him realize that everyone he met was surprised by his strength, so he walked to the front bravely. Angelica smirked and asked if he was done talking to his coach. Rick knew nothing about the limits of what he could do, so he decided to put his power all in. Angelica scoffed as she noticed his expression had changed. She mocked him, saying she would hold back since he was an F-ranker. She stepped her left foot back and ignited her thunderous power. She specialized in strengthening magic by reinforcing her body and her weapon. She wondered if he could keep up with her speed. When she dashed forward with her blink step, Rick was shocked by her speed, and the last thing they knew, Angelica was already behind him. Angelica looked at him and gave him a smirk. "I'm not adding her to my waifu list in this manga, and there are already 2 people, the elf and the clerk." Frito laughed after seeing her sister's unstoppable attack. He called the 40-year-old peasant and bragged about her, the flash of light sister, Angelica. She scoffed after noticing the middle-aged man was speechless, and told him she would not be missing on purpose now. She rushed at him with a blink step, and I could feel a great disturbance in the internet as if thousands of zippers were suddenly open. Rick was surprised again. He watched Angelica and wondered why she was moving too slowly, yet she was known for being the flash of light. It was way slower than his normal running pace. Lynette called him, but he suddenly thought he had to dodge. He moved to the side, and Angelica was dumbfounded because her attack was dodged. She wondered how he saw through her moves. She glided on the floor and thought a few first-class knights could only react directly to her speed. She glared and said it was luck that saved him, so she attacked again with her sword. But out of nowhere, a pebble ruined her momentum. Rick figured she might have used her noble connection to get to her current class. When he looked in front, he was shocked to see her swirling like a disc. She was screaming as she rotated to launch a disordered series of slashing attacks. His teachers might have taught him many, but this was his first time seeing a crazy tornado woman with a sword. He had a little hard time dodging it, making him think there would always be someone stronger than him, so he shouldn't let his guard down. Angelica's attack left a straight cut on the floor. She turned and was relieved that this old man didn't notice her tripping over a rock. She scoffed and said the last time someone could see through his moves was of a special class knight, so she decided to move faster. She lowered his body, knelt on the ground, and launched herself again with a blink step run. She was 3 times faster than before, but Rick wondered if this was her serious full speed. He swept away the thought and told himself not to let his guard down. Rick thought that if he struck carelessly, she would let loose a lethal counter, so he decided to observe. He moved to the side to evade her attack, but Angelica gasped in shock. She couldn't believe this man could dodge her full speed. She could only use her full speed 2 more times, so she thought of something else to win. She thought striking at him at her top speed multiple times in succession would be effective, so she charged again with her blink step in. But as expected, Rick dodged it. She stopped her momentum and grunted in anger. She screamed to activate her willpower. She was so annoyed at this point, but Rick thought of her attack as a fake blink step, so he prepared himself for a perfect time to attack. However, Angelica tripped again over a rock. "This dumb witch," she screamed, getting Rick caught off guard because he had suddenly lost sight of her. He looked at the floor and was surprised to see her approaching her. Rick couldn't believe this woman had read his attack, but didn't realize Angelica had fallen over a rock. Rick was getting anxious because he prepared to attack in front, so he had no choice but to redirect his attack, overthinking at its finest. He smashed his fist on the ground to throw Angelica away from him. The impact was so powerful that it almost created a hole. Angelica was stunned by what had happened. She was trembling in fear as she asked who he was. Rick said he was someone who turned over a new leaf 2 years ago, and a clerk turned into an F-ranker adventurer. Angelica looked like a poop was about to come out of her butt. Rick added that he was told to hold back, but he smiled and took this chance to practice against a skilled opponent so he could go all out. Angelica grinned like a monkey and lifted her hands to surrender herself. He was getting excited, but when he realized Angelica had surrendered, he froze. Angelica, still trembling, admitted her defeat with tears in her eyes. Like brother, like sister, she ran away, calling her little brother Frito. Rick suddenly remembered something, so he asked about their pact, in which she said that whoever loses becomes a slave of the other. Rick hadn't said his condition, so he asked if she should stick with her condition. She screamed, saying she would overcome her limits, and dashed forward with another blink step in. Rick sighed and said it was her fastest speed today. He thought that maybe she felt like pooping. That's why she ran away. The two went to a waiting room. Rick took a deep breath, wondering if he had made it through the exams, so Lynette told him that if he didn't pass, he should increase his training by 3 times the amount. Rick grunted and said he would perish by that time. A man's voice voice suddenly spoke, calling Lynette a beautiful dark elf. A man walked to her, saying he wanted to ask something. Lynette was about to reject him, but the man cut her off and introduced himself as Lastar Dirumuto, hailing from a family that governs the noble people in the north. Rick didn't follow and thought of calling him Hale. He moved closer to her and asked for her name. She told him her full name, Lynette Elfelt, and he groaned, saying her name was also beautiful. He said he dropped something and asked if she was interested to know what it was, but Lynette coldly said no. Lastar smiled and asked if she said yes, ignoring what she actually said, and grabbed her hand. He said he dropped his feelings of love in the depths of her eyes and winked at her. Lastar asked her to come to the northern part of the country with him as his second wife. Lynette frowned her eyebrows. Rick felt she was getting uncomfortable, so he butted in and said this beautiful elf was his girlfriend. He knew Lynette hated this lie, but this was the only way he could think of. Lastar looked at him from head to toe, calling him a boring, typical middle-aged guy. He noticed the ticket Rick was holding and asked if he was an examinee for the promotion exam. Rick said yes. Lastar suddenly burst laughing, mocking him for being an F-ranker at this age. Rick said it was much slower since he arrived in his mid-20s. Lastar chuckled and said he was an A-ranker and had become an E-ranker when he was 14. He grinned and said he was the examiner for the second exam's mock battles. He looked at Lynette and invited her to lunch. Rick looked at her, and to his shock, Lynette grabbed his arm and said she was dating him so that she couldn't accept his invitation. She added that his perfume was too strong and it hurt her nose. Rick added that he thought something stank somewhere and didn't know it was him. Lastar gritted his teeth and said someone like him shouldn't be with a beauty like her. He pointed at him and told him to prepare himself if he would get in charge of their group in the exam. As soon as he left, Rick sighed and slammed his face on his palm as the situation became troublesome again. When Lynette noticed the banner being posted on the board, they scanned the numbers and saw Rick's number. He was so happy to see his number, so she congratulated him. He noticed his hands on her shoulder, so he pulled it and apologized. He also apologized for the lie earlier, but Lynette smiled and said it was okay, and she was happy about it. She turned to make her way to their guild to report it, leaving him flustered and red. Lastar was so angry in the cafeteria, he kicked the chair near him, cursing the ugly middle-aged man. He was gritting his teeth in anger, saying he would beat him to a pulp if he found him again. His thoughts drifted when he heard two familiar crying voices. Angelica and Frito grabbed his legs, sobbing like some random kid stole their lollipops. Frito said a 40-year-old guy used dirty tricks while he was showing off his skills in the exam. Angelica said the man also tried to take advantage of her in a duel. He asked for the man's description, and Angelica said it was a 40-year-old who worked at the town hall and a low-ranking adventurer. Suddenly, he thought of that orangutan and asked Frito what that man's exam number was. The sibling trio kind of reminds me of Team Rocket. When the two were on their way to the next examination, Rick wondered if he could hold back against a human opponent and win. He groaned, exhausted from overthinking. Lynette tried to calm him, but a voice spoke from behind. A man wearing a tuxedo asked if he was Rick Gladiartle. Rick kept his guard up and asked if they met before. The man apologized and introduced himself as Lynx Loloto, the examiner in charge of his second exam. Rick punched out the sky from happiness and thanked God for not sending hail to him. Lynx said he saw his profile and noticed he worked as a clerk for 14 years. Rick sighed and thought this was the moment where he would ridicule him for starting late, but to his shock, Lynx commended his incredible determination. He said he was encouraged by a person like him as a fellow middle-aged person. He added that he became an adventurer when he was 24 and asked if he had something like a dream to achieve for him to become an adventurer at this age. Rick was surprised and said he did have a dream. He asked how he knew about it, and Lynx chuckled, saying he also had a dream at this age and had to become an A ranker to achieve it. He said he had been working on it for 20 years but was only at B rank. However, he was not giving up. Rick smiled because this person might be the same as him, a passionate one regardless of age. He nodded and held his hand out. They shook their hand, looking forward to the mock battle later. When Lynx was walking, Lastar saw him and noticed he had a battle-worn martial artist's hands. He called him with a devilish grin and said they should talk. Rick and Linus went to the official post and saw Lynx. Loloto was their examiner. He was relieved because the Hail Noble wouldn't ruin his exam. He looked at his ticket and it suddenly vibrated. A voice from the ticket said Lynx's physical condition came to a sudden turn and they would be unable to take charge of the exam. Rick's sweat was dripping in nervousness, and when he drank his water, he heard that Lastar Diramuto would be their examinee. It was like the heavens landed on his face. The other examinees in his group were disappointed, saying passing the exam would be impossible. Rick heard them and asked them if Lastar was that famous. The woman said Lastar was a genius with 1,000 skills, known as the most powerful mage and the F-rank crusher. She added that Lastar enjoys tormenting the one who catches his eye, so she advised him not to get under Lastar's nose. Rick almost dropped to his knees because that monkey would surely torture him. When the exam started, the first one was brought out on a stretcher, bleeding. He was cursing Lastar for going all out at an E-rank exam. Rick screamed in frustration as he pulled his hair. Inside the examination, Lastar casually chanted the word to throw a blizzard rock shot at another examinee. When the examinee was crushed and lost consciousness, he sighed and said the examinees were all useless. The people watching were pitying all the examinees because Lastar purposely did not let anybody pass the exam. Lastar smirked and said that the 424-2 guy should wait until he tasted his wrath. He suddenly heard an elite guard calling him. He asked what he wanted, and the man told him to leave the disposal of villain number 424-2 to them. Lastar Blastar told him not to get in his way, but the man said losing to him, the strongest A ranker, would be very humiliating. Blastar thought for a second and told him to make that man disqualified for the exam. He chuckled and said timeliness is important in the exam, and it would be good to see him struggling to make it in time. At the waiting area, Rick was pacing back and forth, thinking what to do. Lynette sighed and asked why he was so flustered. Rick gasped in surprise and said the examiner held a grudge against him and was the strongest A ranker. Lynette told him to be confident with his strength, but Rick was screaming like he was about to get madly insane. A high-pitched voice called Rick's attention, asking if he was an examinee. Rick thought it was an odd place to find a fortune teller, but the man asked him if he would allow him to help him calm down with his magic. He said Rick may be suspicious of him and would do it for free this time. Rick pulled the chair as soon as he heard it was free, but Lynette's eyes widened as he noticed the markings before he was about to sit. In the blink of an eye, Rick was gone before she could stop him. It was a teleportation magic carved on the chair. The man chuckled as Rick fell to his trick. It was Frito. He laughed and mockingly said the best actor goes to him, but his smile disappeared when a slashing sound pierced through the crystal. The wall and window behind him were crushed to pieces in an instant. Lynette grabbed his collar and lifted him in the air. She gave him a chilling glare as she asked where he teleported Rick. Frito was sweating cold, but he tried to act strong. He froze when he felt his lashes falling. Lynette squinted his eyes and said the next target would be his eyes. Tears and snot started accumulating. So out of fear, Frito said he sent Rick within 100 meters, as it was his limit. Meanwhile, Rick was roaming his eyes around, confused about how he got to the square in front of the arena. He wondered why the fortune teller sent him there. He stood up and heard a loud stomping foot in his direction. When Rick turned, he saw a huge man asking if he was the one who beat Angelica. Rick started sweating in nervousness as he saw multiple men wearing black walking toward him. They surrounded him, looking like Yakuzas. The man walked to him and said they were the elite guard of the Diramuto, and they would be burying him alive. He suddenly realized that the fortune teller was that prodigy kid. Rick asked if they were getting on his way to prevent him from taking the exam within 30 minutes. The guard said he beat Angelica, but Rick explained she didn't lose and only ran away because he wanted to poop. He tried to explain more, but the elite guard ignored him and drew a weapon. The weapon infused with courtesy reinforcement and from an A rank it. Rick scoffed, but inside his head he was screaming he was doomed. He grabbed his mouth and thought this would be a tough match against them, and he might not make it in time for the exam with this. The elite guard was about to attack, but noticed 3 people walking towards them. They noticed Rick and asked why he was there and where Lynette was. The guard was left silent upon seeing the 3. When Rick looked behind, he started trembling at the sight of his teachers. The 3 glanced at the situation. The tallest and baldest one called Rick, making his guts tremble in fear. Rick was asked what he was doing outside the examination area and said he only came there to breathe some air. The man asked who these men were, but the other bald one beside Rick cursed him, telling them they were busy. He was surprised when Rick grabbed his shoulder and told his teachers they were his friends who were trying to demonstrate some skills. His teacher tilted his head a little and asked if they needed help. The bald man cursed Rick's teacher, so Rick started panicking, telling him to stop if he wanted to live. He called the butler-looking guard, begging them to withdraw, but the elite guard said if these people interfered, they would be disposed of. The bald man lifted his huge sword at the teacher, but he chuckled and remained calm. The moment the thick blade touched his skin, it cracked and shattered to pieces. He was shocked by what he witnessed, but the teacher said his negligence in strengthening his weapon cannot be commended. The bald man still couldn't believe this man had broken his sword without doing anything. The Eggman clenched his fist and charged towards him, but his fist was caught so easily. He couldn't even move his fist an inch. He tried to push more, but the man said the strength in his arms wasn't so bad. He gripped the Egg's fist tighter, making him scream in pain. Rick dropped his jaw from what he had witnessed. The Egg's fingers were broken and went numb. The teacher told him not to worry because it would heal right away. He pointed his hand at his broken fingers, and it instantly healed by the glowing light. He was shocked, but the teacher told him he might be strong, but he should devote himself to becoming conscious of his body and thinking of it as a singular thing to become stronger. The guards were watching the teacher and couldn't believe an orc could speak and use magic. This is a rare existence of a monster that possesses the qualification of an adventurer, a priest who possesses both superhuman strength and intelligence. This wise orc was Blowstone Ash Orc. He added that their guild was solely made of S-rank adventurers, the strongest party on the continent, the Orichalcum Fist. The guard thought that the guild was just a legend, and couldn't believe they actually existed. Blowstone asked who would be coming next, and the group of guards gathered together ready to attack him, but Rick tried to warn them again and told them to falter. The one with pointy ears called him and said he knew these people weren't his friends, and that he got into trouble. He also knew he did that because he would feel sorry for these men if they fought against Blowstone. He said he was not like those two, and wanted a peaceful resolution. He then pulled out a mother effin' gun from his magic bag that could shoot 30 small lead balls. He blew the bullets at the guards while he screamed like he was just playing. Rick grunted as he could feel the pain from those bullets. In the world of swords and magic, this mother's father pulled an M4A1 and resolved the problem using the American way. Rick stopped him, so he asked if he also wanted to try his new invention. He asked him if everyone was alive. The guard dropped his jaw in shock and asked who that kid was. The old man said he was no child and that he was a mix of dwarf and elf. He had that appearance for over 50 years and was the strongest weapon craftsman named Mizet Eldwarf. They turned around when they heard someone telling them not to move. A man held the girl with a knife pointing at her neck. Rick tried to tell him to stop acting like a fool. Glowstone nodded and told him not to say anything bad, and let go of the girl. The man laughed devilishly as he thought they were trying to protect the girl, so he told the others to beat them up. The girl called Rick tilted her head as she asked what this man was doing. Rick panicked and said the man was only playing with her, so the girl smiled and asked what he wanted to play, but the man cursed her and pressed her shoulder. She screamed in pain and called them a bunch of bullies. She screamed in high pitch, and simultaneously, a burst of magic power emerged from her, throwing those monkeys in the air. The guard was sweating cold after witnessing a kid blasting a 7th order without any chanting. The old man said this 10-year-old kid was a pure vampire, the strongest attack mage named Alicet Dracul. The old man dropped his weapon, saying that now that he had seen the legendary party, he would retire and live a peaceful life. The butler turning over a new leaf really got me. Anyways, upon hearing their withdrawal, Rick smiled and thought he could now return to the examination. Going back to Lynette, she was still holding Frito, making him feel like he had been up there for 2 months now. Lynette told him she would only put him down when Rick arrived. Frito told her to better hold him no matter what, because there were 20 elite guards waiting for him there. His words were cut off when they heard Rick. Frito's eyeball literally popped out after seeing Rick unscathed. Frito asked what he did, but Rick apologized for calling a relief squad. Frito was confused and thought it would be impossible for him to survive their guards, but before he could finish his words, Lynette threw him on the ceiling to shut him up. Rick looked around and noticed the mess she made. She might look modest, very demure, and very mindful. Rick shouldn't make her angry. They returned to the waiting area. Rick was sitting on the bench, waiting for his name to be called. He took a deep sigh because he would be facing Hale. They heard some marching and saw the medical team bringing an injured examinee. Rick sighed, saying Hale was acting crazy, but Lynette noticed he was calmer than earlier. Rick smirked and said he strengthened his resolve and that it was no big deal, but Lynette looked below and noticed his restless knees rocking back and forth. There was a moment of pause and Rick finally burst. He said he couldn't help but feel nervous from going up against the strongest A-ranker. Lynette continued to try to calm him, even if it was repetitive. She sat before him and looked straight into his eyes. She told him to have some faith in himself. Rick was isolated in the mountains for 2 years, and he didn't know anything about the strengths of an A-ranker, so he thought he couldn't have the self-confidence he was looking for. Lynette said another's words could make his confidence surge north. She added that she believed in his strength and that he would win against that man. From the day he decided to become an adventurer, Lynette had always been believing in him. She asked if he would believe in her. Rick took a deep breath. He thanked her for always rooting for him. Their conversation was cut off when they heard a trembling voice. It was Lynx Lulato. He was dripping with his own blood. Rick immediately rushed to him, asking what happened. Lynx fell on the floor and said Laster got him. Rick's eyes widened and thought Hale did this just to take charge on his exam. Lynx said Laster heard about his dream in his hometown, by building a school for the children who wanted to become adventurers. Laster told him that low-ranking oldies like him shouldn't teach children, because they would only end up like him. He kicked him and told him to know the limits of his body and hurry back to the countryside. He was frustrated because he couldn't defend himself, and begged him to withdraw from the exam because he might treat him worse than his state. Rick stood up and told Lynx that he would push through no matter what. When his number was called, he asked Lynn to assist Lynx. Dude is so strong that he genuinely didn't pick up on the fact that they were seriously trying to kill him, but now he actually recognized their hostility because they actually hurt someone else. When the next battle was about to start, Lynette went inside to find Blowstone and the others, but a woman called her. It was Arisa who told her she was Rick's former co-worker. Lynette introduced herself and greeted her. Arisa said she only came to watch Rick's exam, so Lynette asked her to watch Rick with her colleagues. They heard a high-pitched voice calling Lynette. It was Alice who called her. Blowstone told Lynette to sit beside them, but Mazette suddenly noticed the woman beside her. Arisa stuttered as she greeted them. Mazette grinned widely as he noticed the big melons and told her the seat beside him was empty, but Lynette warned Arisa that he might harass her. Blowstone asked her how Rick was doing, and Lynette confidently said he would surely pass the second exam without a problem. Arisha asked if everyone there was Rick's teacher. Lynette nodded, and Blowstone said one's strength relates to these 4 great foundations. One must train one's magical quality until one is 20. After that, one cannot hope for much growth. Arisha asked why Rick managed to grow, so he explained Rick's magical quantity was inferior, and he only had to build his physical strength until he made the most dangerous monster submit with his bare hands. Mizet taught Rick magic control for the past 2 years. Mizet chuckled and said Rick still couldn't use defense magic. Rick trained with Lynette for body control. Arisha gasped as she thought she was a normal maid. Rick's power was almost the same as the S rank, but he could overcome his teachers if he used the inherent skill that was currently banned. He doesn't know how strong Fess rank or a rank is, as his masters, who are Sess rank, keep saying that it is normal for F rank to do. Lynette told them Rick doesn't realize his potential, confusing the 3. Blowstone asked why, so Mizet suddenly remembered the moment before Rick started training. Blowstone told Rick that his humility was his strong point, but hid how strong he was getting every training. Mizet added that inside Rick's mind, he thinks of himself as an F ranker and isn't aware of his growth. He suddenly got worried about the examiner Rick would be facing. Lastar stood there confidently as he smirked at Rick. He scoffed and said he was surprised to see him unscathed from his elite guards. Rick stared at Lastar's blazing aura. He frowned his eyebrows and asked him why he became an adventurer. Lastar raised his brow and said he was born with a talent, and now he was trying to find a perfect time to quit because he was bored. Rick sighed and said he didn't want to lose to him. Lastar chuckled and told him to be more polite speaking to him because he would put him under his terror, but he got confused when he noticed him not talking. He looked at Rick from top to bottom and asked if he lost his nerve, but he was actually trying to keep his anger together and stay calm. Lynette had reminded him earlier to stay calm and focus on his opponent. Rick sighed and kept those words in his head. When Lastar ignited the third order magic, a flame eliminate, Rick noticed it was a chantless version of Frito. When the huge ball of flame came dashing towards him, he watched it as it moved. The moment it exploded, a deafening bang echoed around the area. Arisa gasped, worried about Rick. When the smoke lingered around the area, Rick did not move after the explosion. He was covered with the ashes from the smoke. Lastar was quite surprised he survived it, so he mockingly said the next one would hurt a little bit. He swung his hand across and released a fourth order magic called Hurricane Cutter. The sharp gush of wind rushed to Rick, but the wind disappeared when it landed on him. Lastar pointed his palm at him and said he should pick up his pace. He threw different kinds of attacks, from thunder to waves and to winds. He continuously launched those while saying elites like him should harass Rick. Arisa looked at the teacher and asked why they looked so calm and not worried about Rick. Rick lifted the boulder of cement that landed on him. Lastar cursed as he was getting annoyed by his stubbornness, so he decided to end him with his fist. He ran towards him with a blink step in and swung his fist at him. Rick greeted his fist with his knuckle, and the impact was so strong that it threw Lastar off the ground. Arisa was dumbfounded by the result of the examiner's attack. Lastar managed to land on his feet. Rick finally understood why Lynette told him that. Because Lastar was occupied with his innate talent, he was full of himself, but his great four foundations were all a mess. Rick rolled his fingers into a fist and smiled as he figured that there was no way he could lose to a guy like him. Lastar. The cowardly siblings cheered their older brother. Lastar scoffed and told Rick their attacks happened to cancel each other out by chance. He lifted his hand again and threw another flame eliminate. Rick calmly lifted his palm, and the moment the flames touched his hand, it shattered and was expelled away from him. Alistar's sibling gasped in shock, so Rick said this sloppy magic was so weak that he didn't need to use any magic to defend against it. Alistar still wasn't convinced and told him not to get too cocky. He leaped forward using the blink step Ren, but this was too slow for Rick. In a blink of an eye, his fist was a few inches away from his annoying grin. His body immediately reacted and activated his iron body. His defense was ready before the impact, but Rick's strength overpowered him. Alistar was pushed back a few feet from his opponent. He chuckled as he recognized Rick's power greater than an E rank. He sighed and said he seemed to get tired after performing tests. He called him a third rate, who was full of himself, so Rick couldn't believe how much he didn't want to approve of him. He said he didn't use any magic but used body manipulation that was higher than Lastar's strengthening magic. Lastar wasn't convinced by how powerful he was, but he asked him how he had gotten this strong within 2 years. Rick lowered his gaze and said he couldn't leave in the dragon's den until he defeated it. He remembered how he perished drowning in a swim and how he dragged the 1-ton weights attached to him until he got out of the monster's territory within 100 kilometers. Arisa went pale and wondered how Rick survived without dying. Blowstone replied and said he did perish, making Arisa flinch. Blowstone explained how he brought Rick back to life right after he perished. Alistar smirked and said he would give him poor marks for lying because it is impossible for one person to survive that. Rick said that his dream pushes him forward, just like the dream of Lynx whom he injured. Alistar asked what kind of dream he had, and he replied that he had to defeat the strongest monster in the world, the Kaiser Arsapido. Alistar went speechless for a moment. Frito almost choked from his own saliva, and his older brother burst out laughing. His dream was like a kid's dream from a fairy tale legend of the hero Yamato. He added that they should finish what they had started. He activated his 7th order magic, the forest rope. Some strong roots suddenly emerged below him and grabbed his lower and upper extremities. Rick was caught off guard by the chantless attack. Lastar placed his hand on the ground and said he would show his real talent. A powerful mana emerged from the surroundings of his hand as he chanted the words that seemed familiar to Rick. The strongest E rank, which holds 1,000 skills, released his strongest magic attack, the pinnacle of what humans could do, the 8th order. Rick was amazed by the colossal monster made out of strings of strong plant fibers. The crowd was buzzing as this was their first time witnessing an 8 order. Arisa was so nervous, but his teachers silently watched, unlike these two monkeys cheering their older brother. Rick frowned his brows as he clenched his fists. The strong contraction of his muscles released a whirring solid magic. Alistar scoffed and said that basic attacks would do nothing against his magic. Rick confidently exclaimed he would punch what was in front of him, but Alistar told him that he still had time to surrender. Rick asked how many times he had used that magic. Alistar replied, saying he had used it a few times and had mastered it now. Compared to Rick's basic attack, that he fired the magic off 100 million times within 2 years. The people in the bleachers were stunned by it. Arisa even asked if it was even physically possible, so Blowstone said it would be possible if one would use a special space. Alistar was getting impatient and tired of all of Rick's bluffs, so he decided to smash his dream of his. He commanded the monster he created to smash Rick. Simultaneously, Rick was trying to get off the roots, restraining his movements. When he got off, Rick released the air show to counterattack the Drassel God impact. The impact caused a huge force. Alistar laughed devilishly as he called him a crushed low ranker, but his eyes widened when he felt the monster trembling. The impact impact cracked the arm of the 8th Order monster to pieces. The people gasped in shock as they watched Alistair, the strongest A-ranker, flying in the air. Saitama would probably be wondering how Rick still has his hair. The two monkeys dropped their jaws as they saw the look of their older brother. Rick sighed and said his dreams would remain unscratched, no matter what. After the examination, the people in the hallway talked and looked at him as he walked by. They kept saying Rick was so cool for being able to defeat an A-ranker at his age. But this sudden change of attitude of the crowd towards him made him flustered. Rick's teacher came to him, congratulating him for his splendid attack. Rick suddenly realized he was strong and wondered why he misunderstood things the whole time. He smiled and said his strong teachers had trained him for the past 2 years. He added that it was also their fault that his common sense got distorted, but he got distracted by the commotion nearby. The Diramuto siblings tried to ask if he could really walk by himself. They suddenly stopped when Rick called Alistair. He asked if he realized that a slow starter like him had defeated an elite genius like him. Frito frowned at him and asked if he was only trying to make a snide remark, but Angelica stopped him. Alistair glanced at him and immediately withdrew his eyes. Rick advised him to just practice and master one skill until the very end. He smiled and said he had high hopes for him. Alistair wanted to look at him, but the shame was swallowing him, so he remained like that. He said he would be in charge of his next examination and told him to prepare himself. Angelica bowed before they left. Rick smiled as he watched them leave. Blowstone called him to tell him that their scores were being posted. Lynette suddenly noticed how calm Rick was compared to the first exam, so he said he didn't feel nervous anymore because he recalled the memories from his past 22 years. It was when the small Rick was reading the legends of the hero Yamato. The hero in the story wasn't able to defeat the strongest monster. The hero hoped that someday, the one among the children would be able to defeat Kaiser Arasapioto. The little Rick was so into the story, making him dream of defeating the strongest monster. Her mother called him after hearing about his dream and told him to pick a safer job. His father also said he had to have respectable and stable work for his future family. One day, when he was at school, his teacher announced that they would be undergoing a test to detect if they had any inherent skills so they could attend a knight or mage school. Rick's classmates were so excited, but he didn't care. The moment the examiner told him they had found a skill factor, his eyes shone brightly. As soon as the class ended, he rushed back to their house, excited to tell his parents about the result, just like Yamato in the book. He was so confident in telling his parents that he had finally decided to become an adventurer. A day had passed since that day, and his classmates were asking if his skill had come out. A year had passed, but his skill hadn't come out. However, 5 years later, it was still the same, and he was getting annoyed by the repeated questions he had to answer. That night, when he was reading a book saying one should train while they are young, he had a deep sigh and returned it to the shelves. He saw a letter of appointment as a clerk in the reception area that he had received a few days before. He had finally accepted his parents' wish, getting a safe and stable job for 14 years. He worked at the Tiger Road Guild, writing on the papers and documents and rewarding the adventurers for their subjugations. He lifted his gaze when he was called by a man called Zaid. The man asked if he had any slight illegal request with nice rewards, but Rick told him it was illegal. Zaid showed him his ID, and Rick was shocked to see his rank. Zaid was promoted to a B rank, so he could now live off of being an adventurer. He wanted to pay Rick back for how he treated him as an F rank, and invited him for a drink. The two drank until Rick was wobbling like a drunk old man. He thought he had been sitting in the same chair, doing the same job for 14 years, while Zaid got promoted and reached rank B. This is actually a realistic twist. A child has an initial dream of being something, but sheepy life kinda happens, and then you find yourself in a different career. He drifted in this thought when suddenly a high-pitched scream alarmed him. The woman exclaimed that there was a monster. Rick sobered up and saw a giant troll chasing the people in the street. He thought he had to call off at least a B-ranker adventurer, but when he saw a woman wearing a maid's clothes, he rushed to her because she was not moving. He moved in front of her to protect her, but the woman moved to his front, telling him to move back. The woman swung her hand in the air and instantly sliced the troll like she was playing Fruit Ninja. Rick screamed in shock as he saw the flesh fall to the floor, and it rained with blood. The woman thanked him for trying to save her, and told him she was an adventurer, and this is how the Rick and Lynette shipping started. The blood dropped on the floor as he stared at Lynette with his mouth wide open. She asked if he was right, making him suddenly nervous and stuttering. He stood up and said he came there to save her, but ended up being saved. He thanked her and asked for her name. The two introduced themselves to each other, and suddenly, Rick realized she was pretty strong, so he asked if she was a B-rank adventurer. Lynette said no. He was amazed because it was his first time seeing an adventurer fight since he had been working as a receptionist in their guild. He thought she was an A rank, but when Lynette said no, she showed her ID card, indicating her rank. Rick was stunned as this was also his first time seeing an S in the rank section. He thought Lynette's card was unique, so he told her the question lingered inside his mind. He started by explaining how he wanted to defeat Kaiser Arasapio, and asked if a 30-year-old like him could still start training to become an adventurer. Lynette said he already possesses the critical characteristic of an adventurer, which he showed when trying to save her, which is courage. She asked if he knew about the magical quantity, where after the age of 20, it would be hard to progress as an adventurer. She added that adventurers need a certain amount of it, but she decided to be frank with him and told him that his aim to be an adventurer was most likely impossible. Rick gulped upon hearing her comment. He sighed and gave a bitter smile. He said that since a high-ranking adventurer told him that, he felt like a weight on his shoulder was removed. He chuckled and said he still still felt good since he met a wonderful girl, and jokingly asked her for dinner. But when she suddenly said she agreed, he was shocked. Lynette told him she could set a time at 7 o'clock the next day. When the morning came, Rick went to the guild, and Arisa was surprised to see the uplifting vibes Rick was giving. He was humming as he walked in, so Arisa told him he looked like he was in good spirits. Rick told her they should work harder, but Zaid heard it and jokingly said he was annoying. He asked for a B-rank queue, so Rick nodded enthusiastically, making Zaid cringe. After his work, he was so excited as he leaped his way to their meeting place. He hadn't given up on life, even if his dream of becoming an adventurer was crushed, but suddenly a voice screamed, saying a monster had occurred. He cursed and smashed the floor because his happy day was ruined. A man saw him and asked what he was doing. He added that everybody would perish by these monsters. Rick thought it was an exaggeration, but when he said there were 30 monsters, Rick gasped and realized that was the direction in which he would be meeting Lynette. He immediately ran to find her, but when he arrived, he figured there was no point in him worrying. Lynette noticed his presence and noticed her melons. I mean, she didn't have a drop of blood on her. A real monster with a cute face. He looked at the pile of blood and flesh. He noticed the monsters were still marching towards them. He asked what happened, but Lynette asked him to run away quickly. Since he didn't want to get in her way, he was about to leave when he heard Lynette groaning. She dropped to the floor with a throbbing chest pain. He rushed to her, and Lynette knew what this magic was. A huge wolf growled at them and attacked Rick, but luckily, a man slashed the wolf's body in half. He was surprised to see that the person who saved his life was Zaid. Other adventurers came running and throwing their skills at the monster. Their powers crushed the monsters that were hit in an instant. The guild prepared an emergency request, so they arrived on time. The 3 adventurers moved forward. He looked at them and realized he didn't like the thought that he was only watching them. He knew this feeling wasn't jealousy. Lynette called him and told him to tell everyone to run away, as things escalated too quickly. Rick told her not to worry, because those adventurers were B-rankers, but Lynette told him that was nowhere near enough, because there was a dragon nearby. Rick frowned his brows and said it was impossible for a dragon to be there. Lynette explained that she couldn't control her magic when exposed to a dragon's magic, because of the trauma she had before. When Zaid slashed the last monster, he realized that monsters showing up like this rarely happened since he was born. Rick called their attention and told them to escape now, but it was too late. They heard the flapping wings in the sky. They froze upon seeing the ginormous creature above them. Zaid said dragons couldn't come to the countryside. Rick figured that these monsters went there because they were also running away from the dragon. They all knew that they should run away if there were no more than 5 rankers nearby. When the dragon landed, the dragon started to walk towards them. They ran immediately, but their faces bumped into something. They all realized that the dragoon had set up a barrier. Zaid tried to smash it with his axe, but nothing happened. The dragon released a deafening roar that sent shivers down their spine. They froze in fear, but were shocked when Rick bravely stepped in front of the dragon. Zaid was sweating cold and asked what Rick was doing. The dragon lowered his gaze to him, so Zaid told him this would be a pointless death. Rick knew that, but told him if he perished fighting this dragon, he would be happy to perish as an adventurer. Rick returned his gaze back to the dragon, and knew to himself that there was no way he could fight this thing. He closed his eyes and thought if he should fight or run. He remembered his parents dictating his future. Rick's blood was steaming hot, and he couldn't hold it any longer. He had decided to fulfill his dream right there. Zaid called his comrades and told them they shouldn't let a receptionist act as their vanguard. They followed Rick, and the scene surprised Lynette. She wondered why Rick acted like this, even knowing that he couldn't put a scratch on the dragon. When the dragon used the breath attack, the adventurer ran to the side, but not Rick. When the dragon released it, it caused vast damage to the village. The ground and whatever the flames touched turned to ashes. The adventurers were thrown to the side when the smoke faded, panting for air. Zaid jokingly said that Rick's skill must be crushing their chances of victory. Lynette saw their situation and was starting to blame herself for not being able to do anything. When the dragon opened its mouth again, Zaid sighed and knew this would be their end. They watched the dragon accumulate its blazing breath. They were shocked when they heard something. The dragon saw a hand emerge from the pile of debris. Rick stood up and walked like a zombie. Lynette was surprised to see Rick alive, but when the dragon lifted its arm, Rick was dedicated to fulfilling his dream. Out of nowhere, something inside him activated and said he had acquired a skill. Rick's eyes widened in shock when the reckless soul skill activated. The moment the dragon's hand smashed him, Lynette and Zaid screamed in shock. They went speechless and thought Rick was crushed to death, but little did they know he had caught the dragon's hand with his palm. Rick pushed the dragon's hand away, making it lose its balance. Rick's body was overflowing with his magic power. Zaid got up and wondered if that was actually Rick. Lynette was surprised to notice his pouring magic even though he didn't have training for it. Rick looked at his palm and remembered the little Rick. Tears fell down his eyes, and he told himself that his skill activation was late. He remembered the big lizard before him, so he smiled and told it to help him test out his new skill. The dragon growled and opened its mouth again. This time, Rick was confident. He concentrated his power on his fist and launched it at the dragon's mouth. The magic power shot out from his fist, and a massive explosion was heard when it landed in the dragon's mouth. Everyone gasped in shock when they saw the dragon's flesh shattered in a split second. Bro almost became Saitama. There was a moment of silence as they watched the half of the dragon's body drop to the floor. Rick smiled as he huffed for air. He chuckled and thought his skill wasn't too bad. He wobbled and lost consciousness. Everything went black. He opened his eyes in the village where he was resting and suddenly remembered the fight against the dragon. He tried to get up, but his body ached. Lynette told him not to force himself because because all of the magic circuits in his body were broken, similar to a lifeless person. Rick asked if she had waited for him to wake up, but when she told him he had been sleeping for a week, he was shocked. Lena told him that her party, the Orichalcum Fist, wanted to invite him to join them. He was confused at the moment. His courage when fighting made them invite him because Lynette could guarantee that Rick could become an adventurer. She added that their objective was also to defeat Arisapi To. He couldn't believe it. This was the first time that something like this had been said to him. His eyes became water, and his voice cracked as he asked if it was really okay for him to aim for that. Lynette smiled, nodded, and said yes. Going back to the present, Lynette congratulated Rick on being a fully pledged adventurer. He thanked them and wanted to tell little Rick that he was grateful to him for not giving up on their dream, and that he had finally become an adventurer. After the examination, Rick visited Lynx, who was recovering. He asked if he wanted to get that promised drink, so Lynx chuckled and said that anything would do to celebrate his passing the exam. Lynx suddenly asked if he could bring him to his party's meeting place, but Rick's facial expression changed into worry and fear, like he pooped an arm-sized stool. A few days later, Lynx Lolato walked up the mountain with his high-level equipment, just like Rick instructed him. He looked at the address and confirmed that he had arrived at the right place. The moment he pulled the bell, Rick immediately went out to greet him. He apologized for startling him and said that it would be bad if one of his teachers came out, so he waited for him. When they got inside, Lynx asked why there were no monsters around the area, so Rick said the monsters didn't go near the castle. Lynx asked why he asked him to wear this equipment, but Rick told him he would know it soon. Lynx greeted them as they came in. Lynx thanked her for helping him in the examination, but a child's voice echoed, calling Rick's name. Alicet leaped like an ordinary kid, making Lynx wish to have a lively daughter, but that changed when Alicet shot her lightning bolts at them. Lynx was shocked by the chantless 6th order level magic. Rick moved before him and deflected it to save Lynx. He placed his hand on his waist and scolded Alicet for keeping on playing magic inside the castle. Lynette looked at Alicet and told her she would take some of her meal budget if she did it again. Alicet's face went pale. She dived onto the floor and grabbed Lynette's skirt, begging her like a puppy not to take her food away. Rick sighed, apologized to Lynx, and told him that he would play a little with Alicet, because if he left her like this, she would just do it again. Lynx nodded and told him he would look around a little, so Rick reminded him to be careful. When Lynx went to the garden, he noticed the place was torn up. He noticed a person sitting on a chair. Eldwarf was fixing the weapon he had made. Lynx walked to him and apologized for interrupting him. Eldwarf already knew one of Rick's friends was coming over, so he introduced himself to him. Lynx asked what he was holding, so Eldwarf said it was a weapon he made. The Ultra Gun Model 6, basically an RPG-7 dupe. He told Lynx to do a test run for him, so he instructed him on how to hold it properly. When Lynx pulled the trigger, he screamed in shock when the missile launched and created a huge explosion. He dropped his jaw in shock as he saw the result of the explosion on the ground. Eldwarf sighed in disappointment because there were ashes left behind. Lynx glanced at the destructive weapon and thought that if it were mass-produced, the battles in the world would change significantly. When he got out of the garden, he walked back to the castle. He was wondering if this was normal at their party. He suddenly stopped when he noticed a door slightly open. He peeked inside, and I mistook this for a certain hamburger shop register worker. Blowstone felt his presence and told him to come in. Lynx apologized and went inside. He looked around and asked if this was their library, but Blowstone said it was his room. Being surrounded by books calms him down. Lynx tried to read the titles of the book, but he knew it was something he wouldn't understand. Based on his environment, he thought of Blowstone as a kind and reserved person, so he asked if he was Rick's main trainer. Blowstone asked if he was interested in Rick's training, so Lynx grabbed the opportunity and asked if he could give him a lesson. Blowstone got up and said his eyes were bright, the same as Rick's eyes, so he agreed to train him. Lynx smiled excitedly, and I hoped he could keep that smile until the end. A few hours later, Linny was picking up some fresh mushrooms in the woods for dinner when she heard a man's screaming voice. She looked up and saw Lynx falling from the cliff. Linny caught him by her arms and saw him chasing his breath. Linny put him down and asked if he was all right. Lynx thanked her for saving his life, but suddenly noticed the gigantic boar. Linny said it was an ingredient for their dinner. She looked below and noticed the ankle weights. Lynx sighed and said he asked Blowstone to train him, but the last thing he knew was these 500-kilogram weights were attached to him while running down a 70-degree slope. If Linny weren't there, Lynx would have been a part of history by now. Linny said Rick experienced death many times because of Blowstone. She told him to remove the ankle weights. She took it and lifted the giant boar like it was a stuffed toy. Rick was scolding Blowstone when the two arrived, but he defended himself by saying he could just bring Lynx back to life. Alla chuckled and exclaimed that she also wanted to play with Uncle Lynx. Eldwarf smirked and said it was Rick's fault. Linny told Rick not to worry anymore since she brought his friend safely. Rick rushed to him and worriedly asked if he was okay. Lynx couldn't believe that it was a miracle that he came back alive, so Rick told him that if Blowstone said it was light training, that training would be hell. If Alatuk said she wouldn't do it again, that monster would continue doing it, and worse than before. No one can trust these utterances of their members. Lynx asked how many times he lost his life, but he avoided the topic and redirected it to Lynette's cooking skills. When they got inside the castle, they sat and started eating together. They were all chatting and enjoying each other's company. Lynx couldn't believe a tasty meal like this existed, so he commended Lynette's cooking skills. Blowstone cleared his throat and asked Lynx if he heard about the magical stones, the 6 jewels. Lynx was caught off guard by the random question and said it was from the legends of Yamato. The 6 jewels are in the dungeon where the strongest monster lives, and those stones could open the origin spiral. Rick nodded, said they were looking for it, and asked if he had any information about it. Lynx told them it was known to be in the mountain near the Northern Guild, where wyverns suddenly appeared in great numbers. Upon hearing the information, the Orichalcum Fist, Rick's party, had planned to go to that mountain. In the city, a woman was mopping the floor inside the guild, sighing deeply for doing such an odd job. As an F-rank adventurer, she wanted to eliminate monsters, but she was stuck with this. She suddenly heard an ogre asking for a quest with a danger rating of 82. She was shocked, as was her boss. His voice shook as he said that the quest requires a minimum of 4 people. The woman was surprised, as this was the first time she had seen her boss subservient. Rick walked closer and read the paper. He told his teachers that they needed a temporary member to get the quest. Blowstone nodded and followed Rick's suggestion, because he was a former receptionist. Blowstone called the guild master and asked for a helper. The man stood up rapidly and called Ray Lucas, the woman who was mopping the floor. Ray walked to him, and she was startled when he grabbed her shoulders and asked her to go with the adventurers, since she also wanted to go on a high danger rating quest. Ray chuckled awkwardly as she looked at the 3. Blowstone introduced himself and held his hand out for her. Ray froze as she thought she might end up with a meal of this huge ogre. When they went out to march to the northern mountains, Ray was getting anxious because they were getting near the monster breeding ground. She asked Rick what his rank was, and he told her he had just become an E-ranker. She figured the other 2 weren't normal, but Rick was an ordinary late starter old guy. Alice suddenly pointed in the direction where they saw the huge monster. Ray started sweating cold as she saw the wyvern eating the bear's flesh. She remembered that wyverns calls for help when they got into a fight, so she asked Blowstone what strategy they would use. Blowstone got confused and continued approaching the wyvern. When the monster hissed at him, Ray gasped in shock and told Blowstone not to get any closer. The wyvern attacked him, but Blowstone slapped the hell out of him. Ray shrieked as a shiver went down her spine. Blowstone glared at her as he told her to knock it out. She was dumbfounded when he threw the wyvern away, because she knew that it would call for help. Blowstone knew it but told Rick to keep the noisy girl somewhere else. Rick chuckled awkwardly and dragged her away. The 2 walked out, but Ray kept asking if it was really okay to leave the 2 behind. Rick told her it was fine. Out of nowhere, a herd of wyverns came out, that even an A-ranker wouldn't stand against this many. Ray thought they should go back to save the 2, but Rick told her they couldn't do anything with their low ranks. Ray exclaimed that she couldn't let them die without trying to help. Rick smiled and figured Ray was a good adventurer. Rick assured her that the 2 should be fine, but Ray screamed when something crashed on the ground. When she looked at it, she saw a panting wyvern. Her attention was drawn when more wyverns came flying in the air, and in an instant a huge tornado occurred, swirling around the area where they left Blowstone and Alice at. Rick smirked and told her it was a waste of time to worry about them, but he flinched when he noticed something crashing towards them. He carried her and almost tripped on the ground. The wyvern growled at them. Ray started sweating cold and told Rick they should run away, but he ignored her and walked towards the monster. She tried to stop him, but Rick wanted to check something. Rick said running from it would be impossible, so she had also decided to fight. Rick told her to run, but Ray refused and told him she would never abandon her ally, just like Yamato. Rick smiled and asked her to cover for him. He swung his fist back and threw a punch at the monster's face. Ray dropped her jaw and her eyes widened because its trunk and head were shattered to pieces. Rick had finally confirmed and accepted that he was pretty strong. Ray's voice shook as she asked why he even asked for a cover. She asked if he was really an E-rank. He nodded, but Alicette suddenly called him. The cute little vampire was chewing on a meat as she waved at them. She scanned them and was shocked to see them unscathed. After defeating dozens of monsters, Blowstone and Alicette had managed to find one of the 6 jewels at the breeding grounds. So the following day, Ray's head was occupied the whole morning about what had happened. His boss was thanking her about the other day, but he noticed Ray spacing out. She stood properly and said she was just thinking about how amazing those people were. Her boss told her they were S-rankers, making her wonder if she could also get that rank. The boss chuckled at her idea, but Ray had decided to pass her E-rank test first. In the castle, they were talking about the jewels they retrieved, including the Crimson Petal. The jewel releases pure energy that lures monsters to its area. Blowstone asked Mizette to resonate with the jewel's magic, but Alicette volunteered herself. Mizette stopped her because she might blow up the whole castle. Mizette started his ultra-complex magic calmly, and after a few seconds, a map appeared on the table. It looked like a large developed city, so they were looking for a nearby castle. Blowstone told them it was Herakutopia, a country where fighting entertainment was popular and held in the famous Colosseum. But why does it look like a soccer stadium? I guess this is Thanos and his crew finding infinity gems. That country was only a small country 400 years ago. The 4th king, Alexander Herkutopia, built the Colosseum. Competitions were held there, and even he fought there without any weapons. He was the undefeated champion with over 10,000 matches. People all over the continent gathered there to watch him, and before they knew it, the country had grown to the level of a major nation. Alexander built the nation with his fist, and was called the Fist King. This king has a bull sack for his abs. Just kidding. Anyways, and that was how the fighting entertainment industry flourished. Thanos sighed. I mean, Blowstone Blowstone, and wished to trade blows with the Fist King. Rick said they only came there to ask around for information on the 6 jewels, but who the hell should they ask? A man nearby cornered a woman, telling her not to be cold to him. The egghead was asking the girl to come with him to a hotel, but the woman seemed to be uncomfortable. Rick called his attention, but Blowstone walked to him with glaring eyes. The egghead frowned his eyebrows and told him if he had a problem with him, a gladiator. He noticed Blowstone wasn't familiar with it, so he asked him to come with him in the back. Blowstone nodded and followed him. Rick sighed and felt pity for the bald man. Blowstone carried the man by its collar as they came out. He figured that the Catwoman was Militia. The egghead called Blowstone Master and introduced himself as Gordids. Rick stepped up and pulled a small box. He opened it and showed them the jewel. The two were in awe of the beauty of the jewels. Blowstone asked if they saw a yellow stone similar to this. Rick assumed they had to ask more people, since the jewel was rare, but Gordids felt like he had seen it before. Rick gasped in shock and asked where he had seen it, but a loud horn was heard saying their great entertainment on the continent would be started. Rick asked what it was, and Gordids said it was a parade to announce the Fist King's tournament. Lynette asked what the tournament was, so the egghead explained that it was an ultra-large-scale tournament that gathers 500,000 people every year. Gordids pointed at someone, telling his master it was the reigning champion for the last 3 years, Kelvin Ervolf, a Catman. Lynette and Blowstone knew, just by looking, that this man was quite capable and at a high level. Rick was surprised because his teachers recognized Kelvin's strength. Rick was startled when Gordids screamed. Militia pointed at Kelvin and told them to look at the champion's belt, which was right in the center. There they saw the yellow magic stone. Rick gasped as he knew what was about to happen to him. A few moments later, after the parade, Kelvin walked inside the Red Rings building. A man greeted him and commended his good work in the parade. Kelvin told him to work hard as well, but a man with an eye patch asked how he felt. He sat on a bench and said he didn't feel bad, which means he also doesn't feel good. Kelvin looked at the belt, and said he hoped this year's tournament wouldn't be a disappointment. He lifted his gaze when he heard a guy asking for a conversation. Rick and Lynette came in, and Kelvin's eyes widened as he saw Lynette. He could already tell how strong she was, as well as Rick. He noticed his trained body and his strong spirit. The eye-patched man asked if they were Kelvin's fans. He told them that barging inside the gym was a serious breach of manners. Rick told him they were only doing their job as an adventurer searching for a certain jewel. When Blowstone got there, he was getting impatient. Rick tried to stop him, but being patient wasn't in his nature. Kelvin was shocked to see a talking orc. He scanned him from head to toe and knew he was a real deal. Blowstone abruptly told him to hand his belt over. The eye-patched man was in disbelief and confused, so Blowstone explained that the jewel in his belt was in possession of one of their members a long time ago, and that they would like to trade with another jewel. The eye-patched man, the owner of the building, couldn't believe the orc's nonsense, and tried to call someone to throw them out. Kelvin suddenly said that his nose smelled no lies with their nonsense, so he believed them. He couldn't just hand the belt over to them because it was the pride of the people of Heracutopia, so there was only one way to get it, to stand at the top of the Fist King's tournament. Blowstone nodded and told the two they should head out now. When they were walking outside the building, Rick asked his teacher how they were going to get the belt. Blowstone sighed and asked if he wasn't listening. The owner couldn't believe Kelvin had let those 3 off the hook. Kelvin said it was the right decision because everyone was about to be slaughtered earlier. The owner got that those 3 were not average, but he couldn't believe what he did. Kelvin grinned widely and said those 3 were exceptional and that they would make this year fun. As they entered the Fist King tournament qualification testing grounds, a woman wearing a bunny costume greeted them. Rick sighed and said getting the belt wouldn't be simple and easy. Lynette couldn't participate because she had to gather information. When Rick's name was called for the test, he stood up and hoped nobody would perish because Blowstone went alone to the East League. When he got inside the testing room, the man in charge of the exam greeted him and told him there would be a mock battle where he would fight against a randomly selected gladiator. His opponent climbed quickly from the 5th League to the 1st. They were surprised when the door slammed open and Sailor Moon came in, taking over the moon. Just kidding, the woman apologized for being late. Rick frowned his brows as he heard the familiar voice, and when he looked at her, he saw Angelica, one of the Diramuto siblings. Angelica shrieked in shock upon glancing at Rick. That's the look when you saw your dad at Walmart while cutting classes. Rick chuckled awkwardly and greeted him. The person in charge of the exam asked if they were acquaintances. Now let us continue the story. Outside the examination building, a man named Nicholas was about to come inside when his friend called him, saying his obsession with the tournament had gone too far because he would be watching the qualification test again. Nicholas looked at him and told him that an unbelievably dark horse appears every few years. Meanwhile, Rick and Angelica faced off. She stuttered from nervousness as she asked why he was there, but Rick was also confused about why she came there. The examiner excused himself and told them they had a packed schedule, so he asked them to start the examination. The two took their positions, so Nicholas leaned over the rails, excited to witness the great gladiator, Angelica. When the examiner had officially started the mock battle, Angelica started sweating cold. She knew she would lose, but her pride wouldn't allow it. Rick may look weak, but his appearance wouldn't deceive Angelica. Nicholas thought he was too old to become a gladiator, and thought Angelica would easily finish this battle. Angelica immediately used her flash step, but she froze when her foot slipped, so she screamed as she fell on the floor. "Hey, keep your eye on the face. I can see you, egghead." Anyways, Angelica groaned, thinking she was too cautious and had forgotten to keep her balance. She stood up, but this clumsy witch stumbled stumbled when she tried to walk and fell flat on the ground. Angelica got teary-eyed and wanted to get swallowed up by the floor in humiliation. Once again, I could feel a great disturbance on the internet. Keep those zippers up, monkeys. Rick told her he had developed a new technique called the 8 secret techniques of holding back, which is the power of departing leg sweep. Rick said his trick was sweeping his opponent's legs as they tried to move, which sapped their will to fight. Angelica accepted that even though she was a second-class knight, she couldn't see his technique but was convinced that if it was him, it was possible. She gritted her teeth and used her step rin, but as expected, she kissed the floor. As you can see, Rick's feet move fast. That can't be seen with the naked eye. Nicholas and the examiner were stunned as this was their first time seeing Angelica like this. Rick chuckled and commended her because it was difficult to match her timing. He cheered her up because she hadn't lost her will to fight, so when Angelica heard that he would attack, she raised her hands to surrender. When the examination was done, Lynette greeted him. He showed her the card and told her he passed. He was about to read the paper when Angelica called him, asking why he was there. Rick sighed and told her he wanted to win the next Fist King tournament. Angelica sighed and told him he might be strong, but that it would be impossible for him to win the competition. Lynette was confused, so Angelica explained that one must be in the First League's top 7 to enter the tournament's main event. Rick had just become a gladiator, so that he would be in the 5th league. In each league, they had to win 7 or more of one's last 10 matches. He had to do 40 matches in a month for him to participate in the main event next month. Angelica said a normal gladiator could only do 10 matches a month, so doing 40 was physically impossible. Rick suddenly wondered if it would actually be more difficult than his training. Angelica suddenly said, "Can you please leave the human realm?" If only she had visited the guild castle like Link's Lolotto. Inside the battleground, a woman with a bunny costume welcomed everyone for the 5th league preliminary matches. Only a few people were watching the match, and one of them was Nicholas. He was surprised to see Rick, the guy who made Angelica surrender. Angelica said Rick's opponent was fond of cheap tricks but of the lowest class. This man was known to use cowardly tricks, but he seemed pretty confident about going up against a 30-year-old man. This monkey was already digging his own grave. Everyone may say the MC looks weak, but this dude is ripped as hell. When the referee patted them down for inspection, they were reminded not to use any weapon or armor. The man smirked at Rick, and when the match had officially begun, he placed his palm on the floor. Rick wondered if he would also use a flash step, but little did he know, this tricky man was hiding something inside the heel of his shoe. Rick's eyes widened when he figured this man would use an impact stone that amplifies the impact of an attack. The man threw the sand he grabbed at him, so Rick moved his arm to deflect the sand off his face. The man grinned because his side was not undefended. He landed a blow on Rick's side. He scoffed and thought he had landed a lethal blow, but when he realized his radius and ulna were broken, he screamed in pain. He was confused by what happened, so Rick got worried and said his untrained body and the impact stone caused his arms to break. He couldn't believe his perfect execution did nothing to him. Rick sighed and told him it would be better to train his 4 great fundamentals, so his strategy wouldn't be wasted. He walked to him with a smile, and told the monkey it was his turn to try the 8 secret techniques of holding back. He executed his swing and miss punch technique. Even though it was missed, the impact from the momentum almost tarnished his face. The man lost consciousness and fell to the ground. Nicholas and Angelica were shocked after witnessing an absurd thing. The referee stuttered when he announced the winner. Everyone went silent, still in shock by what had happened. I guess Rick's Saitama's long-lost brother, but with hair. Lynette and Angelica congratulated Rick after the match. He only had 39 wins left to get to the First League, but Angelica replied that doing 40 matches would be impossible because there was a rule saying that an athlete could only compete in the same arena once per day. There were dozens of arenas, and the closest ones were more than 30 kilometers away. There are a lot of people in the 5th League, so finding a vacant arena would be difficult. Angelica explained something, but Lynette called Rick and told him it was time for him to go. Rick looked at his paper and thought he had to go now, to the Green Hill Arena in the 23rd District by 11 a.m. The three walked as Rick told Angelica they had already booked the place for 11 a.m. Angelica frowned her brows and said Green Hill was 30 kilometers away, and he couldn't get there by 11 a.m. with even a carriage. Rick told her they wouldn't be using a carriage because they were going to run, making Angelica feel like she was being mocked. She jokingly asked if he would be setting a world record, but Rick chuckled and waved goodbye. He pressed his foot on the floor and dashed like lightning. Lynette asked Angelica if she would be watching Rick's matches, and when she nodded, Lynette told her to come with her to the arena. As soon as Lynette grabbed her, Angelica was crying like a kid, screaming in the air. She stuttered as she asked Lynette why they had to fly so high. She wailed and told her to put her down and forget about the matches. When they had arrived at the Green Hill, Angelica rushed to the side to vomit. There goes her breakfast. Lynette apologized and told her she would treat her to lunch. Before they could enter, Rick said he had already won. Angelica might have wasted her breakfast for this. Rick sighed because he failed to use the number 3 of the 8 secret techniques of holding back. Lynette commended him, and if Rick continues this, he should be in the First League in 4 days by now. Angelica was dumbfounded after realizing his goal was to do 10 matches per day, and after 3 days, Rick had officially reached the First League. Rick was so happy because he finished a day earlier than expected. He thanked Angelica for her guidance, but she looked more exhausted than Rick. Angelica suddenly noticed that Rick's fast acceleration to the First League wasn't going around the city. Rick placed a newspaper on the table and said it was because of this man. Blowstone went to the East League, crushing every opponent he encountered. There was this man who was known for his strong punch. The people who took this blow couldn't couldn't stand for 10 days, but when his fist landed on Blowstone's abdomen, he froze at the feeling he got. It felt like he punched a century-old huge tree. Blowstone smashed his head like he was playing whack-a-mole. He had finished the 40 matches within 2 days, much faster than Rick. Angelica suddenly talked about his schedule. Rick's opponents would be decided for him. The management decides all of the plans for a full-blown entertainment tournament. He would advance to the main fight if he managed to get into the top 7. Angelica explained that the first league was run as a point system. There would be one match for every 10 people, and rankings would change based on an individual's points. The day when the battle in the first league had begun, Rick's first opponent charged towards him with a sturdy fist. He swung his fist towards Rick's face, but Rick used his number 3 of holding back. He stepped to the side and used the sword hand in passing. The man's eyeball almost dropped, and he lost consciousness. When the winner was announced, Rick was called the Old Rookie. The host said Rick had won by default, making the audience curse, calling Rick a hefty scum for winning against a sick man. Nicholas sighed, calling the amateurs dumb. He may not have understood what happened, but knew Rick was strong. Lynette noticed Rick had improved at holding back because he could easily decapitate somebody if he was serious. The following day, a man named Taylor Blizz, a rank 6, was Angelica's opponent for her first match. Rick could hear people cheering on Angelica and thought she was pretty popular. The host wondered how Angelica could go against an opponent 10 times her size. When the match had started, there was a moment of pause. Angelica took the first move with her blink step and dashed past Taylor Blizz. Her speed caught him off guard, and Angelica kicked his back when he turned to look behind him. Blizz was getting frustrated by her fast movement, so he activated the water wall, a third-order magic. Angelica took a step back, pointing her finger at him like a gun, and cast a thunder throw, a second-order magic. The lightning bullet from her finger almost paralyzed the man because of the water surrounding him. Lynette nodded as she realized that Angelica was quite strong as well. Rick said Angelica had 4 great foundations, and her ability to fight while throwing complex magic made her stronger than her older brother. However, Angelica is at a disadvantage in this match. Blizz chuckled and said he could take that weak attack 1,000 times until she wore out. When Angelica used her blink step, Blizz scoffed as he noticed her movement was slower than when they started. Angelica's eyes widened when Blizz caught up to her movement, so her body crashed against his huge fist. She grunted and crashed into the wall nearby. Angelica gasped for air as soon as her body fell flat on the ground. The host was shocked and said Angelica got in an overwhelming blow, resulting in an unfortunate down. After waiting for seconds, she did not move an inch, so Taylor Blizz was declared the winner. A moment later, Angelica was brought to the infirmary to recover. The healer advised her to take a rest for a night. Angelica sighed at the thought of losing her first match. When she got dressed and got out of the room, Rick greeted her and asked if her injuries were okay. She scoffed and told him it was none of his business. Rick called her and said she was being too hasty. He added that Angelica already knew that Blizz wasn't a good match for her, so he asked why she continued to fight despite knowing that. Angelica raised her voice and told him it was none of his business. She walked away from him, ignoring his calls. Rick followed her outside the arena until the streets. He asked where she was heading, so she replied that she would go to the inn. Rick asked why she was in a rush and if she had some important reason. Angelica suddenly stopped and thought she shouldn't be stubborn, so she decided to tell him about it. The two went to a canteen and saw Taylor Blizz arguing with some lizard. Blizz tells the lizard to let the woman go, but the lizard refuses. Blizz got impatient and landed a punch on his face, but unfortunately it did nothing. The lizard grabbed him by his neck and lifted him off the ground. He swung his body and pressed it on the floor. Everyone was shocked by the sudden attack. The lizard scoffed and stepped on Blizz's face. The lizard was a dragonborn and their race was larger than that of humans, but this person was bigger than a Blowstone. The lizard glared at the woman and said she had bumped him and spilled a drink into him. The woman sobbed and said it was only a little spill, but the dragon was already pissed. Angelica couldn't take it anymore, so she screamed and told him to let her go. The lizard told her to shut up, and in the blink of an eye, his arm was already a few inches away from her face. Luckily, Rick caught his arm. The lizard was surprised that this old man caught his arm easily. He glanced at his arm and squinted his eyes. He cursed Rick and asked if he wanted him to kill him. Giz, the lizard, was stopped when another lizard refrained him from doing it. The man walked calmly towards them and told Giz not to act rashly. This man was called Snape Lizarect. Giz sighed and said he would go out for a drink. Snape sighed and apologized for the disturbance. He suddenly paused when he recognized Rick. He greeted him and said he was the head of the management for the Western League. He introduced himself and shook Rick's hand. Rick asked how he knew him, so Snape said everybody knew about the fastest person to climb the first league in history. Rick suddenly asked if he was a gladiator before. Snape was surprised and asked how he knew. Rick explained how he knew just by shaking his hand. Snape was a gladiator 20 years ago. He garnered fame and attention during that time. Rick asked about the guy who caused a ruckus earlier, so Snape said it was Giz Lizarect, his younger brother. Giz gets irritated easily and cools down quickly as well. Snape admitted that his brother was too strong, which is why nobody could stop him. He apologized again and asked if Angelica had any injuries. When she said no, Snape turned and hoped they would remain safe always. When he left, Rick asked if Angelica knew that guy. Angelica sighed and said that the man was his fiancé. Rick was caught off guard by her answer. She sat on a barrel and said this was why she chose to become a gladiator. She asked if he knew her current rank. Angelica was in the 9th, because in the past months he wasn't able to raise her rank, so she was also rushing to compete. However, Rick was noticeably quiet as as he was still processing the fiancé thing. When he finally realized it, he gasped in shock. Angelica couldn't believe how slow his brain was, so she explained it pertained to her family's situation as nobles. Snape acquired the right to sponsor someone in the tournament. Angelica was certain he was aiming to fix a match. Snape would have a strong athlete to compete, so the spectators would be impressed. He would wager a large amount of money on that athlete's opponent, and when his athlete purposely loses, Snape would get a huge fortune. Angelica thought Snape must be up to something because he was gathering money and trying to connect with the nobles. To stop Snape's plan, she had to defeat his sponsored athlete before he could fix the match. Angelica suddenly thought that Snape's athlete must be Giz. She was getting frustrated because Giz had defeated Blizz in a single blow. Rick called her and asked if she would like him to train her, but his eyes were saying a murder was about to happen. On Angelica's first training day, she prepared early. She stretched her arms as the two walked. Rick reminded her that her training would be harsher than she could imagine, so he asked if she was okay with it. Angelica told him she had already prepared herself, so Rick asked how many matches she needed until the tournament. Angelica only had 3 left since Taylor dropped out. She moved up in the ranks but was still 3 points short. She reminded him she withdrew from the match against him 3 days ago, so she only had 2 matches left and must won them by knockout. Rick nodded and the two went off, marching to the middle of an open field. Angelica panted for air after running about 20 kilometers. Rick excused himself, and the last thing she knew, her extremities were chained with 30 kilograms each. She asked for an explanation for it, but Rick ignored her question and told her not to slack on her strengthening magic. She screamed like she was about to give birth to a giraffe, as Rick ran at the speed of light, dragging her by the rope on their waists. She wondered how they ran faster than her blink step, and if her feet were still intact. Rick smiled and told her someone would pull her faster than her to accustomize her body to fast movements. Angelica was crying and whining during the whole training, while Rick reminisced about the days when his face cleaned the floor while Lynette dragged him. After 6 hours of running endlessly, Angelica fell flat on the floor, extremely exhausted. Tears were unconsciously going down, as she thought that her legs felt weird, and that she was certain her legs had been torn off ages ago. However, Rick suddenly took off, dragging her again. She begged for a few seconds of rest, but he told her this would be the best time to push her limits and run for 6 more hours. After a few more hours of running, Rick smiled and commended her for doing a great job on her first day of training, because he died 3 times on his first day. Angelica smirked and told him she survived his training, but she froze when Rick told her it was only their morning training and that they would continue after the lunch break. She trembled as she tried to stop him, but he waved goodbye and walked away. 5 days had passed, and as she ate her meal, she came up with the idea that she would give up. The room may be quiet, but inside her head she was screaming from the PSTD caused by the torture Rick did to her. She sighed and realized that he certainly endured worse for 2 years. Rick called him and was glad to find her finally. He greeted her, sat before her, and looked at those biceps. Damn, that's bigger than my brain. Anyways, Angelica asked if he had come to scold her, but he said no. He added that he knew she wanted to run away, because he also thought of running away in his years of training. He grinned like a maniac as he thought of the moments before he perished each time. That endless pain he experienced. There was one time when Blowstone was low on mana, so Alicet helped him. When he came back to life, he gasped for air and asked if he perished again. Blowstone told Rick. Alicet gave him mana to revive him 2,000 more times. He told him to stand up with his horrifying face. Rick added that even if he decided that regret would be better, Blowstone would only send him off amiably. Hearing those words would always make him feel better. Angelica looked at the table as she said that she had received training as a noble lady since she was born. The social etiquette, dance, makeup, and dresses. She slammed the table and angrily said it did not fit her at all. She gritted her teeth and said she was only born to be a wife and bear children. She didn't like it because she wanted to support the Diramudo family by becoming the strongest knight. She stood up and said she was still on her current suffering. She walked and looked back at him and said she would meet him at the same spot. Rick nodded and said he would go after he ate. After their meal, the two met in the open field. Angelica gasped in shock because Rick had arrived before her. They worked on the basics for the past few days, and now they would train her fighting style. Since she uses a knight's sword, he tells her to use her techniques barehandedly. She may have had a better win if she had used the sword, but it was against the rule. Rick pointed to his side and said Lynette would teach her to turn the bare hand into a sword. Lynette and Angelica greeted each other. After 20 days of endless training, Angelica managed to survive. The tournament day had arrived. The arena was buzzing with the crowd's screams. A man named Silva Helgen was Angelica's opponent, but everyone noticed that something strange had happened to Angelica. Just take a look at her. She looks like a savage berserk monkey. The commentator above pointed out the different auras and looks of the famous elegant knights they had ever known. The man beside her added that Angelica might not win this round because she lost her elegance in fighting, but as soon as the match started, Angelica screamed and sent a flying kick at Silva Helgen. He coughed out blood after he got crushed between the wall and Angelica's kick. The commentator froze, snotting in shock. Everyone went silent as they announced the winner. Angelica growled and screamed, "My goodness, they're creating another monster." Rick smiled and proudly said Angelica's training was enough, but that enough was enough to make her crazy. The referee tried to stop and pull her away, but she was screaming some word salad. Now that Angelica had won this battle, the next part of the tournament was the raffle to pair off the athletes. At this moment, the Alexander Central Coliseum was filled with thousands of people, and the tournament host introduced the 16 15 elite fighters who had won several grand battles. This would also be part where they would draw to match the fighters. The fighters who managed to get to this tournament were lined up, and their names would be matched through a lot of draw. Angelica's name was called, so she rustled through the box and pulled out a paper. She handed it to the man, and showed everyone the number 14. Her name flashed on the screen, and when Rick's name was called, he pulled a number, and got the number 12. Rick thought that if he went against Angelica, it would be in the semi-finals. The brackets were down to half, and when the undefeated champion's name was called, Kelvin Ervolf, the crowd was screaming and clapping hands for him. Angelica suddenly frowned, and thought Gis was supposed to be called first, not Kelvin. The champion drew the number 1 card. When Blowstone was called, the crowd also went wild because of the image he left from the matches he did recently. Rick started sweating, and thought he would withdraw immediately if he got paired with his teacher. He blew an air out of relief when Blowstone got the number 7. Gis's name was the first to be called. When the sponsored athletes were called, he sighed as he walked to the front and commented that things were getting boring. He rummaged inside the box, and when he pulled out a piece of paper, he left it hanging in the air. Angelica saw the man pull something out of his pocket and act like he caught the paper with that same hand. The man flashed the number 15, making Angelica smirk as she already knew Snape was behind this. To make it difficult to match with the champion, the man who was reading the numbers switched out the papers to move the champions and Blowstones. He scoffed and called Snape a foul man, but this would be a good chance for Angelica. The following day, the names of the fighters were posted on the bulletin board. The host had officially opened the Fist Kings tournament, and the first pair was Kelvin versus Eddie Grace. Blowstone and Rick sat together to see the champion's capabilities. When Eddie and Kelvin faced each other, Eddie immediately made the first move. Kelvin did not budge as he knew Eddie would do a feint, and as he expected, he did a feint, so he swung his fist towards him and landed it straight on his cheek. That clean hit took the wind out of Eddie's sails with the help of his quick reaction. Blowstone said that Kelvin's special nose might be troublesome. Their race's sense of smell was several times better than that of a human, and Kelvin used to sense his opponent's movements. Kelvin was not finished and jumped toward Eddie to smash his face on the ground. Eddie was knocked out, and Kelvin Ervolf was the match's winner. Blowstone smiled a little and got excited to match with him on Tinder. I mean in the matches. When Blowstone was up for the next match, he easily and quickly ended the match with a single punch. RIP for the audience. Rick made the guy whose body was forcibly turned into a centrifuge. Now all of his blood and bits are separated. Angelica, as usual, flashed her dark cave. After their first match, they sat on the bleachers to wait for the last pair for the first match. Gis Lizarect and Herman Muller. Their physique was significantly different. Gis started their match with a deep yawn, but Herman took this opportunity to land a punch on him. Herman cursed him and told him not to play around. He followed up multiple blows at the different parts of G's body, but was not moved from his standing point. Gis sighed in annoyance and swung his arm at him. Herman tilted his head to the side and smirked, proud of his reaction. The impact of Gis's swing created a loud sound that startled Herman. The host commended G's physical strength. Herman started sweating cold, but he shoved his doubts away and threw multiple attacks at his opponent again. Angelica watched how G's was responding, and wondered how many blows he would take to knock him down. She added that Herman defeated her by knockout the last time. Herman was getting frustrated, as he poured all of his strength into his fists. G's sighed and said he was getting thirsty, so he lifted his fist and smacked the hell out of this annoying worm tickling him. His fist smashed the ground, and the impact shattered the floor. The smoke screen coming from the attack made Herman lose sight of his opponent. G's swung his arm around in a glimpse, and was glad it hit the worm's face. Herman took the hit, and was crushed on a wall, knocked out. The host couldn't believe how strong the sponsored athlete was. The audience was screaming his name, cheering for him, but G's cussed and thought the people were so loud. Snape smiled and thought G's was in a good mood. Rick finds G's strange because he is powerful and tough, but moves like a beginner. The two walked to the hallway and came across G's, who was gulping down his drink. Angelica said that G's seemed to be pretty calm about tomorrow's match. G's was confused and asked who she was, so she told him she would be his opponent tomorrow. He paused for a moment and said he now remembered her because of Snape. He added that he would avoid her face to keep her face intact for her wedding, making Angelica grit her teeth in annoyance. G's turned and reminded her not to use a pointless amount of hard work. Angelica raised her voice as she stopped him and asked if he still had any respect left for other gladiators. G scoffed and said he had none. He said that those idiots trained so much yet were weak as worms. Angelica said there was no way he could have a body like that without training, but to their shock, G's revealed that he was born that way. Before leaving, he told Angelica to stop being assertive and behave herself for tomorrow's match. Angelica started shaking in anger when G said he would also avoid her stomach so she could have kids with Snape. She cursed him and said he would beat the heck out of him. On the second day of the Fist King tournament, Raichik's teachers saw him and called his attention. He walked to them. Eldwarf said they came because they wanted to cheer on him, but Raichi knew he only went there for food and women. A voice suddenly called him, and it was Snape, asking if the seat next to him was available. He said it was empty, so he sat, making Rick wonder why he wasn't in a VIP seat. seat. He assumed that Rick had already understood why there was a match between his brother and fiancé. When the match between Angelica and Gid was announced, he suddenly felt dizzy. Although Angelica noticed it, she knew she shouldn't let her guard down before him. When the match had officially begun, she used a flash step towards him and landed a kick on his xiphoid area. But to her shock, it did nothing. Gid got annoyed because she didn't listen to his advice yesterday. Angelica immediately moved to dodge his fist, and luckily, he managed to survive that fatal blow. She slid to the side and did a side kick, thinking she could cause damage, but Gid suddenly stretched his arm to her. Angelica used her flash step to avoid it. She glided on the floor as she landed. The commentators said Angelica was leading Gid by the nose and was impressed by her usage of strengthening magic. Gid scratched his head in annoyance. Angelica asked why he participated and if he was just annoyed. She thought Gid wasn't a person who would agree to his brother's requests. He replied, saying he had his own goals. Angelica realized her blows weren't damaging him at all. She looked at the bleachers and saw Lynette cheering on her. She smirked and Gid was surprised to see her aura change. Angelica said she would show him why he shouldn't mock her hard work, and dashed with her flash step, infusing her mana inverse reflection. This was what Lynette taught her, the technique to turn the bare hand into a sword. That day, Rick told her movements would be much faster, so he asked Lynette to demonstrate them. And in a blink of an eye, Lynette slashed her arm, and simultaneously, the big rock was sliced in half. Angelica was in awe by how Lynette used her hands without using magic. Lynette said that cutting thread was one of the techniques used in body control. When Rick told her they would teach her that, Angelica exclaimed they were asking for too much from an ordinary human. Lynette told her it was not too much, and that even Rick could do it. Angelica tried to slash a paper but he failed. Rick told her she was only starting, so this shouldn't shake her. She looked at the paper and thought that if she could master this, she would become noticeably stronger. It is a now or never situation. So when she learned it, she felt the air and lightly swung at the very tip, and successfully slashed Giz with the cutting thread. Giz gasped in shock because a cut on his side gushed blood. Snape couldn't believe Angelica was able to cut through Giz's skin. Lynette commented that Angelica was a natural and learned the difficult technique on her own. She even incorporated her mana inverse reflection. Eldwarf said it was like closing the opening of a running hose and opening it to allow a greater release of magic. Rick thought that it might strain her, but due to her hellish training, it was nothing to sneeze at. Her flash step improved by 120%, and with her cutting thread, this became her killer move. Giz growled and cursed her. He smashed the ground and released the smoke screen. His huge hand came out of the smoke and his nail was only a few inches away from her eyeballs, so she used her flash step Rin to move away from him. She noticed that Giz didn't expect that she could dodge it, so she decided to release a counterattack. She used her flash step Rin with mana inverse reflection, but when she swung her arm in the air for the cutting thread, everyone gasped in shock. Giz talked to who was standing behind her. Before she could even turn, his fist landed on her side and threw her off the ground. Giz apologized to Snape for hurting the bothersome small fry, but Angelica's blood boiled in anger when she was called a small fry. Giz said that they may have thought that Snape was trying to make himself lose on purpose, but he was aiming to win this battle. Snape chuckled and said he had already bet a fortune on his brother. He had already planned to make Giz look weak so his opponent could drop their guard. Rick figured Snape was awfully confident in his brother's strength. Snape quit being a gladiator because of Giz. When Giz was 8, Snape had already begun to make a name for himself, but his younger brother thoroughly beat him. Giz was a natural genius and a true monster indeed. Angelica's strength was deteriorating slowly, so Giz looked at her and told her that no matter how long she trained, she should hold a grudge against her mommy and daddy for giving birth to her with no talent. He scoffed and added that trash parents gave birth to trash. Angelica screamed in anger and thought Giz had been looking down on people's hard work when he had never worked hard himself. She activated her continuous flash step and Giz got sick of seeing it, so he decided to copy it and run beside her. Angelica flinched in shock to see him beside her running, but Giz pulled her hair and threw her off the momentum. She grunted when she crushed on the wall and coughed out blood. Giz started laughing devilishly and said this feeling rushing inside his body was the best feeling. He added that he liked to trample everyone in their misery. Angelica was wobbling as she tried to stand, but Rick already knew she had gone past her limits. Angelica stepped on her shaking foot and wanted to fight because she didn't want to lose to someone like him. She was crying in pain, physically and mentally, but Giz was getting pissed to see her trying to fight, making him want to kill her. He rushed towards her with his sharp long nails. Rick's heart was pounding as he screamed to call the referee to stop him, but the referee was too late. Giz was already in the air, but his eyes widened when his attack was pushed to the side. Angelica lost consciousness and fell on the floor. Giz was still wondering why his attack was missed, and noticed the smoking shoe that fell on the floor. He figured he was hit by it, so he looked at where it came from and frowned his brows when he saw who threw it. Rick was the one who threw it, and his aura was different. He had portrayed a kind and patient character, but this situation broke it and made him this. Poor lizard boy will meet a true monster that will cook him to a crispy lizard with soy sauce. Angelica was brought to the infirmary on a stretcher. Lynette said she couldn't stand seeing a girl getting hurt, but she noticed Rick was gone. Alicette said that Rick was so mad with her tiny voice, but Eldwarf scoffed, saying that the lizard was the type that pissed Rick off the most, so they felt bad for the next opponent. When Rick was walking, he came across Gistel. The lizard called him, saying he was the one who threw the shoe when he had finally got his hands on some amazing prey. Rick wasn't talking, keeping himself composed, but Gist didn't like it. He screamed at him and told him to talk. He tried to kick Rick, but in a glimpse, Rick was a few meters away. He told him to be patient, since he would send him flying in front of the spectators tomorrow. He walked away, and left Gist pissed as hell. Out of anger, he smashed the wall. Poor wall. Gist squinted and said he would be looking forward to their match. Nicholas told his friend that Rick had come out. His friend chuckled and asked why he kept on betting on Rick. He added that he should be voting on someone like Blowstone, who was winning in a flashier way. Nicholas said that was the mindset of an amateur, because flashiness doesn't equal strength, and Rick has reserved strength. His friend commented that Rick might have a bad matchup today, since he was going up against Michelangelo. This person may be young, but he's in a league of his own in terms of ability. Nicholas scoffed and said that the kid was only there for the money. His friend chuckled and said he would treat him to a drink with the money he would win. Nicholas suddenly noticed Rick's aura had changed. He wondered what happened. When the match had begun between Michael and Rick, the kid noticed he was pretty mad, and told him it would be a drawback to get so heated over a money-earning tournament, but Rick ignored him. When Michael activated his 7th order magic with his palm, in a split second, his skull was smashed by Rick's steel hard punch. The impact created a ripple effect on the floor and shattered it to pieces. Everyone in the Coliseum dropped their jaw open in shock. Eldwarf chuckled as he saw what he expected. Poor little guy, he would be staying in the hospital for a few months after this, I guess. The host had officially announced the winner, and the crowd went wild. Everyone was clapping and cheering on Rick. Nicholas laughed joyously and said that was Rick's real strength. After his match, Rick immediately rushed out and went to the infirmary to check on Angelica. The nurse told him to calm down and that Angelica was having a bit of a rough time with the treatment. He looked through a window and saw her unconscious on the bed. Rick knew she might be frustrated after losing at that lizard with the hellish training she had gone through. Rick spoke like he was talking to her and told her to come back tomorrow to watch his match with Gis. Meanwhile, the people inside the Coliseum were screaming because Blowstone extended his record of punching his opponents. The undefeated champion came next, and he easily won the match, as expected. The host officially announced the top 4 who reached this point. Rick would be going up against Gis, and his teacher Blowstone would go up against Kelvin. After the event, Rick left the city and trained his power in the middle of nowhere. He continued practicing and polishing his skills, and when the tournament's 3rd day arrived, the Coliseum was packed. Rick was walking down the hall when he froze and saw Angelica approaching him. She couldn't look at him in the eye in embarrassment. He asked how he felt, so she told him Blowstone healed her. She took a deep breath and apologized to him. Rick was surprised when she started sobbing as she said that his hard work in training her had gone down the drain. She felt guilty for wasting his time on a talentless person like her. She wiped her tears and said she always had to prove that she could grab hold of her dream with her own power. She wondered if she should just listen and marry Snape so she could live easily. Rick knew she worked hard without complaining and admitted this was his fault for not seeing Gishti's strength, so he told her to watch this match closely. She tried to stop and explain it, but Rick was gone. Angelica walked to the bleachers and was surprised to see Snape sitting beside them. He smiled and told Angelica not to treat him a bit more fondly, since they would marry in a few days. Blowstone butted in and told Snape that Gishti's win wasn't decided yet, but Snape was so certain his brother would win despite being aware of how strong Rick was. Snape suddenly asked them who they thought would win without bias, but the 4 of them simultaneously said Rick's name. The people were watching very closely for Rick and Gishti's match in this semi-final round. When the match began, Gist asked how the woman he beat yesterday was doing as he wanted to apologize. Gist sighed and said if he didn't interrupt them she wouldn't have to live a miserable life, suffering because she had no talent. Gist told him to forfeit to make things easier for a commoner like Rick. Rick ignored him. Gist tells him to show him the scrappy result of his hard work, but his words were cut when that hard slap landed on his thick face. Everyone was holding their breath at this moment. Gist grunted as he coughed out blood. He got pushed back for a few meters, and when he caught the momentum, he stopped. He held his head, cursing Rick. He didn't think a commoner could also knock a genius like this. Rick told him that he could keep punching someone who looked pathetic. Gist cursed as he massaged his jaw. He glared at Rick and told him not to get cocky, so when he charged towards Rick for a powerful blow, his attack was dodged. Rick lifted his arm and hit his abdomen. Gist groaned in pain and moved away from him. Blowstone smirked and seemed to be proud of his student. Angelica was confused about what Rick did, so Blowstone explained it was an internal blow. She was even more confused, so Eldwarf said it was a technique that applied the impact of the blow not to the outside, but to the opponent's inside. Angelica noticed Snape so calm, so he sighed and said this wasn't enough to shake Gis's victory, and that the situation would only worsen for Rick. When Gis recovered, Rick mocked him, asking if he was giving up. Snape added that his brother was usually in play mode, but now they would be witnessing the true frightening side of Gis. Gis lifted his hand and used the strengthening magic unique to Dragonborn, the Dragon Force. He threw the question back to Rick and asked if he wanted to surrender, but he did not respond. Gis immediately charged, and in a split second, he was already before his eyes. Luckily, Rick raised his guard up on time, but the impact threw him off. Gis did not let this second go and followed up an attack mid-air, but Rick dodged it. The wall it hit exploded and shattered to pieces. Rick tried to run to make some distance. When he noticed Gis was right behind him, he changed his momentum and let Gis pass, but it was a wrong wrong decision. Gis smelled his movement and kicked his face. He was thrown in the air. Angelica couldn't believe Gis could respond that quickly to Rick's feint, but Snape explained that Gis was a natural, and that was how capable he was. Blowstone added that their dragon force takes up quite a bit of mana. Snape smirked and said Gis had not once trained his mana, and was only born with this capacity. Rick sighed and said he suffered so much because he was born in a small mana reserve, but Gis told him to complain to his garbage parents. When Rick rushed to him, Gis activated his iron body, so when Rick released the internal blow, it did nothing to him. Gis moved for his counterattack. He swung his arm for a cutting thread, and Rick was surprised to see a cut on his cloth. Gis managed to travel through behind him, and when Rick was about to turn, Gis released an internal blow at him. Rick fell to the ground, and Angelica was in disbelief at how Gis easily copied those moves. Gis told Rick that he could replicate a move once he saw it. Snape told them that this was the reason why he was able to keep calm. Out of nowhere, Gis started laughing devilishly, mocking Rick and calling him a garbage commoner. He told him to get up because he couldn't enjoy tormenting somebody who looked pathetic. Nicholas and everyone went silent as they watched Rick get beaten up by Gis. When Rick fell to the ground, Gis noticed the crowd went silent. He thought a genius like him beating a commoner was too obvious and didn't excite them. Snape said that it was obvious that the four of them were wrong. Blowstone looked at him and asked what he was talking about. Snape reminded him that they said Rick would win this match, but Blowstone figured out how Snape was looking into the match's situation. Snape was confused, so Blowstone said the current situation was irrelevant. He called Angelica and told her how she saw this match was important. When Gis landed another punch at Rick, he was noticeably sweating and panting for air. Rick sighed and said Gis was now finally running out of breath. Gis was shocked after realizing he was intentionally trying to exhaust him and noticed Rick didn't have a drop of blood after those attacks. Rick said it was a body manipulation technique called fluid body to spread the impact throughout his body. Gis's stamina had been slowly chipping away, so he got mad at Rick for cutting the corners the whole time. Rick had been going all out to hold himself back to Angelica's physical level. Angelica was shocked by what she heard. That's a new way to flex. Lower his power to his opponent's last defeated foe and still beat his ass. Eldwarf chuckled as he remembered that slap and said that was just Rick being angry. Blowstone told her that winning this match wasn't important because he wanted to show Angelica her own potential. Basically, Rick wanted to make Angelica imagine this as herself against Gis. The lizard couldn't believe a commoner dared to mess around with him and said he would exterminate him quickly. Rick replied, telling him to move according to how much stamina he had left. Gis ignored him and activated his iron body and sturdy fist. He moved forward with a blink step Ren that he copied from Angelica. Rick sighed and said his sloppy copying would be useless. When Gis released his attack, Rick moved below him and released a fatal internal punch at his abdomen. Gis couldn't even make a sound from the pain he felt and dropped to his knees. Rick looked at him and said this happened because he never trained to the point of exhaustion. Gis's voice shook in disbelief. The host said he had been driven to his knees, making Snape wonder if Rick possessed more talent than Gis. However, the four teachers all said that Rick was only an average guy, so Angelica was shocked and wondered how little talent Rick had for them to say those things. Blowstone said a unique skill may be called a talent, but the activation requirements were rare. Snape asked how Rick managed to overwhelm a super genius like Gis. Angelica had finally gotten it. She might have gone through hellish training, but she was able to acquire the same relative amount of strength. Rick went through even more since he trained 20 times longer than she did, and the result was unfathomable. Gis had never experienced exhaustion, so he didn't know how to move while he was fatigued. Rick told him that those hard workers he looked down on continued to train no matter how exhausted they may be, and that true strength came after exhaustion. Gis cursed as he charged his fist toward him, but Rick caught it and immediately used the internal strike. The impact flowed through his arms, and when it reached his system he fell on the floor. He told him that even without working, he was just strong, but in terms of geniuses, he was still a newborn level 1 genius. He added that the truly gifted take the body and intuition they were born with and work hard to polish their talent, because he had seen those people who had done that, and those are his teachers. He told him he might lose to him like this, but if Gis went against his teachers, he would be blown to bits in a second, and the world would be huge. He reached this far out of luck, but hearing these words annoyed Gis more. He screamed and exclaimed that he would slaughter him and those people whom he called stronger. He screamed as his body twitched, changing his form. His muscles increased twice, and he appeared more powerful than before. Snape said that Gis had called on his origin, the Earth Dragons, to attain this form. Gis was growling as he glared at Rick. He rapidly crashed his thick fist against Rick, which made him tighten his grit. Rick grunted from the impact. He was blown away despite using the fluid body. Angelica was sweating cold and thought he wouldn't survive that attack if it were her. Rick imitated the blink step Rin and landed an internal strike at him, but Gis mocked him that some fly was buzzing around trying to sting him. Rick noticed he had not activated the iron body, yet Gis's body was as hard as a metal. He scooted down when Gis suddenly swung his arm. He gritted his teeth and noticed his attacks had gotten faster, but he was caught off guard when Gis used his tail for a follow-up attack. Angelica could barely follow a single punch and thought if Rick kept using her physical ability to face Gis, winning would be impossible at this point. Rick stood up and commended his blessed body. He finally figured that Angelica couldn't beat him no matter what. Angelica may have no chance of winning because of his current status, but knowing her, she wouldn't afford to give up, and it was exactly for those times that one should train oneself until death. breath. He closed his eyes to embody Angelica's strength after 6 months, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Gis was dumbfounded and became alert. When he noticed him from behind, he swung his arm to the back, but it was too late for him. He internalized Angelica's strength for 9 months of training and released a powerful internal strike. Gis groaned and tried to catch him, but she would be this fast after 12 months of training with Angelica. Maybe faster than Sonic. Snape couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Angelica finally realized that Rick had been using the same skills she had to demonstrate her strength. If she continued that hellish training for a year, Rick told him that he wouldn't be able to overcome the difference in the physical ability they were both born with, but winning would require another year of training. After coming this far, he asked which way her scale tipped. Angelica pressed her fist on her forehead and exclaimed that she was only born with a scale that tips one way. She thought that even if it may take a year to reach this point, she hoped Rick would patiently wait for her and show him that she could catch up to him. Now that's how a master should shower his disciple. At this point, Giz was getting overwhelmed by Rick's speed. He was getting exhausted and drained. Rick told him that he would only win if he fought him with the will to die as a beast. But that was the effort Giz was looking down on commoners. Giz scoffed, cursed him, and asked why a genius like him should act pathetically. Rick knew his pride was getting in the way, but in his heart he had already given up. Upon hearing those, Giz got furious and made a desperate charge at him. Rick sighed as he saw this. Rick would send him home, and just like how Angelica said, the trick was to feel the air and lightly swing at the very tip. In a blink, Rick released the cutting thread at him while traveling. The wound opened and gushed out blood. He sighed because he could perfect the cut just like how Lynette's. Giz would have been sliced in two on the spot if it was her. That concludes the match between the lizard and Rick. Snape was still in a state of shock, trying to sink in what had happened to his brother and his money. Rick said Giz should be glad that his match with Angelica wasn't a year from that day. He looked to the side and raised his thumb up at Angelica. This man may be a giga-chad. The author doesn't nerf him, he nerf himself. Giz was brought to the infirmary immediately after a few seconds. The crowd was still screaming the intense fight. Angelica faces Snape and asks why he doesn't look upset after his brother's fall and his money. Snape was also surprised at his reaction, but a part of him wanted to see Giz getting denied. His existence was completely denied as a gladiator because of Giz's overwhelming talent, and seeing him lose somehow relieved Snape. He looked at her and said he regretted that he wouldn't be able to marry her, but Angelica called him a sore loser, a man whom he wouldn't marry. Snape shook his head and said it wasn't related to his plan, but just being able to marry an amazing woman like her was her dream. He suddenly realized his statement was embarrassing, so he excused himself to leave. Angelica was surprised by the revelation and wondered if she was really that dragon-like. Blowstone stood up because his turn was finally up. Let us go back from 7 years from that day. In a city where chaos and cruelty were evident, people who were weak and defenseless were taken advantage of. A man walking by commented that this city was far from Heracutopia. He couldn't believe a lawless place existed. The two men came there to see the starving wolf of the slum and scout him for the tournament. When they arrived at the house, they almost prayed that that man wouldn't be starving yet. The moment they peeked inside, they saw a tall pile of lifeless bodies. The wolf immediately noticed their presence. The man was shocked to see the stacked poor bodies, but the eye-patched man remained focused on him and asked if he was the wolf of the slum. The wolf nodded and asked if some more gang members went there to try to exterminate him, but he was shocked when they said no. He smirked as he noticed the strong aura coming from the two. The eye-patched man knew the wolf's race was strong, but had a low magic affinity. Just by looking at him, one can see the overwhelming aura he possesses. He asked who they were, and added that it would be nice if they were a cleaning crew. The eye-patched man said he was the owner of a gym, and came there to personally scout him. The wolf was dumbfounded, so he explained that his fist had a purpose, and invited him to Heracutopia, where he could eat if he could win against stronger people. The wolf chuckled and thought his offer was interesting, and that was how Kelvin's name came to shine under the spotlight. Going back, he was walking down the hallways for the semi-finals when a woman asked how he felt. Kelvin told them it was his duty as the champion to win and drive the fans crazy. The woman wasn't satisfied with his answer, and asked how he felt inside his heart, so Kelvin faced them and said his body adjusts to his opponent's strength, and that he was excited if his opponent would be stronger to show them his perfect form. Rick had just arrived in the bleachers. His friends and teachers greeted him, but he was surprised when Angelica faced him and bowed. She thanked him for everything he had taught her, so Rick told her he just won his match for his goals. Angelica smiled, and when the crowd screamed like crazy, they looked below and saw Kelvin smiling at the crowd. Angelica was surprised to see the people's reaction upon Kelvin's entrance. Blowstone would be his match, and most people had been waiting for this match. The two stood there staring at each other, but everyone gasped when the wall nearby exploded. Kelvin immediately put his guard up and saw Gis growling as he came out of the hole. Snape's jaw dropped as he figured Gis had lost consciousness, and went wild because the dragon's blood was controlling his head. Gis was running towards Kelvin, but remained calm and stopped him with his bare hand. He smirked and thought Gis's attack was heavier than he expected. In the blink of an eye, Gis was sent flying and crashed on the wall he had ruined earlier. Kelvin chuckled and said it was not bad, but not enough to interrupt his match. Angelica was shocked to see how the undefeated champion crushed Gis with one blow. Rick said Gis's strength was a top A-ranker adventurer, so he knew Kelvin may have already begun to step foot into the realm of S-rank. Blowstone smiled and said Kelvin seemed to be well, feel. He replied saying that he never felt this good. The host calmed the audience and introduced the adventurers who were competing. This match is for Kelvin Erwolf and Blowstone Ashork. Kelvin smirked as he noticed the orc was standing like a rod and had no single gap in his defense. So when the match had officially begun, Kelvin did not waste a second and made the first attack. He dashed towards Blowstone and deployed multiple punches that were invisible to the naked eye. Blowstone did not move an inch and let Kelvin release his tantrums at him, but when Kelvin swung his leg at him, Blowstone raised his arm to block it. Kelvin glided on the floor, so he made a follow-up attack, but Blowstone caught it without even looking at it. He swung his arm, making Kelvin flip in the air. Kelvin turned his body and dragged his weight on his leg to smash his opponent, but Blowstone blocked it. When he landed on the floor, he was shocked to see his fist before his face, so he rapidly moved to the side to dodge it. Luckily, that blow was missed because it would have been fatal. The people watching gasped. Kelvin laughed excitedly and told Blowstone he was the strongest opponent he ever had. Finally, a worthy opponent. Their battle will be legendary. Never forget that Blowstone's role in their party is probably tank, so Kelvin would be digging his own grave. There was a moment of silence. The host was so excited after witnessing action for only a few seconds that it made the stadium roar. Rick analyzed the battle. The champion's attacks were blocked a few times, but luckily he managed to dodge Blowstone's perfect attack with his sense of smell. Angelica noticed that Blowstone had always purposefully taken the first punch from his opponent, but this time he blocked them. Rick told her his teacher could go for a KO, but he probably realized Kelvin would just dodge it. Even Kelvin knew that if he took that hit directly, his brain would be scattered by now. After the exchange of blows, Kelvin had finished analyzing him and thought Blowstone had high stats in every category. He asked why he hadn't moved a foot and if he was trying to give him a handicap. Blowstone looked at his foot and realized he hadn't moved his foot and told him he wasn't planning on giving him a handicap. Kelvin chuckled and said he would make him run around in no time. He thought he had to do something about his strong guards, so he dashed toward him and released strong punches at him. He swung his right arm back and used his rolling fang technique. The speed of that attack was so super that it made Blowstone flinch in shock. He was about to block it, but that split second wouldn't be enough, so he tilted his head to the left to dodge it. Kelvin smirked upon seeing his reaction. Angelica said that technique would intentionally match his opponent's guard and then knock their arm to the side. When Kelvin went in for another batch of punches, Angelica was shocked to see an intense barrage. Kelvin was mixing his punches, feints, and rolling fangs together without any pattern, but every attack was deflected and blocked by Blowstone. Kelvin smirked and sneaked a swing under, but he sniffed something off. He groaned as he moved to the side upon seeing Blowstone's fist rushing towards him. A loud explosion was heard when that force touched the ground. Kelvin was starting to sweat. He was aiming for an opening after forcing Blowstone to block, but he did not expect that he would also take advantage when he kicked him. Blowstone knew that taking that kick wouldn't do much damage, so they launched an attack. Kelvin had a crack in his rib from that impact. He analyzed him again, but his stats were over the limits. Even Kelvin's manager was shocked to see Blowstone's strength. Angelica noticed Rick getting silent, so Rick said that there was something about the champion's movements bothering him. Blowstone sighed and asked him in a low voice that only Kelvin could hear. He asked why he kept on holding back. That question caught Kelvin off guard. Angelica frowned her brows because she couldn't hear what the two were talking about. Kelvin asked what made him think like that, so Blowstone said the question kept lingering inside his head whenever he watched Kelvin's matches. He added that there might be an effect of motivation and adrenaline against a strong opponent. Still, he asked if there was a fighting ability that conveniently adjusts itself so he would have a good match. Even if Kelvin could hold himself back against a weak opponent, it shows that if he fought against someone like Blowstone, he should be feeling something off. Kelvin sighed and said this was the first time he had ever felt somebody so good in 4 years, so Blowstone asked again why he had to hold back. Kelvin paused momentarily and said he couldn't fight seriously anymore. That day when Kelvin first arrived at Herakutopia, he was amazed by the people, the place, and everything else because he had been born and raised in the slums. He left the slums easily because no one was holding him back from leaving that area, and the only greeting he could get there was that of guys slugging each other. The manager knew getting used to the city would be tough, but they had to do something about his filthy getup. When they arrived at the Red Rings gym, his manager said that it might not be that big, but they had strong fighters that reached the top 4 in the King Fists tournament. Kelvin smirked and asked where the fighters were. The manager called someone and asked him to be Kelvin's partner. When he was preparing, he asked about the rule, and the only rule was no use of weapons or armor. He smiled as the match began, and told his partner not to get mad if he hurt him, but ended up kissing the floor after the match. Kelvin's partner won. He apologized for hurting him, and hopped off the ring. He may not be able to beat the top 4, but the manager knew Kelvin had greater potential based on his talent and experience. This was Kelvin's first time losing a fight, and for him, fighting was his ultimate pleasure. But since no one in the slums could defeat him, beating those guys made him bored. Now that he kept losing, he trained his butt off, and to win a fight, he met a stronger person, so he lost again. He trained harder and tried to win as much as possible by eating delicious foods he had never seen before. After a year of continuous training, Kelvin managed to get into the Fist King tournament and make it to the finals. His manager reminded him that he would be going against a 2-time reigning king. He nodded and knew to himself he wouldn't lose, so when he was up he walked down the tunnel. When the match had begun, it only took a matter of seconds and left the audience speechless. Kelvin easily defeated the champion, and he did not feel any happiness because he would go through endless endless battles. Just give him a belly rub, and he'll surrender. He's from the dog race. This man was suffering from success. That night, the people inside the gym celebrated Kelvin's victory. They were drinking beers and eating in a restaurant nearby. The manager was teased because he would become famous with this. He chuckled, and one of his men chuckled and said the owner may be acting calm, but he was almost crying when Kelvin won. The boys teased him. They were all laughing and enjoying the moment, but Kelvin was staring blankly. The former top 4 noticed him and asked how he was feeling. Kelvin only said that he was tired because he knew from the start of the tournament that what he was doing just worked for him. It was easy for him to defeat his opponent, which made things as boring as those fights in the slums. He had come this far in a year, but knew he still had room to grow stronger. He wondered if he had stopped training back then. He might have been happier and still felt excited about every match. However, he did not stop. When he couldn't get any joy out of fighting, becoming stronger was the one he could enjoy, and meeting his manager's expectations, because he was the person who took him out of the slums. And to pay him back, he trained endlessly. After another year of being a champion, he topped the second tournament once again, but still felt empty. He was aware that this work brought no joy to him, but when he saw the owner so happy for him, he thought that winning this tournament wasn't so bad at all. A year passed, and one day during his session, he broke the gold slime bag and went to fetch a mop to clean the mess. When he was walking, he passed by the owner's office and accidentally heard his name. A man with the glasses said Kelvin's matches hadn't had many viewers because people were getting tired of how he always ends the match in a single blow. If his overwhelming victories continue like this, his popularity will decline. The owner sighed and said it was fine, making the man scratch his head and telling him that other groups and businesses were avoiding him because they didn't want Kelvin in their matches, which would put his gym at risk of bankruptcy. The owner asked if he would suggest fixing Kelvin's matches because he would never do that, and wanted Kelvin to become the strongest champion in history. The owner added that he doesn't care if his gym would come to ruin, and he would rather quit if he had to fix a match. Kelvin couldn't take what he was hearing, so he left. The man asked what took him so long, and he didn't even have a mop. Kelvin stopped and asked why the owner was betting on him too much. The man was caught off guard by the sudden question. He sighed and told him not to tell the owner about what he was about to say. He took a deep breath and said that the owner had a kid in his life, and that kid's personality was alike. His kid dreamed of winning in the tournament, and they all knew he was strong and talented, but he perished before the owner at the age of 19 in an accident. If the owner's kid had lived, he would have been the same age as Kelvin. So ever since then, he took the dream that his son couldn't fulfill and entrusted Kelvin with it. The owner thinks of him as his own son, but the owner hasn't told him because he would make a fuss about it. When he entered the Coliseum the following day, everyone was so quiet. He thought of the situation as pathetic. He finally figured that he didn't want to be the champion if he would only cause trouble to the owner, so he was so occupied thinking about it that he forgot he was in a match. He cursed as he saw the opponent's fist rushing towards him. He moved to the side to dodge it. He could see the movement so slowly, he could dodge it but realized he had to take a hit there. When that blow landed hard on his face, he let his body drop to the floor, making everyone gasp in shock. The people went alive, roaring in disbelief and excitement. Kelvin sighed and thought the people were so happy because he was down. He felt bad for the owner for this, but he didn't want to cause any more trouble. He was no longer the fighter who fought for pleasure, but a fighter who made the crowd happy for the owner's sake. From that moment, Kelvin acted like an athlete who had his ups and downs to get the crowd hype and his fans wild. He holds back his strength and adjusts it to entertain everyone. Kelvin told Blowstone that the result of that made the people more excited and had their gym expanded. Kelvin was an animal, mindlessly using his fist to hurt strangers in the slums, but the owner changed his life and gave value to his fist, and this was the only way he could think of returning that favor. If Kelvin quit acting, everybody would know he had been acting all along, and that's why he couldn't fight Blowstone seriously. This dude should be in WWE if he was like this. Kelvin added that people would be disgusted if they knew about it, but Blowstone told him that he was only prioritizing others over himself, and that was how a pro should be. Kelvin thanked him for understanding his situation and said he would still fight while acting. Blowstone knew it couldn't be helped, so he told him that he would fight using his 2 fingers in response to him. Kelvin was shocked and dumbfounded, so Blowstone said he would also keep his feet from moving to add to his handicap and have a good match. Kelvin scoffed and said they should now have an ordinary battle while both held back. He rapidly ran towards him, and his opponent's fingers blocked his attacks. He couldn't believe that Blowstone really did block his attacks with it, so when he released a rolling fang, he thought he could break through his defense now, but he was wrong. Blowstone caught it between his fingers, lifted him in the air, and flipped him on the floor. Kelvin screamed in pain from the impact. When Blowstone lifted his fingers and was about to pierce it through his abdomen, Kelvin jumped to dodge it on time. He glided backward and thought Blowstone was trying to crush him while holding back. He wondered what would happen if the both of them wouldn't hold back. Maybe just join the Orichalcum First Guild and go full out, a promising new member there. He flinched when he heard the owner calling him a dumbass. He turned to him and was shocked to see him screaming, telling him not to look down on his opponent. Kelvin looked at the owner upon hearing his voice. The situation confused the crowd and made them wonder who that pirate-looking man was. Kelvin asked him why and told him their conversation had nothing to do with him, but the owner knew he was lying. He told him not to try to fool him because he knew what they were discussing. He said that raising the strongest fighter in history was his ultimate dream and that his son had nothing to do with this because he wanted Kelvin to become the strongest. He told him to make his dream come true because that was the #1 thing he could do to repay the favor. favor. Kelvin got silent. The owner calmed down as he scoffed and told him to try to beat his opponent before saying that being strong was boring him. Kelvin chuckled and realized what he had to do to make his fans happy and satisfy himself to go all out. It was to beat this monster. He thought that by winning this match, he would make the owner's dream come true. So he sighed, and in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. Blowstone was alerted and rapidly caught his fist with his hand. Kelvin smirked and said Blowstone used his 5 fingers, but he replied that he was just using the appropriate level of defense. Angelica was surprised by the sudden changes in Kelvin's movements, but Rick realized what was happening and thought that if his strength changed this much, even a child could notice the difference. Kelvin knew it, so he thought of being thorough. When Blowstone released a swift punch, Kelvin moved quickly. He glided back while chuckling and mocked him for missing it. He lifted his palm and activated a 5th order flaming magic. A huge flame wave emerged from the ground. Angelica could tell that Kelvin's power was stronger than his brother's. Even the owner didn't know his athlete could do such an amazing thing, so when the surging flame wave approached Blowstone, he stomped his foot and summoned a huge boulder to cover himself. He also placed his hand on it and covered the boulder with his mana to make it fire-resistant and stronger. When the impact landed, the flames slid through the boulder, and Blowstone remained untouched. After the wave of flames, he smiled and commended Kelvin's power. Angelica couldn't believe a dogman like Kelvin could possess such talent, because their race was known to be used only until the 3rd order. Rick commented that Kelvin has an incredible magic talent and a blessed body. He is indeed different from guys, because Kelvin is a true genius, just like Rick's teachers. Angelica felt that Kelvin had been holding back, so Rick suddenly started getting nervous, or he might have already been calculating casualties. Kelvin smirked and started chanting another attack called the Emperor of Lighting, so Blowstone decided to crush the boulder to bits and send it flying toward him. Kelvin activated the flash step to move to the side in a split second to defend himself. Angelica was shocked as he used all the mana he had been weaving into a spiel and diverted it into a flash step. Mid-air, Kelvin activated a 7th order magic, a forest rope that emerged beneath Blowstone and restrained his whole body. Kelvin did not stop there and followed another incantation. An immense amount of magic surrounded him as he activated the 8th order magic. Angelica gasped because only a handful of people could reach that level. A loud rumble was heard in the sky, and when the citizens near the Colosseum saw the huge blazing meteor about to crash the Colosseum, they all screamed in fear and started running away. Rick froze. He was holding his head as he panicked, thinking about what to do because he knew his teacher well. Blowstone would stop holding back at this rate. Kelvin chuckled as he thought his opponent would impossibly evade this vast attack that would also put so many people's lives at risk. Blowstone sighed, and in a few seconds, he ripped the thick vines apart like paper. Kelvin's eyes widened in shock upon seeing how he easily tore it. Blowstone rolled his fingers into a fist and swung it back, putting his weight on it, and when he released it at the surface of the meteor, a blinding light occurred upon the contact, and powerful force from his fist shook the meteor and eventually reaped it to bits. Some of it turned into ashes, but some fell and crashed into the nearby facilities. Just look at our MC, he is sweating in buckets like he has been holding his poop for more than an hour. Kelvin was left speechless and couldn't sink in what he saw. Blowstone commended him and said he shall now respond with his level of strength in kind. Rick pointed out Blowstone's hand gesture, which was called the quarter thumbs up. This gesture indicated a declaration that they would not dodge or block but slug it out, which was pretty common among orcs. In other words, Blowstone would now be pouring his strength on his turn to attack. Kelvin felt a shiver down his spine. His cold sweat dripped. This was his first time feeling this intense fear. Blowstone walked to him with his intimidating aura, but Kelvin fought his fear and decided to cast another 6th order magic Emperor of Lightning. The electric blast flew towards him, but he remained calm and let the vast lightning go past him. His shadow was seen standing firm. Blowstone asked him why he wasn't giving all of his strength, and urged him to attack without holding anything back. Kelvin was still trying to process what happened, but in the blink of an eye, Blowstone's fist was already before him. He gasped and thought he might not be able to dodge it, but luckily, he evaded on time. That powerful blow certainly injured many spectators, though. The owner was surprised that Brownstone wasn't using a single ounce of magic. Everyone's eyes were focused on them. Kelvin's sense of smell wouldn't be useful because Blowstone's movements were fast. He had no choice but to summon all of his magic power. The fire, earth, water, and lightning magic power. The host was in awe by the diverse magic, but that did nothing to this thick-headed orc. Kelvin was getting frustrated because he couldn't even push him back even a centimeter. Rather, he couldn't even make him blink. He gritted his teeth as he thought of another plan. He stepped his foot back and chanted another attack, but the mid-sentence Blowstone was already right before him, and that glimpse of his total death flashed. He knew it would be impossible to dodge it this time. He decided to put up as much defense as he could, so he used the fluid body to disperse the damage while using a blink step to evade, and the rest of his mana to throw a defensive spell. A shield opened up to take the impact from Blowstone's fist, but his eyes widened when it cracked to pieces, and his fist pierced through and landed on his abdomen. This fatal blow made him gasp for air, and his body was blown away. The impact also damaged the surrounding area. Rick knew that with that defense, the damage lowered, but that wasn't enough. Kelvin could feel his flesh and organs throbbing. He was coughing out blood from the damaged organs inside his body. The owner could only call his name and worry, but Kelvin Kelvin couldn't make a sound because of the severe pain he was experiencing. He stared at his opponent for a moment and thought it would be easier if he would just give up, but he remembered wishing for an opponent stronger than him, so he stood up to make his dream come true. Blowstone had been watching him and noticed Kelvin had used up all his strength, but he cut him off and exclaimed that he hadn't given up yet. He screamed and activated 7th Order magic, the Flame Sword, Storm Javelin, Water Hammer, and Lightning Axe all together. The audience was speechless by the powerful magic orders combined together. When the magic was gone, a huge smoke covered the area. Kelvin was chasing his breath when he noticed the status of his mana. When the smoke was swept away, Blowstone was revealed unscathed. He asked if Kelvin had used all his strength, but he denied it and said he still had physical stamina. He screamed as he rushed towards him with his fist, landing multiple attacks on Blowstone's body. Angelica was surprised because that was the fastest barrage infused with his rolling fangs. The owner was still in awe by the impressive strength Kelvin was showing. He was huffing for air and couldn't even move. Blowstone was about to ask if he still had any powers left, but he noticed that Kelvin was slowly losing balance and dropped to his knee. After a moment of silence, the host couldn't believe to see the champion fall on his knees. Kelvin's fans started crying at the result of the match. He knew he was at his limits, and that he was no match for his opponent. He was finally accepting that there was nothing left to do, but he flinched when a young boy screamed, telling him to do his best. The boy kept cheering him with his cracking voice. The crowd looked at the boy and started cheering Kelvin as well. Kelvin was in shock by the reaction of the people towards the result. The owner looked around and started to feel his eyes getting watery. Angelica and Rick were so glad to witness this historical moment. For Kelvin, he was grateful for the people's love despite deceiving them. He took a deep breath and started to howl a little. He stood up slowly and released an echoing howl that lingered around the area. He pushed himself to throw just another punch. He rolled his hand into a fist and covered it with the last bit of his soul, without even knowing that he had given birth to a new technique. The blink step, sturdy fist, and several types of magic wrapped in this rolling fang were poured into his fist, which would be called the Kaite Rasenjeb. The punch of the wolf's bite landed on Blowstone, and the impact was ginormous. When the smoke faded, it revealed that his punch did nothing to Blowstone's body. He nodded and commended his attack, but it was noticeable that his body was pushed back a few inches. Kelvin might have already used all of his strength, but he managed to laugh. Kelvin stood straight and told him that it was the most fun he had ever experienced. Blowstone smiled and told him that his magnificent fighting had his greatest respect. He swung his fist at him, and Kelvin received the blow without evading it. The owner was silent. Kelvin did lose this match, but for him, he was still the strongest gladiator he had ever known. The people started clapping. They were glad to see Kelvin trying his best, and their calming claps were music to Kelvin that made him smile before passing out. And once again, Blowstone was hailed as this match's winner. Kelvin is a true Chad. It looks like Rick will be meeting Blowstone in the finals now. Rick gonna be like an oh freak. Here we go again. Another day to mother father die. 2 years ago, Rick arrived at the Breakheel Castle for the first time. When he got inside, he met Blowstone and offered his hand to shake. Blowstone noticed that Rick had the lowest class of mana, so Rick was surprised that he could already tell just by shaking his hand. Blowstone looked at his body and asked if he knew about the 4 pillars. Rick said yes in response. Blowstone said that he neither has particular talents nor skills, but his unique skill would likely be a conditional activation type. That activation condition would be limited, since he hadn't activated it for the past 20 years. In short, he lacks the skills and talent needed to be an adventurer. Rick sighed and said he was already aware of it. He lifted his gaze and asked if he was trying to tell him to give up, but to his surprise, Blowstone said no. Blowstone said he was just asking if he could endure several hundred times the amount of training of somebody with talent, and that's how Rick started to become an adventurer. Rick looked at the bulletin board and saw his name and his teacher going up to the finals. They went to congratulate his teacher as he walked out. Angelica commented that it was an overwhelming victory. Rick smiled because they had officially obtained another one of the 6 jewels, so when he was about to say he would forfeit, Blowstone cut him off and told him he would be looking forward to their match in the finals. Rick was speechless as he watched his teacher's back. Angelica tried to call his name, but he was starting to shred hair and sweat cold from stress. Bro would be dying for another time, I guess. The following day, the Colosseum was roaring with the numerous people gathered to witness another historical fight. Some of the famous fighters did an exhibition match to entertain the people. Kelvin and the owner went inside one of the rooms. They read the newspaper that says many people were demanding an apology from the former champion for the deception. Still, his fans defended him and said Kelvin was only making the tournament more exciting. Kelvin chuckled and said he was really no match for his fans. They were talking when the door suddenly opened. Blowstone came in, excusing himself and asking how Kelvin's wounds were. Kelvin thanked him because he heard Blowstone had pursued some people criticizing him, but Blowstone told him he was only stating facts. Kelvin added that many people would now aim to take him down, but Blowstone smiled and told him it would be his responsibility to take those people head on. Kelvin smirked and said he was ready for it. After the exhibition, Angelica went to a nearby inn where Lynette and the others were staying. Lynette welcomed and congratulated her for winning the exhibition. Angelica suddenly noticed Rick missing, so she asked where he was. Lynette sighed and said that after Blowstone clarified that he wanted to fight in the finals, Rick shut himself away in his room. Rick was rolled like a sushi and rolling back and forth like he had loose screws. Angelica knocked on his door, telling him to stop acting like a kid, but Rick repeatedly screamed no and said he didn't want to do it. Snape and the other went to his door to persuade him. Snape Snape told him that the people were so worked up in a way totally different than in the usual years, but Rick apologized and said he values his life more than the tournament. Snape sighed and said several hundreds of millions of gold were staked on it, and 10,000 people eagerly looked forward to their match. Snape turned and said he wouldn't be bugging him anymore. Angelica sighed and told Rick that Blowstone would surely revive him if he lost his life in the match, but he told her that she didn't know how scary it was to experience death. Angelica paused to process her thoughts and calmly told him that she could only imagine the trauma from Blowstone's training, but he had endured it for 2 years, so she told him he should be braver now. Rick kept refusing and telling her she wouldn't understand him, so Angelica gave up. She told him that he may have respected him as her teacher, and added that she had misjudged him. The room went silent as she stormed out. Alicent walked to the door with her little feet and told Rick that Blowstone was looking forward to playing with him, but there was no response. Eldwarf decided to speak, telling Rick that he should be wondering why Blowstone gave him a detailed training form 2 years ago at the start of his training. Rick thought of it and said Blowstone might want to raise allies that could help defeat Arisapieto. That was true, but Eldwarf told him Blowstone was training him mainly to raise an opponent with whom he could have an equal fistfight. Rick was speechless upon the revelation. Eldwarf added that Blowstone became too strong and felt alone for a long time, just like Kelvin. Blowstone's dream was to have an equal fight where he could punch his full strength out, and that dream might be granted tomorrow. Before he left, he told Rick he was free to withdraw, and only told him what Blowstone felt. Lynette added that she would support and wait for Rick no matter what. The day went by, and Rick remained inside his room, processing his feelings and thoughts. The following day, almost no seats were left vacant because the most awaited day had finally arrived. Even the host's button popped out from excitement. She panicked a little and took it off while he continued her sentences. Angelica looked at Snape, who was sweating a lot, mocking him for being nervous. Snape said he didn't know what to do if Rick didn't show up. When the host called Blowstone's name, he came out of the doorway, making the crowd go wild. Everyone was waiting for his entrance when the host called Rick's name. When Rick finally went out, Snape released a deep breath. Rick's teachers were so excited and cheering for them. Eldwarf stood up and told Snape he would place protection magic on the battleground. Snape was asking what it was for, but he only told him it was for the better. Alicent placed her palm on Eldwarf to transfer some huge amount of mana to help him. When he started chanting the magic words, an invisible barrier called Airbreak Wall was established. Meanwhile, Rick and Blowstone looked at each other as soon as they stepped in. Blowstone smiled because he was glad Rick came. Rick was obviously sweating in nervousness, but more than that, he knew he owed Blowstone a debt. When the host officially introduced the adventurers who managed to get to the finals, Rick raised his guard, preparing himself for this battle. This is just going to be a freaking clash of art. In the bleachers, Nicholas's friend couldn't believe Rick had made it to the finals. He asked Nicholas whom he had bet on and replied that he had bet on Rick because he wanted to see how good his eyes were for fighters. Eldwarf suggested making a wager of their own, and everyone got excited and agreed with his idea. Mizet, Eldwarf, and Alicent placed their bet on Blowstone since they think Rick may be strong but still not on Blowstone's level. Angelica also wanted to bet on Blowstone, but betting on Rick would make things more interesting, so she picked Rick. Lynette nodded and said she would also bet on Rick. Eldwarf chuckled and said if he won, he would expand his workshop. Alicent said that she wanted an eat-all-you-can hamburger for a week. Lynette wanted a no-chores week, and Angelica wanted to be able to visit their castle. Blowstone stood firmly and told Rick they should now begin the fight. Kelvin and the owner noticed that Blowstone may have looked like he wasn't on guard, but he had no gap in his defense. Kelvin suddenly wonders how strong Rick really is, because he knows he is holding back in his battle against Gistons. Angelica was getting excited to see Rick's full strength, and Rick knew he had to give his all in this match to keep his life intact. He was still trembling in fear, but out of respect for his teacher, he decided to prioritize dodging his attacks. He stepped his foot back and in a split second he was gone. Everyone held their breath from shock, and when Rick swung his fist, all the people saw was an explosion. Everything was too fast, confusing most of the audience about what had occurred. The debris that flew bumped into the barrier. Blowstone lifted his arm and noticed a laceration on his arm. The host was stumbling with her words because Rick managed to put a scratch on Blowstone at the speed of light. Snape finally realized why a barrier was needed, so he thanked Eldwarf for putting it on. Snape looked back at the battleground and asked what magic they were using, but Alabio told him they weren't using any magic. Angelica frowned her eyebrows and wasn't sure if the two were only using body-strengthening techniques. Lynette commended her and told her she was quite skilled for noticing it. After Rick dashed towards Blowstone, he released some flurry attacks at him that were invisible to the naked eye. Blowstone blocked his right fist as well as his left fist. The strength of those punches radiated and created a loud bang. That continued for a second, but when he saw an uppercut attack from Blowstone, Rick was alerted, so he leaped back to make some distance. Rick landed his feet on the wall and created momentum to push himself back to his teacher. He sprinted, and when Blowstone threw a punch, Rick pushed it to the side and lowered his body for his final attack. He slid to the slide, and in a glimpse, he successfully landed a cutting thread attack on him. There was a moment of silence afterward because people were trying to process the scene, and when they saw the bleeding on Blowstone's body, everyone cheered. The host couldn't believe they were witnessing such an incredible battle. Even Kelvin couldn't follow through their movements, making him wonder how confused the people were. Angelica kept his eyes stuck to them and thought she may have gotten stronger, but these two monsters were in a different realm. She could only imagine how crazy Rick had gone through in those 2 years to become this insanely strong. This man is sweating in buckets while having multiple PTSD as he tries to fight. If this turns into a drawn-out fight, his mental status won't be able to keep up. He couldn't believe his trauma would be this strong. Blowstone looked at his surroundings and said it would be rude if he continued to defend when Rick had already decided to fight. Rick took a deep breath, wondering how his teacher would approach him. When Blowstone pulled back his fist, Rick was surprised by the distance. He almost froze in fear when he saw the force from his fist. Blowstone's fist had created a halo of immense natural power, and when that force shot from his hand, it was like a vast bullet coming in Rick's direction. Rick contracted his muscles and leaped to the side to evade it. Luckily, he was able to dodge it on time. Kelvin still couldn't believe how strong Blowstone's punches were. Out of nowhere, Blowstone released Hadouken, Hadouken, Hadouken. I bet Goku would approve of this attack. Rick almost pooped his pants in shock. Eldwarf chuckled and said those were just normal punches of an orc, so Blowstone could put out a chain of it. However, Blowstone was suddenly right below him. That Hadouken was just a trap to keep his guard off. As a result, Rick would surely take this punch without a chance to avoid it. Just like Kelvin's situation before, the shockwave from Blowstone's attack had created a loud explosion, making Angelica worry for Rick. Kelvin wondered if Rick had taken the attack straight on, but to their surprise, Rick luckily dodged it with a first-order spell called Air Cushion. They were surprised because it was their first time to see someone using it without chanting the spell. Angelica had heard it was theoretically possible, but there was no record of anyone doing it. Blowstone chuckled and said Rick's precision of his magic control was outstanding. Angelica went silent and thought these two monsters had surpassed human limits in all categories, because this was surely a fight between Ace-rank and adventurers. Just how often he has to lose his life to cast a chantless magic instinctively. Using a cutting thread may be easy, but it would now be enough to make Blowstone budge a little. He thought of using his special move with an air shot, but he was surprised when Blowstone told him he had significantly gotten stronger. He added that he was proud to say that his plan to train Rick was perfect, making Rick stronger than anticipated. Blowstone smiled, called him his disciple, and told him he was worthy of respect. Rick was speechless because he knew his teacher would never tell a lie or give an empty compliment. He could remember the days he was training with him, so he was touched and told him he was honored. These were the happiest words he could receive from his master, but he suddenly remembered Blowstone's dream. He spoke and said Eldwarf told him that he trained him to be able to have a fist fight as equals. Blowstone looked at Eldwarf, who was acting like he had not heard it. He sighed and told Rick not to worry, since it was an exaggeration to call it a dream, and that it would be nothing more than a side benefit if it happened. Rick could tell from his passion while he trained him how serious that was to Blowstone, so he told him he wanted to return the favor to him. He took a deep breath and said that if he respected and fought him, he would sincerely pay his respect to his teacher. Rick suddenly asked why he wanted to have a fist fight as equals. Blowstone paused for a moment before realizing he hadn't told Rick the reason why their guild was built. Blowstone's dream was related to the founding of the Oracolum Fist Guild. That was 46 years ago when he was still living in the tribes of the orcs. The male and female orcs were separated, so he lived with his father and two older brothers. When Blowstone was about 5 years old, he realized he was different. Aside from his gray skin compared to the natural green color of an orc, his level of intelligence was also different. He picked up the books humans dropped, learned about letters and language, and even copied the habit of individual names. He read a novel and decided to name himself similar to one of its characters, Blowstone. He learned martial arts and gained magical knowledge from the books. He prioritized learning healing magic because orcs usually get injured from fist fights. They also have a hierarchy, and Blowstone's dad is the boss of their tribe. One day his dad got mad because all he did was read books, but he ended up beating up like a pulp. He was still a 10-year-old, but Blowstone was accepted as the boss. He used what he learned from the books to improve the lives of their people. They created houses and cooked food on fire. He taught them how to communicate without words. It came to a point where his people saw him as a god. No one went against him, nor dared to fist fight with him. Even his dad and brothers only worshipped him without trying to get close to him. He only sat at the top while watching them fight, settle it with their fists, and laugh it all out afterward. All he could do was look down and watch from his seat. He felt so alone at the top. After living like that for 10 years, he decided to go out to get some material for a potential landslide. But when he returned, it was too late. Everyone was gone, and his village was wiped out. He was shocked, not because of what happened, but because he didn't feel any sadness when he lost his family and tribe. That slapped him hard, how truly alone he was. After that, he started traveling with no destination in mind, and one day he found a village being attacked by a monster. He walked to that area and gave a single punch to the monster. He was about to ask the humans if they were all right, but they started running away from him in fear. A man jumped from above, telling the human to get to a safer place. Blowstone was alerted when the human adventurer started attacking him. The man noticed the impressive precision of his fighting skills. He asked if he was the one who saved the villagers, because this was his first time meeting an intelligent orc like him. The man was so happy and asked if he could talk. Blowstone said yes, which excited him even more, and invited him to talk over drinks. Near a river, the two sat while they warmed themselves. Blowstone told that adventurer his story, and that he was looking for allies he could call his equal, so the man suggested he try to make his dream come true. Blowstone got confused, so the man told him that he was one of the people who fought alongside the hero Yamato 200 years ago, and is now called the Legendary Five. Blowstone asked if his dream dream was to defeat Kaiser Arasapi, and the man nodded in response. Blowstone had read that book and couldn't believe that the story of Hiro Yamato was real, and one of its party members was right before him. The man was surprised that the orc knew about the book, so he told him to chase his outrageous dream so strong individuals who could rival him would gather. Blowstone had become an adventurer since then, and they created the Orcatalum Fist, and just like that man said, strong people gathered and joined his guild. They all had their own forms of strength, so he couldn't ask them into a fist fight. That was when he had an idea about the training plan, but the members rejected it, saying nobody could endure that intense training. So, to give up on it, he convinced himself it was an insignificant dream, but the world was mysterious, and he was brought Rick. Blowstone chuckled and apologized for making him listen to his rambling story. Rick closed his eyes and thought he shouldn't be thinking about using his special move, because all thanks to his teacher, he was able to chase after his dream. He remembered the day when he asked about why orcs stick out their thumb, and Blowstone explained it was a declaration that they would not defend or block and place their will into just punching. Rick raised his arm and showed him the quarter thumbs up. Blowstone was caught off guard by his gesture. He chuckled, and a soft smile flashed on his face. Blowstone lifted his arm and bumped his fist with his quarter thumbs up. That was some Chad fist bump for a man-to-man communication. Such a beauty of a story of Blowstone. If that doesn't make you bowling your eyes out one bit, then you got a problem. And my tears are different. It's a manly tears. When the two swung their fists back, their punches landed in their faces at the same time. The impact was so strong that the floor trembled and cracked to pieces. The debris from the ground flew to the barrier, but the strong impact also cracked it. The people in the bleachers screamed and covered their faces immediately. Eldwarf figured that his barrier would collapse any moment now. Meanwhile, Rick and Blowstone coughed out blood and were pushed back a few meters. The two brought their gazes back to each other, and in the blink of an eye, the two had already landed another fistful attack. Their rock-hard fists almost crushed their facial bones from the impact. The intensity and shockwave from the fight were getting a little stronger, making the host dumbfounded and excited. She couldn't believe how fast the situation accelerated. The shockwave pushed the barrier again, and when a hole appeared, the barrier shattered slowly like a falling glass. Eldwarf calmly told Snape to evacuate the spectators, so he stood up and told the host to tell the audience to evacuate immediately. The host picked up his mic and told everyone to exit the Colosseum as fast as possible. But after a few seconds, Rick and Blowstone created another powerful shockwave. That blow caused the barrier to explode this time, but luckily, most of the people got out. Angelica screamed from the impact. The other spectators were still running, as the host told them to keep calm as they evacuated. The owner asked Kelvin why he wasn't moving, so he looked below and told them he would want to watch this intense fight for himself. Angelica grunted and felt like she was getting lighter, and in the blink of an eye, she got caught by the powerful force. Lynette heard her scream, so she acted quickly but was too far away. Luckily, a hand grabbed her wrist and it was Snape. He pulled her to the floor, and when she recovered, she asked why he didn't run away. Snape is about to say that he is the leader of this tournament, but Angelica cuts him off and says Snape was once a gladiator, and she is certain he also wants to watch this historic fight. Rick and Blowstone were pushed once again away from each other. The two were huffing for air while blood was dripping from their faces. They may have released equal numbers of punches, but they knew Blowstone's punches were far stronger. Rick screamed his pain out as he charged towards his teacher. When he got near, he released multiple punches at Blowstone's body. The impact pushed him a few meters away from his standing point, but Angelica noticed Rick's stamina change. He seemed tired, so when Blowstone attacked, Rick couldn't move. He groaned from the pain and was sent flying in the air. The thick wall of the Colosseum shattered from Rick's body. The smoke and clouds of dust lingered around the area. Rick sat there, bleeding and barely breathing. He could feel his flesh and bones torn apart, but he thought that he did pretty well by overcoming his trauma. When he thought of giving up, he suddenly realized that this much was still just a fist fight, and it was not enough to be called Blowstone's equal. He closed his bloody fist and decided to push himself more. His teachers smiled as they all knew Rick was not yet done. Angelica suddenly remembered Rick's unique skill that Blowstone banned, but Alicent told her they trained Rick to control it without Blowstone's knowledge to surprise him. This unique skill they were talking about was called the activation condition, where Rick overcame his limits and challenged a stronger opponent than himself. I am 80% sure this guy has Saiyan blood in him. A blinding lightning suddenly appeared in the sky after Rick's unique skill was activated. Angelica asked if that skill was activated automatically. Eldwarf told her no, because it wasn't mana or his stamina that activated it, but his force of will. Rick had gone Super Saiyan at this point. Sangoku would be proud. Meanwhile, Blowstone was left frozen. His eyes were wide opened in shock. His friend laughed at the look of his hilarious reaction. This made Angelica proud of Rick, because aside from his vigorous training with Blowstone, he was also undergoing special training. Blowstone took his prayer beads off. Lynette said it was a piece of equipment that raises the effect of healing magic, so this only means Blowstone figured he didn't need to heal Rick. When he threw the beads, the floor where they landed was crushed. It was so heavy that it cracked the floor. Kelvin had gotten more excited because he could now witness their full power. The air went silent, and they could only hear Rick's unique skill. At the speed of light, Rick charged toward Blowstone and rapidly struck a punch in his face. Blowstone spat blood, but underneath that, an impact landed. Blowstone also landed a fatal punch on his abdomen area, making him cough out blood. The exchange of blows ruined the battleground to pieces. They both have the same amount of power, but Blowstone's damage is far more significant. significant. The people in the bleachers knew this was a fight beyond the realm of a student and a teacher. Blowstone suddenly realized he had been too obsessed with the idea of a fist fight when he had some people who depended on him and went through a lot to make this fight happen. Blowstone realized he wasn't alone. That feeling made him smile in relief, and in a second, Rick threw a punch at him, sending him back. The two were bleeding, chasing their breaths from the vigorous fight, making Angelica and Kelvin think they were at their limits, so the next blow would determine the tournament's champion. When the two screamed with all their might as they charged towards each other, their fists collided, and a powerful shockwave almost threw the shattered floor off the ground. The smoke and dust covered their area, but to their surprise, the two were still standing. Rick chuckled and told his teacher he was truly amazing, because even after all of those, he could not still win. He started to wobble and fell flat on the floor, unconscious. The host from above looked closer to see the situation and announced that Blowstone Ashork was the 113th tournament's champion. Blowstone chuckled and said Rick had helped him fulfill his dream, and that he had defeated him in this battle. After he said those words, he lost balance and fell unconsciously. This is enough to make a grown man cry, because I have never seen such a magnificent and manly fight as this. On top of that, it is clean and not too chaotic. 3 days passed after the finals, and Rick finally woke up from his deep rest. When he got up, Lynette greeted him. Rick groaned from the after effects on his body. His teachers and Angelica came inside and greeted him with smiling faces. Rick wiped the sweat out of his face and asked how it ended when the dragon attacked, but they figured his memories were all jumbled up. Alicent told him Blowstone won, but Blowstone said that Rick won their match for him. Rick was glad for Blowstone, but he knew to himself that he couldn't win if Blowstone used magic attacks. His teacher stood up and called Alicent, Mizet, Lynette, and Rick. He bowed to pay respect and thanked them for making his dream come true. Rick was dumbfounded and asked what he meant, so Angelica explained that his teachers had trained his unique skill to surprise Blowstone. Eldwarf chuckled and said they kept it a secret from him to prevent more pressure on him. Rick finally understood why they were so motivated to train him without Blowstone. That day was also the day of the Belt Awards ceremony at the Eastern Arena, since the Coliseum was crushed to bits during finals. Nicholas's friend said it was a shame that he lost his bet on Rick, but Nicholas was certain Rick was a real deal. Thanks to those destructive finals, Nicholas got injured, but was still happy to witness such a remarkable match. As the top 3 finishers entered, they stood on the platform, making the crowd wilder. Rick's teachers were bursting into laughing as they saw Blowstone's ridiculous face. The owner felt so wrong to see Kelvin in 3rd place, but since Gis had his fighter registration erased, he was automatically placed in 3rd place. Kelvin punched in the air like he won the whole thing. Rick Gladiardle was called for the 2nd place award, but his face looked like poop was about to come out of his butthole. The dude was sweating in buckets, and when the grand champion and the strongest man in the tournament's history was called, Blowstone's face was sulking. After a few hours, they went back to the inn to rest and discussed the 2nd jewel of the 6 jewels. This royal yellow jewel was attached to the belt, so they tried to pull it out, and it popped out easily. Eldwarf told them to make Alicent fill the replacement with mana, so they placed it inside a safe box when they were done. After such a good fighting scene, we require this type of thing. Okay, enough of that. Kelvin knocked on Snape's door the following day and asked why he called for him. Snape apologized for interrupting his training and said Blowstone and Rick returned the belt, erased their fighter registration and left as if nothing happened. Kelvin remained calm as he knew about it. Snape noticed his calm reaction, so Kelvin said he didn't know about the details, but their goal wasn't to win. Snape took the belt and asked Kelvin to be the belt's owner temporarily. Kelvin gasped in confusion. Snape said it was because he was already used to keeping the belt safe, so Kelvin looked at it and noticed those monsters really did switch out the jewel. At the near end of the city, Blowstone and the others were packing their things into the carriage. Alicent asked Angelica to come to the castle, so Angelica told her she would come if everyone allowed her to go. Upon hearing them, Lynette and Eldwarf told her also to come, so she thanked them. She was about to climb the carriage when Blowstone told her the carriage was only for the luggage, Eldwarf and Alicent. Blowstone added that the physical types would go home running, as part of their training. Angelica was surprised and wondered when she joined their physical type group. She sighed and accepted her faith. She asked if they would be running for 200 kilometers, but when Rick said it was 2,800 kilometers, she almost farted because it usually takes a week with a carriage. Rick told her they could get there in 3 days by running. He looked at the clear sky. He remembered how he dreamt of joining the Fist King tournament when he was a kid, and now he got to compete until the finals. In the heart of the city, Kelvin was walking with the belt on his shoulder. A man called him and asked why he had the belt, but he said something had happened. He was about to walk away when he froze, when he saw the Kingdom Knights. But the guy with dark hair caught his eye the most. It seems Trollo is tired of waiting for Hex H's return, so he accepted a different series in the meantime. Kelvin almost choked from the immense fear he felt from that monstrous aura. He started to wonder why such a special class knight was based on his uniform. The man halted as he noticed the match had ended. Bro was talking in cursive, I guess. The man sighed and said he had no luck to watch some matches for now. After 7 days of running, Rick's group arrived at the castle. Angelica let his body drop to the floor in exhaustion. She was panting for air and struggled to tell them that if it weren't for them, she would have broken a world record with that. They all welcomed Angelica to the Orichalcum Fist's home base. Alubois ran to her as she saw her to hug her. Eldwarf said they cast strengthening magic on the horse to arrive earlier at the castle, but little did they know someone was following them. Rick asked why she wanted to visit their castle, but Angelica told him it was just for official reasons. She added that when she saw how Rick portrayed her after vigorous training, she decided to train how Rick was trained. He was shocked and nervously told her that the training he experienced was in different leagues of hell, but she said she was prepared to become stronger. Rick froze when he felt that familiar presence. Blowstone smiled and told Angelica to follow him. Angelica was surprised and begged him to make her rest first, but Blowstone dragged her, saying a break for their training would be too early. Rick sighed and told Angelica inside his head that she would die. After a few hours, Angelica was screaming from the bottom of her lungs. She was running upwards from a pit with weights on her limbs. Asking Blowstone what kind of torture this was, she exclaimed that she only wanted to learn how to train by herself, but ended up getting tortured. The monster kept trying to crawl out of the hole. Blowstone kept calm and said this would be a good exercise to balance all of her muscles. Blowstone said Rick was able to get out of that pit for 10 hours, but Angelica suddenly started slipping and losing her pace. Her heart pounded in fear as she saw the monster getting near her. She screamed and tried to run faster but lost balance and slipped on the floor. Her brain was going crazy as she screamed in terror. The noise ended and blood was all over the place. After a few minutes, Angelica woke up. Rick asked how she felt, as this was his first time witnessing someone get brought back to life. Angelica grabbed her aching head and asked if she had passed out, but when Rick told her she had lost her life a second ago, she froze. She looked at her body and saw her clothes ripped. When the thought that everything wasn't a dream sunk in, her soul and color almost left her body. She sat on the floor and stared blankly into nowhere. Blowstone figured she was in shock, so he let her rest for a bit. Angelica called Rick and apologized for criticizing him for being afraid of dying during the finals. Lynette told her Rick had experienced death and came back alive, more time than she could count. Angelica sighed and told her she sucked at cheering people up. Alicent ran to her and asked her to play and eat with her. Angelica stood up and asked where they were going. Alicent dragged her and Lynette toward the pool area. After changing into their swimsuits, they walked to the poolside. When Alicent jumped into the pool, Lynette reminded her not to push herself too much. Angelica said it was fine, and losing her life shook her and she questioned Rick's willpower. She knew to herself that she wasn't weak, and that Rick was just extraordinary. Lynette nodded and said they also couldn't understand Rick's strength of will. Angelica looked at her and saw something on her side. She asked if it was a dragon tattoo, but Lynette said no, and that it was complicated to explain. Angelica apologized, but Alicent suddenly called them to come over. The two smiled and hopped into the pool. They splashed water and played, but Angelica suddenly felt her body getting numb. Angelica felt dizzy little by little. When she lost consciousness, Lynette helped her and heard Alicent saying she also felt sleepy. Lynette looked at the pool water and figured someone must have put an anesthetic in it to kidnap Angelica. She looked around and thought this wasn't enough to make her pass, but when she blinked, she lost consciousness. Everything went blank. The moment when Angelica regained consciousness, she gasped in shock. She felt a shiver and asked if she died again. Lynette told her she fainted, but she got confused when she noticed the three of them were tied up inside a dark cave. Upon hearing their voices, a man walked in, wondering how the two of them woke up early. The man took his knife out and asked who they were. Angelica blew an air out in disbelief, as they should be the ones asking that. The man apologized and said he was the commanding officer of the Black Curse. His name was Gunas. Lynette stared at him and said that the group was the largest criminal organization on the continent. Angelica said that this organization has 2,000 members who take illegal jobs like assassinating and kidnapping. Gunas chuckled because they were familiar with their group. He added that he came there for Angelica Duramuto because Simon Duramuto hired him. Angelica was shocked upon hearing the familiar name. Gunas said the man hasn't given up on her marriage with Snape. Lynette was confused and asked who that man was, but she was left silent when Angelica told her it was her grandfather. Gunas told Angelica to try not to fight back, but Alicent heard everything. She asked if that man was a bad guy, and Lynette replied yes. The rope strapped around them suddenly broke, leaving Gunas caught off guard. When Angelica gave the signal, the three simultaneously attacked Gunas, leaving him paralyzed, flying in the air. Inside the castle, Rick had been looking around for girls. He was starting to worry that something bad happened to them, and after a few minutes, the three walked from the gate. He asked where they went, and they casually said they were kidnapped and sent the man flying in the sky with the team rocket. When Blowstone saw them, he walked up to them and told Angelica they would be resuming their training. Angelica begged to spare her life this time, but Blowstone dragged her without flinching. As their training continued, Angelica screamed and screamed until she lost her life once again. Blowstone revived her, and after a long day of training, Angelica, Lynette, and Alice hopped on a hot tub together. And I didn't expect to get flashed by melons. That caught me off guard. After their bath, they all ate outside for a feast, watched fireworks, and had a midnight snack and chit-chat before they went to sleep. These three were inseparable. The following day, Angelica packed her things and thanked everyone. Alice asked if she would come back. She replied saying yes, but froze when Blowstone gave her some weights as a gift. Rick asked if she had recovered, but she chuckled awkwardly and said she should lose heart there. She grabbed her things and said goodbye to everyone. She started her journey back to her town with some huge balls attached to her limbs, as if she were still in training. Meanwhile, the Orichalcum members gathered inside a room for a meeting. They looked at the map where the next jewel was located. Rick was confused about how the jewel got inside a school. That school they were referring to was the training facility for the kingdom's new knight recruits. Rick sighed as the kingdom protected this facility, making it hard for them. He halted from speaking when he noticed Eldwarf cocked the gun and asked what time should they go there. His teacher marched forward in unison. Rick was shocked and asked if they planned on starting a war. Blowstone gazed back at him and said they just didn't want to lose. Lynette asked if there was any way to get there without using force. Rick thought for a moment and told them they should infiltrate and gather information first to get in through negotiation. When they talk about infiltrating, Alicent suggests going boing and jumping in. They told her it was the same as using force. Lynette suggested entering the School of Knights as students, but they don't know how to become students there. Blowstone spoke and said he had a good idea. Rick gets nervous, but when Blowstone talks about meeting a young lady named Mia, he gets confused. He asked who that lady was, and it looked like he was the only person who hadn't met the lady. The Marchioness, Mia Alicent, Restora. Her parents perished when she was young, and she became the feudal lord in their territory. Mia opened the curtain, looking into the clear sky, saying it was such a peaceful day. She called her butler, asking for a cup of black tea. Meanwhile, outside her mansion, the Orichalcum Fist had arrived. Rick looked at Eldwarf and said seeing him going out for this was rare. They heard a commotion near the gate where the guards told a merchant to leave if he had no invitation to enter. Rick asked Blowstone how they could get inside without any invitation, but he told him not to worry. When the guard was busy pushing the man away, Blowstone excused himself and asked if they could open the gates for them. When the guard looked at him, a shiver went down his spine after realizing the Orichalcum Fists had arrived. The people in the mansion were running around in fear. Mia was startled when she heard her butler going crazy, telling her to hide immediately in the inner bedroom. He locked the door and said the Orichalcum Fist was on their way to her. Mia's eyes widened. She started sweating cold, felt numb, and dropped her cup. She couldn't believe they came back. The butler tried his best to hold the door tightly and told his lady to leave while he delayed them. The man looked at her and told her he had sworn to her parents to protect her even if it cost his life. But in the blink of an eye, he was sent flying in the air when Blowstone opened the door. Poor Sebastian. Butler. The butler flew a few meters away and crashed on the floor. Mia cried as he saw her butler. Blowstone apologized for startling them and breaking the lock. Rick immediately asked them if they were all right, but Mia was still speechless. Blowstone greeted her, so she lifted her gaze and awkwardly greeted him back. He introduced Rick as a newcomer, telling her he wasn't pro yet. When they arrived here half a year ago, Mia looked at Rick and greeted him. She thought he had a different aura from them. Rick asked his teacher how they met, so Blowstone said they have a give-and-take relationship. He added that when the Restora territory was attacked, they asked their guild to help them, and promised to support their guild with their activities as a reward. Mia sighed and asked what they wanted this time. Blowstone firmly told her to prepare a 5-slot to enter the Eastern Knight Academy. Blowstone added that it should be easy for her. Mia chuckled awkwardly and sarcastically said yes. The three men thanked her and bid their goodbyes. The butler ran to her lady and asked if she was all right. Mia blew the air out and said she may know those people were nice, but she always gets nervous and afraid of getting them angry because they are too strong. After a week of waiting, the Orichalcum First Guild received a letter saying only 1 slot was available. Lynette had expected this since getting 5 slots at a time would be difficult. The guild members gathered for a meeting. Rick scanned a book saying the average age of new recruits seemed to be 18, so Lynette and Eldwarf may get in for their young-looking faces. Lynette told them the academy was focused on recruiting men, while Eldwarf said those knights view half-elves as a negative attention drawer. Rick thought Blowstone and Alice were out of the question due to their age and appearance. He thought that he might stand out if he were to enroll in the academy, but Blowstone told him the age limit for this academy was different. Rick asked what its age limit, so when Blowstone said it was 32, Rick smiled and said picking anybody other than him could lead to turmoil. Eldwarf chuckled and said his plainness would keep him in the dark. Blowstone told everyone that the rest of them should find another way to infiltrate the academy. After a few days of preparation, Rick walked down the city wearing his uniform. An old student looked like he had been kicked out of different schools. Compared to when he was trying not to stand out at the Colosseum, he would need to be more thorough with holding back. He halted when he saw the signage. He had finally arrived at the Royal Kingdom Knights Recruit Training Academy. In this place, they would find the third jewel to uncover the dungeon's location where the Kaiser Arasapi II could be found. When Rick got inside, he looked around for his room. He stopped before the room 402. When he went in, he looked around and noticed it was a room for 4 people. No one was there, so he wondered where the others were. When he heard the door creak, he noticed a scared cat. Rick noticed he seemed stressed out, so he greeted him first as an adult, but the man shrieked in fear. He started apologizing and said he would do whatever he said. His reaction dumbfounded Rick, so he told him to calm down. The man stood up and apologized. He admitted that he was shy and a bit of a coward, which Rick agreed on because it was too obvious. Rick introduced himself, and the man told him his name, Henry Forstfadfia. Rick shook his hand and said he would not stay there for long, so he would be in their care. Henry placed his bag on the floor and said he would just read a book silently. He told him to let him know if he was bothering him. Brub's shyness was severe. Rick's eyes widened when he noticed the book he was holding. Rick asked if he also liked the legends of the hero Yamato. Henry seemed shocked and abruptly said said yes. Rick pulled the book out of his back and showed him that he also liked it. He sat before him and asked what his favorite scene was. Henry said there were many nice scenes, and Rick agreed because it was also hard for him to pick one. He added that when Yamato refused to give up right after he decided to face the Demon Lord alone, his party recovered and came rushing to help Yamato. Rick added that he always cried in that scene, so Henry added that people who don't cry about that shouldn't talk about Lehea. Rick asked what his favorite line from Lehea was, and the two of them said, "Give up? I don't know the meaning of that word." The two continued talking when Rick suddenly asked why he decided to become a knight, since he did not look interested in it. Henry said his father was a former A-rank adventurer, and his mom and siblings were at the top of their fields, but he was different. Henry loved reading books and thought of himself as good for nothing, so he hated himself. His dad always told him that he would always believe that he would become a great man someday. In order not to disappoint his father, Henry changed himself. He took the knight entrance exam, and being a bookworm paid off. He was at the top of the written exam, so he passed, but his practical exam was a disaster. Rick said it was great that he had taken the exam since he had gone there a little late. Henry realized his age was pretty rare to be seen in the new recruit, so he asked for his reason. Rick avoided his eyes and said it was complicated. When they heard footsteps towards them, they saw a tall man with Elvis Presley's hair. Henry shrieked in fear upon seeing him, but Rick walked to him and introduced himself. The man noticed his wrinkly face and said his age was pretty rare to see there. He said he was Guile Koblenz, the second son of their family. Rick pointed at Henry, said his name, and said he was a little shy, more like a chicken. Henry's body was quivering. He was whispering not to hurt him while crying. Rick sighed and said he was acting like he was looking at a cold-blooded killer. Henry explained that he reacts like this whenever a woman or some guy is taller than him. Guile chuckled devilishly, calling him a four-eyed chicken, and said he would now take him as his little bro. Rick sighed and thought his two roommates were perfect opposites of each other. Guile was surprised to see the book they were reading and asked if he could borrow it. They all went silent when the door opened, and when they turned around, they saw a gorgeous guy standing at the door. Henry started snotting nervously, so Rick asked what the heck was happening to him. Henry said the guy was smaller than him, but him being menacing makes him nervous. Rick introduced himself, but the man ignored him, saying he didn't plan to get to know them all, since they just happened to be placed in the same room. There was a moment of silence, but Rick spoke again, saying they would be living inside that room for the whole semester, and they at least needed to know how to address one another. The guy sighed and said his name, Ark Gervais. Suddenly Guile started laughing, because their room consisted of an old wrinkly guy, a skinny chicken nerd, and a frail-haired guy, and he added that he was the only good guy there. He called Ark and said he was lucky to be in the same room with him, and that he would take him in as his little bro. Ark ignored him, but Guile got angry and told him not to ignore a man like him. Rick was getting alarmed, so to avoid standing out, he had to solve this before a fight broke out. Ark apologized and said it was odd that someone placed himself even under somebody who was already below them. Guile's eyes twitched in anger. He cursed him, asking what rank his family was. Ark said he was just a commoner, so Guile threatened and told him to watch his mouth. Ark smirked and said he was too focused on his family's title. When Guile asked if Ark wanted to go, Rick tried to stop them, but the two ignored him and released a swing at each other. A loud impact echoed in the room, and the two froze when they noticed Rick grabbing their fists. Rick told them to calm down. Henry gasped in confusion because he thought Rick was just right beside him a second ago. Guile gritted his teeth and told him to let him go, but when he tried to pull away, he couldn't move his hand. Their arm was fixed like it was stuck on a rock. Guile couldn't understand how strong Rick was because he was the top in power on their practical exam. The two started to wonder who this middle-aged man was. Rick thought the two were pretty good. Guile was quite strong, and Ark was great at his body control using magic. However, he couldn't tell Henry's capabilities since he was hiding inside his shell. He told them they all came there to become knights, and hurting their comrades would be just for their foolish pride. He said joining the same group was also a fortune, so they should all get along. They all looked up when they heard the speaker ringing. A voice told them to assemble in the auditorium within 5 minutes of the ceremony. Rick smiled and told them they should hurry, since the school was strict. When he got out, they all spoke, saying Rick was not normal. Guile asked if he found Rick weird when they spoke, but Henry said they were talking normally. They walked to the hallway behind Rick and suddenly thought that his name seemed familiar, like they had seen it somewhere. When everyone had settled down in their seats, the representative of the new students was called. Rick and Guile were surprised when Ark's name was called to come to the front. In one of the academy's rooms, a meeting was being held. A man who looked pampered by his mother said they have many promising students this year. This man was the academy's headmaster, and his name was Klein. He looked at the papers, asking who these students were in the special training squad. They introduced Ark, Guile, Henry, as well as Rick for the special squad. Klein said it was rare for the top of the class to be in it. They may all have shortcomings, so they were chosen for this squad. So they used this opportunity to serve as an example to other students with good grades to keep working hard. The headmasters seemed to be nervous about it, so let's just go back to our MC. They were gathered in the field by their teacher, Pedig, for the next 6 months. Rick scanned his teacher and thought he was a perfect picture of a devilish instructor, but when he checked on Henry, his mouth was bubbling like he was poisoned by fear. He was so nervous because his teacher was taller than him. Pedig pointed at the huge mountain nearby and said there would be tags with numbers for each squad on the summit, so they had to bring the tag back. He added that there would be a 20-kilometer round trip in the steep mountain, and they only have 2 hours to accomplish it. If one of their members didn't make it on time, their squad would take punishment to teach them cooperation and teamwork. When the training began, everyone started running, but Petit called Rick's squad. The teacher said their squad was chosen for the special training squad, since they comprised outstanding individuals. When he said they would be running on a more rugged path, they happily said yes, and immediately sprinted off. While Rick cheered Henry to do his best, Petit smirked devilishly, and thought their pathway could take a pro knight 3 hours to complete, so it would be impossible for them to accomplish it. After an hour of running in the woods, Guile told everyone to hurry, since they were running out of time. The uphill track was still further, and when they reached the rock climbing area, Guile looked like a melting candle from his sweat. He thought he might be at the top of the practical exam, but couldn't believe they weren't at the summit yet. He noticed Ark and Henry far behind him. He was in disbelief that the old man was before him, with not even a bead of sweat on him, when he was dripping like a fountain. Rick suddenly felt his stare, wondering if he was going too fast. He wondered if he should act a little more like he was worn out. He started huffing for air, but Guile caught him and told him he sucked at acting. He cursed while panting and asked who the frick he was. Rick chuckled awkwardly and said it came with age, but Guile said this was in a different dimension for a 30-year-old man. Rick thought a 20-kilometer path would be easy for everyone, but he looked suspicious now. Meanwhile, Henry couldn't even speak due to exhaustion. He reached his limit and lost consciousness. The three heard him fall, and Guile was shocked by Rick's rapid movements. Rick tried to wake him up, and luckily, Henry woke up. He started crying and said this would be the end of his becoming a knight. Guile was surprised when he saw Ark moving forward. He called him, and Ark said he would go to the summit and return to the school. Guile couldn't believe Ark would be abandoning his comrade, but Ark said they were already at their limits, so it would be hard to make it on time if they stopped for this. Guile scoffed as he saw Ark slipping down the cliff. He said that this was as far as he could go as well. The two knew it would be impossible for them to climb this cliff in their current state. Rick lifted Henry and placed him on his back. Guile asked what he was planning, so Rick said cooperation and teamwork were important based on their instructor. Guile was about to say that it would be impossible for him to reach the summit with Henry on his back, but Rick cut him off and told him to leave this to his elder. Ark and Guile were left silent, as Rick told them to hop on him as well. The two couldn't believe what he was saying, but after a few more minutes, the instructor was getting impatient. He looked at his watch and saw that the special training squad had only 10 minutes left. He was starting to think of what additional hellish training he should give them, when he heard a voice screaming that Squad 402 had arrived. Rick commended Guile and Ark for running the last 5 kilometers on their own. Petit said they were the first group to return. Rick gave their squad number, and their teacher said they were the first squad to make it 10 minutes earlier with complete members. Petit suddenly gasped when he realized what he said. He couldn't believe this special group arrived first. He thought they may have broken the rules in some ways. He checked the card to see if it was fake, but it was real. He noticed that despite exceeding his expectations, the three were obviously exhausted, but Rick was noticeably not sweating a drop. Rick told their instructor he would bring Henry to the infirmary, and when the night came, they went to their room to rest. Rick asked for Ark, but Guile said he hadn't seen him. Guile's pride was crushed after he was carried by an old man, whom he belittled and even called his little brother. The following day, the students gathered in the field, and Petit had another trick up his sleeve for the special training squad. He announced the mock battle with another instructor, who got promoted to a first-class knight. When the instructor came in, Angelica exclaimed and pointed at Rick, asking why he was there. Rick chuckled and greeted her. PTSD has already set in for her. Here she thought she could finally show off her training and train some noobs. Little did she know, death was so close to home, gaining a new trauma every time. Angelica started trembling when Petit asked if she knew his student. She cleared her throat and said he was only an acquaintance. When Petit said they should hurry and start the mock battle, Angelica started sweating, because if she fought with Rick, she would look like a fool to everyone. She chuckled and said their second training day might be a little too early for strength training. When the training started, the students were rushing back from the river, and Squad 402 arrived there first. Petit clicked a sound from his tongue. Angelica called Rick to talk for a second. They walked to the back of the building. Angelica asked if it was about the 6 jewels. Rick smiled as he nodded and said she was good at guessing. Angelica sighed and said she wouldn't be asking how he could enroll there, so he asked if they had already figured out where the jewel was in the academy. Rick said he had no clue because he was too occupied with not trying to look suspicious. Angelica had decided to help him since Rick had a natural way of looking suspicious, so Rick was glad to hear it. Angelica asked about the others, and he said his teachers would find another way to infiltrate, so it would be only a matter of time before those people would show up. Angelica thanked Rick for the training, because she raised her rank easily. She chuckled and said that wearing the first-class knight uniform and seeing him wear the new recruit uniform gave her a sense of superiority. When they finished talking, they went back to the field. Guile asked where he went, and he said he went to use the bathroom. Ark suddenly called the first-class knight Diramuto. He introduced himself formally, said he looked up to her, and aspired to be a knight like her. He went closer and added that he respected her for being a first-class knight at her age. Ark smiled when Angelica said he had a discerning eye and good potential. Rick was surprised to see Ark smiling like that. That night, Rick slammed the door open and excitedly told them they should all take a bath. He suddenly noticed Ark missing. Guile and Henry apologized because their body was still aching. In the headmaster's office, 2 people were playing chess. Klein nodded and said he was no match for Ark. He apologized for making him play along, but Ark said he was only grateful for his time and for the enrollment. Klein smiled and told him he had high hopes for him. The following following day, they gathered again in the field for a mock battle. Pedig said Angelica might say it was too soon, but he had brought another person to lead the mock battle. Pedig introduced the first-class knight named Vidars. Pedig smirked as he watched Vidars say they should start their training with the 402 squad. Rick and his squad members responded to him. Vidar scoffed as he could already tell from their eyes that they still thought their squad was being treated specially. He looked at the guy who looked confident about shaving their will away to fight. Guile Koblenz was called, so when he walked to the front, he thought he might lose against Rick, but he knew he was good when it came to strength. In this training, they would be using a wooden sword, so when the match began, Guile launched the first attack, but Vidars thought his body strength was useless. He activated his sturdy fist and blocked Guile's wooden sword. Guile gritted his teeth as he figured Vidars used a strengthening magic. The instructor thought this student came on top of their class for nothing. He thought of taking his time to play around a little, so he allowed Guile to attack him with all his strength and continued blocking it with one arm. Vidars started groaning when he felt his attacks getting stronger. He added the sturdy sword with his sturdy fist, and Guile's sword broke in a swing. He was caught off guard and sent flying a few meters away. Rick started to worry and thought that going to this extent for a student was too much. Their match ended, and as Vidars watched him walk away, his heart pounded because that student's strength exceeded his expectations. Ark was walked to the front when he was called. Vidars smirked and thought this peasant commoner would make the perfect example to teach everyone. When the match began, Ark prepared himself, keeping his guard up. He was examining the instructor and different tactics from Guile. When Ark infused his sword with power, he accelerated his foot to transition his body from strengthening to movement. Vidars was caught off guard when Ark rapidly attacked him. He thought that Ark's attacks were faster but lighter. Ark grunted when his sword was deflected. He stopped his momentum with his foot and immediately amplified his body, strengthening it to reorganize himself quickly. Vidars sighed and activated his third-order magic. Ark gasped upon seeing a chantless magic, and when an arrow blast came dashing towards him, he tried to block it, but that thin sword wasn't enough and got blown away. Rick dropped his jaw at the instructor's dangerous move. When their match ended, Vidars was sweating hard because he was forced to use magic against a trainee. He was getting nervous, but he became more confident when he saw the next student. Vidars smirked and remembered that this person was at the bottom of the practical exam. Henry was trembling in fear when Pedig called his name. When the match started, Henry was sweating a bucket. Vidars chuckled and thought even a wooden sword seemed to be heavy for him. He asked if he was all right and told him to make the first strike. Henry followed him and ran at him with his sword. Vidars knew Henry's attack would be lighter, so he easily landed a strike on his abdomen. Henry coughed from the impact, but Rick did not like it because the instructor hit a vital point on purpose. Henry dropped to the ground, curled and grabbing his abdomen in pain. Vidars asked if he could continue, but Henry surrendered. Vidars smirked and said he shouldn't become a knight if this were enough to make him surrender. He grabbed his clothes to pick him up and slashed another attack on him. Henry screamed in pain as Vidars continued to hit him. Guile was shocked and figured there was something weird in their group training from the first day. He could tell the instructor had an apparent malice to torment his students. He gritted his teeth because he couldn't do anything to help the four-eyed chicken as their leader. Henry was thrown on the floor and he was bleeding and begging for the instructor to stop it. Vidar stepped on his abdomen, making him cough out blood. He told him not to be so soft, but inside his head he happily laughed because his greed was satisfied. Vidar told him he would attack again if he did not get up. Guile and Ark called him and screamed at him to get out of the way, but Rick took the blow when he swung the sword. Vidar was surprised to see him there. Rick told him Henry was at his limit and that it was about time to train him instead. It's time to give him the proper butt-whooping that he deserves. Vidar scoffed upon seeing the brave, stubborn student. He told Rick that he should beat Henry into shape to become a first-class knight like him. Rick called Guile to take Henry to the infirmary. He stood up and said what he did shouldn't be called training. Rick had undergone thousands more stricter than this, but he could do it because his teachers were looking out for him. However, this monkey was a pure monster. Rick turned with glaring eyes and told him if he wanted strict training, he should train him instead. Vidar scoffed and said he would give a very special mock battle for this oldie student. Their class went to the closed gymnasium, and everyone watched from the door. There were real weapons laid on the floor. Vidar said Rick was free to use any of the weapons for their battle. Vidar chuckled and said they weren't allowed to kill their opponent, but they could still end up with grave injuries. The gathered students came inside, and Vidar thought this would be perfect to expose Rick's disgrace. After running, Guile finally arrived and asked Ark if the battle had begun. Meanwhile, Angelica was walking outside and noticed teacher Pedig did not call for him for the training. She suddenly heard some students betting their money between instructor Vidars and a trainee. She came inside and asked Ark what was going on. Ark was flustered upon seeing her, so he formally greeted her while stuttering. Angelica told him to just call him Angelica. Ark's cheeks turned red as he said he would do his best, so he called him Angelica. Guile sighed, scolded them, and said this isn't the time to be flirting. He added that this old instructor was about to duel with a real weapon, Rick. Angelica looked outside and thought she was surprised that the school wasn't doing anything about gambling compared to the school where she graduated. Angelica suddenly had an idea. She told the two to do as she said. When they saw the scoreboard, most of the students were betting on Rick to lose, so most of their money was on the instructor's side. Ark gasped in shock when Angelica said she would make a bet. When Angelica blurted out that she would bet on trainee Rick, Guile and Ark gasped in disbelief. Angelica chuckled and said they should follow her and bet everything they had, because if they trained with Rick, they should know he wasn't normal. After handing them their money, she looked at them and said she would take responsibility if they lost. Going back to the battle, Vidiers picked a huge sharp lande made out of steel. He knew he wouldn't lose since the rest of the weapons were only made out of normal iron. Rick scanned the weapon before him and remembered what Blowstone told him. He said he was forbidden from using a weapon or getting near one. Vidiers waited and asked if he wouldn't be using a weapon. Rick nodded and said these fists would be his weapon. Everyone was shocked by his response. Vidiers laughed and said he wouldn't listen to any excuses after losing. Ark asked Angelica if betting all of his money would be okay since he wasn't rich by any means. Angelica told him he would get his money back in double. The student who was in charge of the betting closed the betting period. He chuckled devilishly and thanked those three idiots for giving them some profits. When the mock battle had begun, Vidiers immediately rushed forward, and the students were shocked by the speed of his movement. However, despite that speed, it was too slow for Rick and evaded it easily. Vidiers looked back and changed the momentum of his body. He used the body turn at such speed, making the students feel secure that they would be making a profit by betting on the teacher. The students laughed at the three idiots who placed their money on the trainee. Pedic chuckled and thanked the gambling for making things exciting. When Vidiers launched another attack, there were multiple slashes around Rick in a flash. Vidiers laughed as he managed to slash Rick's clothes. He called Rick a talentless beginner and told him to know his place. Vidiers was dashing left to right and mocked him for believing he could still become a knight at his age. He added that his useless dream would be useless, just like that four-eyed kid. Rick remained silent and let the dog bark, but when Vidiers went at him to strike his sword, Rick released his fist in his sword's direction. In a blink of an eye, the sword was crushed, and his fist went through and landed on his thick, ugly face. That hit was satisfying. An explosion occurred when Vidiers crashed on the floor. The people's souls almost left their bodies in shock, except for Angelica, since she knew this would happen. Look at that sneaky, smug face. Easy money for them. Vidiers was seen on the floor with his face like a deflated ball. Angelica snickered and mockingly teased the guy who managed the bettings. Guile spoke as he finally remembered who this old guy was. He saw him in the Fist Kings tournament, and since he was an avid fan, he watched it every year. He could remember that day in the finals when he thought he was just an ordinary old man who was bad at magic, but he found him super cool. Ark nodded and agreed with him as he finally realized it as well. Guile didn't expect Rick to show up there while keeping a low profile. He may not realize who he was, but he now knows this old man was the Fist King tournament's runner-up. Pedic immediately rushed to Vidiers. He cursed Rick for hurting an instructor like this, but Rick defended himself, saying it was Vidiers who said to treat the battle like a real fight. Pedic exclaimed that he would be expelled from his squad for collective responsibility. Rick smirked and said things wouldn't matter if he got expelled. He suggested that he should give him a beating as payback. Pedic felt a shiver down his spine, so he ran with Vidiers off his back while reminding Rick to remember this day. Angelica thanked him for making them lots of money. Ark was still recovering from the money he was holding, while Rick was still dumbfounded. Ark asked if Angelica knew what would happen. However, Guile was on the side, processing what happened. That night, Rick and Angelica were walking down the hallway. He was checking an orb and noticed there was no reaction to it. He explained it was supposed to glow when it was within 4 meters of high-density magic like the 6 jewels. He thanked Angelica, but she told him not to worry, and she would also search on her own. Angelica asked if he had thought of having his squad help him, so Rick said no, and that he might get expelled from them if things went wrong. He knew those three really wanted to become knights, so he wouldn't risk their dreams. The two halted when they noticed the person before them. It was Lynette in her janitress uniform. They greeted each other. Angelica asked if she was in disguise. Lynette nodded and said she didn't think that anybody would suspect her. Rick asked about the others, so Lynette told them they would arrive soon. She added that they couldn't find a good way to get in, so they needed some help from the inside. The three went to the corner of the wall surrounding the academy. They were surprised when they heard Blowstone, Alicet, and Eldwarf's voices on the other side. Rick asked if they planned on jumping over the wall, but they replied that the barbed wire was on the way, and that the guard would know if someone got in, if a fiber of their clothing got caught. When Blowstone said they would open a hole in the wall, Rick almost choked in shock. He said that someone would notice them with something flashy like that, but they told them not to worry. Alicet got excited and said she had been practicing it, and in the blink of an eye, a laser-like light blasted through the wall. Due to shock, Angelica screamed in fear, saying that it was too dangerous. The laser moved and created a box figure on the wall. When Alicet was done, the wall was smoking. Eldwarf told Rick to catch the wall, and when it slid, he caught it in his hands. The rest of the Orichalcum Fist had finally entered the Knight Academy. Alicet was so happy upon seeing Angelica. Rick sighed and asked what they would do with the piece of wall. Blowstone told him not to worry because Eldwarf would make it into a door. After a few minutes, Mizet Eldwarf finished fixing the wall and putting it into a door. Blowstone asked the status of the search, but Rick said he still needed to figure it out. Blowstone said they should decide on who would search where, but Angelica became worried because they might get revealed. Blowstone told her they were good at disguises. Angelica volunteered to search for food, while Mizet asked if there were any female students. Rick scolded them and told them to retreat instead. There was a meeting in one of the buildings, and the board asked how Squad 402 was doing because of Vidar's incident, which required him to recover for 5 months. Paystick was sweating sweating coldly as he said he found out that one of the students in that squad was the first runner-up of the Fist King tournament. The board suggests isolating Rick and continuing the training with the rest of the squad members. Meanwhile, Ark was inside the headmaster's office playing chess with him. It was almost 9 in the evening when they finished. Angelica and Rick went back inside. She told him to head back to his room to avoid suspicion. They too bid goodbye, and when he returned to his room, he was surprised by Giles' huge reaction. Rick almost got scared of him when Giles said he was a huge fan of his during the tournament finals. Rick was surprised he was there, so Giles said he only realized it earlier in the fight, after seeing his strength. He bowed to apologize for all of his rudeness formally. Rick was flustered, so he told him it was alright, and that they were squad mates and should treat him as equals. He almost farted when Giles started bawling his eyes out, while telling him strong people like him have such a big and warm heart. Rick told him to cut this polite language, but Giles said no and asked if he could also talk casually to the people he respects. Henry cleared his throat and thanked him for saving him. Rick asked if his wounds were okay, so Henry told him he was alright and shouldn't have acted so pathetic. Giles told him nothing was pathetic about it when he held on and didn't pass out until the end. Henry's face lightened, and they thanked Giles for saying that. Giles apologized for his rudeness and said he would now treat him as equal friends. Rick gave them a big smile and told them they should go to the bath together, as proof that they were all equal now. The two agreed, and they headed to the bath. When they got to the large bath, Rick realized, since the men and women didn't attend at the same time, there was no specific bath for men and women. Giles noticed Rick's body and said he had a crazy big body. Rick chuckled as he flexed it and said he worked hard for it. They heard a familiar voice inside the tub and figured it was Ark's. When they took off all of their clothes, they walked to the door excitedly to take a bath with the whole squad. They opened the door and greeted Ark, but 2 pairs of melons greeted them. Ark and Angelica were inside, naked, and they were dumbfounded when they realized Ark was actually a woman. Man, we just got flashed again. I hope it doesn't stop. Just kidding. After a few minutes, Angelica was threatening Rick for plucking his eyeball out so he wouldn't make the same mistake again, while Ark remained inside, hiding herself. After things cooled down, they all returned to the room to discuss what happened. Ark sighed and apologized for hiding it. Giles was still processing things and asked if Angelica knew it. She said she could tell at first glance, even if she hid her chest. Rick and Giles' jaw dropped, and they said they couldn't tell it at all. Ark was able to talk to Angelica after she met her squad, and she was caught off guard when Angelica blurted out that she was a woman. Angelica assured her she wouldn't tell anyone about her secret, and that she would rely on her if she ever had any trouble inside the academy. Ark closed her eyes and said Angelica was a total goddess, and at this point she was buoyed with respect. She was just worshipping Angelica. Giles asked if he noticed, but Henry said he noticed she was 175 cm below and felt something strange about her. Angelica frowned her brows and asked if she was the only person who didn't understand what he was saying. Giles asked why he pretended to be a guy, but Angelica scolded him and told him to have some delicacy. Ark sighed and said there was no point in hiding it anymore. She told them her real name, Alma Gervais, and Ark was her little brother's name. Most of the students there came from a noble family, and as she said before, she came from a commoner family. The 4 of them lived a modest but happy life. A month ago, their family went out to sell their items. Ark noticed his older sister always carrying a wooden sword around, so Alma said she wanted to become a knight like Angelica. Their parents told them to be careful because that place was known to have some small monsters. Their father felt contented because Alma was there to protect Ark. The two wonder what their life would be like if Alma became a first-class knight. Alma told Ark she would protect him if a monster showed up, but he told her he would be fine because he was now 8 years old. She looked at him and said she would always protect him no matter what. Ark sighed and said he would allow her until he was 10, but Alma patted his head and told him until he would be taller than her. Alma's soul almost left his body when he heard a terrifying scream from behind. Her parents were bleeding and were below a gigantic rock scorpion whom only a first-class knight could take care of. Her father screamed and told her to take Ark to a safe place because she would be no match for this huge monster for now. Alma exclaimed she couldn't leave them like this, but her father screamed and told her they would be fine, but in a glimpse, a hole was pierced through his chest. Alma was shaking in fear as she called her dad. Ark suddenly came running towards her mom to save her, but he did not notice the scorpion's tail. Alma acted quickly and dashed towards him. She grabbed him to the side to evade the sharp tail and fell to the ground. She asked her brother if he was alright, but was shocked to see his arm with a deep laceration. Her eyes widened when she noticed the wound. There was poison on it. She got distracted when she heard her mom calling her. She was in tears and sorrow was buried behind those smiles as she told Alma to protect her brother. In a second, her mom's flesh and blood came raining down on them. Alma was in deep torment at the moment and processing what had happened. Her body felt numb as she saw the scorpion approaching them. She tightly hugged her brother as she let the monster grab them, but in a gush of the wind, 2 strong men appeared and sliced the monster's arm. Her eyes widened when she realized those men were knights. A man with the knights asked them if they were alright. After a few minutes, they were brought to the hospital. The headmaster approached her and apologized for being unable to save their parents. Alma asked about her brother, so the headmaster told her his life was not at risk, but the scorpion's poison was impossible to remove. He handed over the medical expenses, and Alma was shocked to see how expensive it was. He added that they could only extend Ark's life for 7 months, which surprised her. The headmaster couldn't abandon them after he got this involved, so he asked if she wanted to be a knight. Alma nodded and asked why. He said he was the headmaster of the Night Academy, and offered her to be the top of their school as she graduated to become an officer, who would receive welfare from the country that would cover all of her family's medical expenses. He added that she would take 6 months to graduate so he could make it in time to pay for Ark's treatment. Alma went silent, sorting her thoughts about the offer. The headmaster chuckled awkwardly and said he wished to help her with the medical fees, but it was too much for him. Alma looked at him and agreed to take his offer. She added that she would do everything if it meant she could save her little brother. So she entered the academy as a man, because the enrollment for women was much later. She had no choice but to disguise herself as a man, but she halted talking when she heard sobbing. Angelica and Guile were crying themselves out from the story of her life. Henry and Guile presented themselves and told her to rely on them if she needed someone. Alma was flustered, but the two told her not to think of it as troubling them because they were in the same squad. Alma became speechless and eventually started sobbing. Her heart was touched upon knowing her friends loved her, the love she missed from her parents. Rick suddenly spoke, saying they should notice by now how weird their squad was going compared to the others. He added that things would be difficult for Alma if this continues. He smiled and announced that he would be training the three of them. Rick said the entrance exam would be in 6 months, but they should focus on the midterm exam in 3 months because he was certain the instructor would eliminate them as much as possible. He exclaimed that they should train to put those instructors to shame, and his squad smiled and agreed with him. Guile was so excited and said he wanted to do the same training as Rick, but he replied by saying not to rush towards death when he's this young. Angelica added that the exam wouldn't have been the issue if his spirit had been broken. Guile was dumbfounded and asked if his training was that difficult, but Rick told him they should talk about it right now. He looked at his squad and told them about the Great Four foundation they would focus on in the training. Guile was shocked when he heard that Rick would be training their body and magic and their midterm written exam. He said there were many areas outside of his expertise, so he told them to follow him. They walked to the back of the school to tell them his secret, since Ark had told them hers. He apologized and said he entered the academy to look for something and not to become a knight. The three chuckled because they already knew it, and Guile added he was asking about a jewel from Lahea, making Angelica sigh because Rick sucked at keeping a low profile. She and Rick pushed the bush to the side and revealed a door in the wall. Guile got excited, but Rick told them to keep it a secret because they would be working with some other people outside the school. Ark figured normal people wouldn't be able to open it, and it was this door's lock. Only Rick and his teachers could open it. When they got out, they met the Orichalcum Fist in the woods. They greeted everyone, so Rick introduced the teachers who trained him. He added that he had already talked to them about their circumstances and told them not to hold back in their training. Rick was more like introducing death to his friends at this point. Rick asked about how his healing went with Ark's little brother. Still, Blowstone said the rock scorpion's poison was difficult because if healing magic wasn't applied as soon as the condition contracted, the effectiveness of the healing magic drops drastically. It has been a month since he was poisoned, so even if he were to be revived after perishing, the poison would still be there. They were surprised when they heard a loud thud. Henry fell like a log after seeing Blowstone and said he was 230 centimeters tall. Angelica couldn't blame him because this orc could be in a horror movie. Guile was starstruck by Blowstone because he knew he was the winner of the Fist Kings tournament. Angelica nodded and said Rick, Lynette, and Blowstone were also her teachers, so Ark looked at Rick and apologized for her rudeness. They went to an open field nearby. It was wide, and if they used it at night, they wouldn't be found by anyone. Before they began the training, they had to decide who would be teaching who. When Alicet and Mizet were assigned to teach Guile, Mizet sighed and said he wanted to teach Ark. Maybe about his love. Just kidding. Henry was assigned to work with Rick and Blowstone. Rick would be ensuring that Henry wouldn't be killed. He would basically be keeping an eye on his teacher, and Ark was assigned to work with Lynette and Angelica. Rick reminded his teachers to do their best to avoid casualties, and that they shouldn't train these three past their limits because they aren't slow starters like him. By looking at their faces, they may not be responding, but Rick knew they wouldn't be listening to him. Since it was getting late, they discussed the training a little before they went back to the academy. The following day, their squad was walking back to their room after their daily training, and they noticed how harsh they were to their squad again. Rick wondered why he was the only one in their squad receiving easy training, but they figured it was because of Vidar's, how he crushed him with one punch. Rick reminded them to eat and rest a bit before their training. Guile was so pumped up, but little did they know they would be crying their butt off later. After lights out, Angelica walked to the hidden door to check on them. She could still hear the noises coming from the open field. She sighed and walked through the forest, and when she saw them, they were being chased, dragged, and slashed like a total hellscape. Angelica screamed to call for a meeting. She asked what they were doing. Alicet explained she was just throwing mud balls with magic in it. Rick said he was just running and pulling Guile like he did with her, and Lynette said it was only normal sparring. None of their statements could justify the difficulty they thought they were doing, because it looked like they were torturing the three. Angelica panted in anger and said she thought things would be fine if Rick was there, but she remembered he was crazy as well. She figured she also had to supervise Guile and Henry while training Ark. She placed her hand on her waist and scolded them for making the students withstand this crazy training. Meanwhile, while they were being scolded, the three almost passed out from pain and exhaustion, but somehow, Guile looked like a zombie and Busan bit him. Blowstone reminded Angelica he could heal them so they could continue, but suddenly, Ark spoke, saying she would continue the training for the sake of her brother. Guile scoffed and said he wouldn't allow being left behind while Ark got stronger, so Henry nodded in agreement. The three looked at them and begged Angelica to allow them to continue training. She was dumbfounded, but Rick and Blowstone smiled, proud of their braveness. Ark told her she would do it at her own risk, so Angelica decided to allow them but banned the trainers from killing their students. When they resumed their training, Blowstone started off by working on their physical fitness so they would be able to survive their training. After a few minutes, the students went to their respective teachers. Eldwarf showed them how to use body strengthening, Lynette showed how to be precise with every movement of her muscles, and Elicito basically did a mukbang to increase their mana and satisfy Elicito's cravings. After resting, Angelica demonstrated how to mix their own specialty with swordsmanship, and for Rick they ran endlessly, so the next day the three were sleeping in class. After classes they resumed their training when the light was out. Lynette cooked food for them to enjoy, but the next day they were studying. Their squad was multitasking to improve themselves. They were working together with the same goal. At least they managed to stay alive during the training. Another day came, and it was time for the mountain running course. Rick was assigned to run a 20-kilometer while the rest of his squad would have to run 30 kilometers. Pedek was baffled when he saw Rick running back to the field, and it had only been 15 minutes since they started. He asked Rick if it was alright to leave his squad behind, but Rick was confident that they would arrive on time. Pedek scoffed and thought Rick was bluffing, but after an hour and 40 minutes, the three were seen running towards the gate. When they officially announced their arrival, Guile became teary-eyed because he was proud of Henry for finishing the course by himself. Rick commended them for their excellent work, but Pedek was left dumbfounded, wondering how they finished that ridiculous course. That night, during their usual training, Rick saw Henry sitting on the floor as he watched the two running. Henry chuckled and said it was hard for him to keep up with them. Rick told him it would be alright if he wanted to rest for the midterm exam. Henry frowned and looked away. Rick asked if he was worried about whether he would be able to pass. Henry nodded and said he was also worried about being separated from the Guile and Ark. Henry was certain the two would pass. Henry was bullied and has never been able to make friends until now. The two of them were the first people who treated him as a real friend. He sighed and said he was scared he might fail and get separated from them. He remembered the day of the sparring when he was the only one who couldn't do anything. Henry thought he would chicken out if he got paired with someone bigger than him, but Rick told him it would be fine. Henry said it wouldn't matter to him, but Rick cut him off and said if he really didn't want to get separated from his friends, he could use it as a source of strength. He added that he had worked hard for these 3 months, so Rick assured him things would be okay. Henry finally smiled and thanked Rick. The next day was the written exam, and the academy was quiet because every student was so focused on their exams. When the time was up, Guile's brain was so dry that it looked like it had been placed in a dryer. Rick chuckled and asked if he was okay. Their squad gathered and went out of the room. Out of nowhere, Guile started screaming, saying he would let his anger out in the practical. After lunch, the students gathered in the field for their practical examination. Each squad would be going up against another squad, but Rick's squad had felt something strange already. Angelica called them and said she would be cheering on them. Pedek called Rick's squad and the squad 416 to the front. When squad 416 came out, they looked like a bunch of gym rat gangsters. Rick spoke and asked who these squads were. Pedek scoffed and said they must have forgotten them from being too focused on their studies. Pedek called the students, asking if they knew squad 416, and they all said yes. Rick figured these students had fallen into line. Angelica could tell the lowest among that squad was around a second-class knight. Rick was about to reply when Guile burst his anger out. He cursed and asked how dirty he was willing to act before he could be satisfied. When Guile comes to the front saying he will beat them to ass, Pedek calls one of the squad 416, telling him about Guile's weaknesses. Henry and Ark figured this man was a magic user, which was Guile's worst matchup. When they began, the two glared at each other. The man said a person who couldn't use magic had no right to graduate from their school. He ignited a flame on her left hand and threw the fire ray attack in his direction. Guile was still angry. He did not move as he activated his iron body and sturdy sword. In the blink of an eye, Guile successfully slashed it off. The man was surprised by his defense. Guile exclaimed that the attack was too weak compared to Alicet's magic, which would have turned him to ashes long ago. When he raised his sword and activated an attack strengthening, the man became anxious and thought this was different from what he was told. Guile smashed his wooden sword at him, and the man was pushed to the floor due to his power and eventually lost the fight. Pedek was left dumbfounded by the result. Rick commended him as he walked back to his squad. Henry and Ark smiled at him and gave him a high five. Rick asked who would go next, so Ark volunteered. She was confident as she walked to the front because she was trained by the strongest teachers in the world. As Ark's opponent came to the front, Rick and Angelica said this man was a clear power type. When the match had officially begun, the man laughed at her and said he seemed like a woman. He teased her and told her to give up on being a knight, but when he swung his sword at Ark, she was gone. The man flinched when he heard a voice from behind. He swung his sword at her again, but it missed. Ark mocked him and told him to try to aim better. The man cursed and swung his sword multiple times in a second, but Ark evaded it without breaking a sweat. Ark told him he would be the weakest if he couldn't land his blows, even if he was the strongest. The man was getting frustrated, so Ark decided to end the match. Ark ran to him just as Angelica and Lynette taught her. She used the cutting thread and the man grunted in pain. He was caught off guard and fell unconscious on the floor. Pedek shrieked in shock. Ark walked back to his friends and they congratulated Ark for her performance. She gave the two a high five, and from a distance the headmaster Klein was watching, smiling proudly at her. When Henry was told to step up, he started sweating cold. The next man on the lineup asked Pedek why his students' strengths differed from what he had told them. Pedek told him to calm down because the next one had no talent in in combat skills. The man walked while Henry was repeating inside his brain that he would graduate with his friends. When the match had begun, the man from Squad 416 charged forward. Henry was caught off guard, but he could already feel the trembling fear inside him, eating him alive. When the man swung the sword at him, everybody was shocked when the man stopped midway. There was a moment of silence before the man stood up straight and told him he couldn't attack someone who had lost the will to fight. Henry sighed and went back to his squad, but his friends cheered him up. Rick patted him and said trauma wasn't something that could be overcome easily. Henry was losing hope because no matter how hard he trained, he still lost against fear. A huge guy who looked like Blowstone with a wig on walked to the front. He told Pettick not to stop him if his opponent would start screaming and crying in pain. Pettick nodded and began the match. The man screamed at Rick that he would show no mercy to a middle-aged guy like him. But before he could finish it, his life was finished because Rick sent him flying. He's been Looney Tuned. When the midterm exam results came out, Rick told them not to worry because he knew they all did their best to pass the exam. Guile was so worried about his written exam, while Henry was so anxious about his practical. When Ark opened her envelope, she was glad that she was ranked at the top of their class. Rick looked at Guile when he screamed in excitement. Rick chuckled as he figured he had passed. So when they all looked at Henry, he was staring blankly at the envelope. After a few hours, Henry was sitting alone in the field watching the sunset. Rick found him and walked to him. Henry felt his presence, so he spoke, saying practical skill was important for a knight. Rick said they should go and ask the instructors for a second chance, but Henry said it was fine. After losing the practical skill exam, he couldn't imagine how the school would treat him. He smiled and said he would drop out of school but not give up on becoming a knight. When he added that he would enroll again next year, he started crying and said he would catch up to Ark and Guile. Rick could feel how painful it was for him, but he didn't know what to say anymore. Henry wiped his tears and said he would leave by the morning. He added that he was truly indebted to him and asked him if he could give him some time to himself. Rick said okay and left him there in silence. Meanwhile, Guile was pacing back and forth beside one of the buildings. Ark told him to calm down a little, but he told him Henry could have passed the exam and asked what they could do to help Henry. Ark sighed and said she also wanted to help him, but her words were cut off when Guile started running off, saying his head would explode in anger. Rick and Angelica were walking down the hall. Angelica said it was a shame Henry did not pass. Rick sighed and said he was distracting himself by searching for the jewel, but he couldn't concentrate because of Henry's situation. Their party had been searching for the jewel, but they hadn't found any clue. When Henry returned to their room, he was packing up his stuff when he saw his favorite book. He opened it and saw what Yamato said. Give up? I don't know the meaning of that word. Henry stared at that phrase for minutes and reflected on it. Going back to Ark, she was left there alone on the bench, but she suddenly noticed someone behind the bush. She was scanning the figure, but was alarmed when the man with a cloak rushed to her with a thin sword in his hand. Ark crouched to evade it and landed a blow on his abdomen. The man grunted and was sent flying a few meters. Henry flinched when he heard a loud thud. He heard Ark asking someone who he was. Ark was shocked when 5 more people appeared from the dark. She was even more surprised to see a familiar face. The headmaster greeted her and commended her skills. The men around Klein walked closer to her, making her feel nervous. He gave her a creepy grin and apologized for doing this earlier than he planned. Ark was confused, so she asked what he meant. She wondered if he had deceived her and the instructors, so Klein said he was only using this academy as a cover-up to his plans. The instructors were knocked out at this moment, so that Klein could do anything freely. The headmaster looked at his men and ordered them to capture her, while trying not to inflict great wounds. The 4 men simultaneously attacked her, so she used the sword she picked up to defend herself, but they outnumbered her. She knew these men were knights based on their skills. She gasped when Guile came out of nowhere and punched the man who grabbed her arm. The man crashed on the floor. He asked Ark who these people were, but he was shocked when he saw the headmaster. Ark told him she hadn't quite caught up with what was happening. Out of the blue, a voice chanted a first-order magic, an electric shock, on a man with a cloak. Ark and Guile glanced in its direction and saw Henry. Guile patted him for coming out of his room. In a split second, the headmaster was already before Ark. They were caught off guard by his speed, so Guile acted quickly and aimed it to slash him with the sword. But an unexplainable phenomenon happened. His sword slipped off of the headmaster. Guile grunted when he felt a sharp, heavy pain in his abdomen. He couldn't even make any other sound as he was flying in the air. Henry was stoned to the ground as he saw Guile. The two crashed, and Guile lost consciousness on the floor. Ark looked at them, wondering how an old man like his could generate this much power. Her eyes widened when she felt a tingling pain in her back that caused her to lose consciousness. One of Klein's men carried her on his shoulder, but they stopped when Henry called them. He pleaded and told them to release Ark. The headmaster chuckled and told him to quit and not to follow them. Before he could even talk back, Henry felt his head getting heavy and eventually fainted. Henry's body dropped to the floor while Klein walked away with his men and Ark. After a few minutes, Rick arrived and was shocked to see their state. He was relieved when Henry woke up, so he asked if he was alright. Henry immediately rose and asked where Ark was. Rick told him she was nowhere to be found, so Henry said he didn't know why why the headmaster abducted her. He looked at Guile, so Rick told him Blowstone healed him from his severe injuries. Henry stood up and said he would head out. Rick was dumbfounded and asked where he would go. He said he would save Ark, but Rick told him his opponents were strong enough to beat the three of them. Henry halted and said he may be right. He was still terrified, but he added that it wasn't a reason to abandon his friend. Rick smiled and said he may be unable to muster his courage for his own sake, but he could overcome fear for the people important to him. Henry smiled, happy upon hearing those words from Rick, but he said his body was honest, that he was scared because his legs were trembling. He sighed and called himself pathetic because he had failed school and couldn't save his friend. Rick told him it was okay to be afraid because he would be afraid if he were in his shoes. He held his shoulder and told him they're friends, and they were not the type who would give up. Henry dropped his jaw when the Orichalcum Fist walked to them and said they would help him. Good heavens, would you look at the time? It's time to go beat someone over. When they went to the field, Blowstone told them he noticed Henry had an aptitude for magic. He looked at Rick and told him to try to teach him his tricks. Henry asked what it was, so Rick smiled at him and said he would teach his surefire move. After a few minutes, they were done and went to their camp outside the academy. Blowstone healed their injuries and Guile was just sleeping like a baby. Lynette suddenly came, asking if they were done with their preparations. The two nodded. Rick asked if Henry was sure it was the headmaster that he saw. So Henry nodded and said Klein went to the left and spoke about the hundreds of knights. Their party gathered to check the map and plot their plan. Blowstone asked Angelica if she would be fine on her own, but she reassured him this duty would be easier for a knight. Alicet was tasked to send a familiar to Lady Mia, so their party marched forward to rescue Ark when they were done. In Mia's mansion, she told her butler that they should now take their rest. She sighed and said it was a relief that the Orichalcum Fist hadn't returned after the chaos that had occurred 3 months ago. The butler nodded and told her that the guild shouldn't be bothering them now to request another. But speaking of the devil, Alicet's familiar broke through the window. The cute little bat spoke and told Mia they wanted to ask another favor. Meanwhile, Ark, who was starting to regain consciousness, noticed that her wrists were tied to a pole. Klein greeted her with that creepy smile. He walked to her and said she was inside the Knight's Eastern headquarters, which had been used before in a war, the sturdiest office in existence. He told her that no matter how strong that 32-year-old friend of hers was, he wouldn't be able to pass through their security. The headmaster started to tell a story when he was sent to the front lines of the Great War. He said he used a fake name at the academy and had gained weight, so he was unrecognizable from the photos in history books. Ark was confused when she heard he was in a history book, so Klein revealed that he was a special knight from the kingdom's chivalric order, Klein, Gareth, and Noble. Ark flinched in shock while Klein chuckled and said it was nice to meet her again. She knew that there were only 13 knights in history to make it to a special class, and that Klein was known to be an amazing warrior and leader in that great war. She thought Rick might have a hard time defeating this creep. Klein snickered and told her to behave and quit her weak attempts to end this without suffering more because that would lower her value as a product. Ark was dumbfounded, so Klein said he was doing human trafficking for the money casually. He had a request for a girl her age who had high magic power and combat ability. Ark glared at him and said this would trace back to him, but Klein replied that he had already laid down all the groundwork. He made the teachers look like they were robbed, so a missing student wouldn't be strange. Klein stared at her straight in the eye, said he could easily cover his dirt with the power he had gained, and told her to accept her fate as merchandise. Ark thought of her brother and decided that she would go with his plan just to save his brother, but she got confused when Klein started chuckling. He said that her little brother was nothing more than a hostage, and he would exterminate him after he sold her. Her face went pale after realizing how fudged up her situation was. Klein called her naive for believing everything that happened was only an accident. He smirked and said he planned everything to make her enter the academy, starting from that scorpion to poison her brother. She looked at him in disbelief and asked about her parents. Klein raised both of her eyebrows, trying to remember who they were. When he finally remembered, their parents were in the way, so he had to exterminate them. She couldn't believe this old creep was saying all of this with a smile and no sign of remorse. She burst out crying and shouting at him that she would crush him to ashes. She tried to kick and remove the tie on her arms to get him, but Klein said her spirit should be able to sell her for quite a bit. Due to her fuss, Klein had to knock her out again to keep her quiet while on the road. She cried and begged him to stop it, but when she closed her eyes, she heard a loud boom. He rushed out of the window and saw the explosion on one of their walls. One of his men informed him that there were some people invading their base. Klein looked at him and asked the numbers, and the man said there were 4 people outside trying to get inside. What the freak? This mother-father Eldwarf brought a tank to the fight. Rick and Henry sneaked to the back while those 4 were putting on a show. Rick told him they would split up to look for Ark when they got inside. A bunch of knights gathered at the south gate, and they were surprised to see a maid. Lynette was not putting on any expression when she told them to tell her any time if anyone wished to surrender. She crossed her arms before her in a swift, and in a blink of an eye, she had gone past them, but a sharp thread of winds went through their weapon and body. Simultaneously, the knights grunted in pain and dropped to the floor. The knights who saw it were caught off guard and became Lynette's next victims. Another incoming knight used their shields to defend themselves as they approached her, but that did not stop her. Lynette told them that they were pretty lucky compared to the other 3, because she was still within the realm of humans. In the east gate, the knights had Blowstone with their weapons, but they were confused as to why their attacks couldn't do anything to him. Blowstone finally spoke and commended the first-class knight for the strengthening weapon, but when he told them they lacked strength, he swung his arm and threw everyone off the ground because of the impact. When their captain figured they could not win against the orc. They brought the giant golem they made. Blowstone scanned it and said their squad might be up to no good for producing a man-made monster. The golem growled at him, making him think he should hold back against a lifeless thing like this. When the monster swung its fist at him, the knights gasped in shock when the explosion occurred, creating a huge hole in their golem. It looks like these knights would be meeting the Grim Reaper any second now. At the west gate, the knights were shocked to see a kid riding a tank. Eldwarf came out of his tank and jumped out of it. The two knights calmly walked to him, asking who told him to do this, treating him like a child, but they gasped when two loud noises lingered, and those two dropped to the floor, losing consciousness from the impact of the bullet. His guns were loaded with electric magic to knock his opponents out. It was too late when the knights figured he was a threat, because Eldwarf had already rained them with his bullets. When his bullets ran out, he swiftly grabbed another pair of guns and continued the torture with a smirk. When he got tired of using it, he took out the bazooka and bombed the hell out of them. Unlike the other three, Eldwarf would keep blasting large ranger attacks until these people surrendered. On the other hand, Alicet surprised the knights at the north gate. She came flying through the hole like she was only playing and excitedly said she was told to use as much magic as she wanted, until everybody bled to death. She chuckled and started playing with them. With that second, we witnessed another massacre using different types of magic. During those huge waves, one of the knights ordered the archers in the towers to fire their attacks, but before the arrow could even land on Alicet, it turned to ashes. Alicet swung her fingers left to right, and when an explosion occurred, she chuckled and said playing with them was really fun. The way everyone except Alicet downplays themselves is hilarious. Klein was watching everyone in his room, and he knew these people bring trouble, so he had to move and wrap things up elsewhere. He walked back to her and placed his palm on her head to put her back to sleep. Ark's tears fell as she accepted her faith, but to their surprise, Henry came in to stop this creep. Klein looked at him and gave him a mischievous grin. The Silent Night became a nightmare for those unfortunate knights. All of them were deployed to the field to defend their headquarters, and now Klein had to protect his merchandise. Henry was sweating and panting for air when Klein told him to give up so he would not end up getting hurt. He gave him a chance to leave because he didn't want to hurt one of his students. He added that he could still go back to his bed in the dorm to continue his study, but before he could even complete his words, Henry stomped his feet and told him to release Ark. Klein smirked as he figured Henry wouldn't listen, but Ark suddenly spoke, telling him she was glad he came to save him. She told Henry to get out of there because it would be impossible to defeat this man. Henry kept his eyes on Klein and said he knew he was Klein. Gareth ignoble. Ark was shocked because he already knew it. Henry noticed it by his hair color, the shape of Klein's body, facial features, and inherent skill. Klein smiled and thought instead of giving up, despite knowing it, he still chose to challenge him. His grim smile sent a shiver down his spine when Klein accepted his challenge. Henry was sweating from nervousness, but he dared to charge towards him and activate a first-order magic. Klein remained calm, and Henry found himself tripping over something in a split second. He fell, and his face landed on the floor. Klein immediately kicked his face, threw him off, and crashed into the wall. Ark called him worriedly. Henry was bleeding out blood as he coughed. Klein told him that no matter how hard he tried, he would never lay a finger on him, so he asked him again to quit and return to the academy. Ark screamed at Henry and told him to get out and save himself. Klein nodded and told him to listen to his friend and give up, but Henry suddenly said, "Give up? I don't know the meaning of the words." Ark knew the familiar line, but this old creep got confused and called him stupid. Klein walked to his wall and took his sword to finish this challenge. Henry picked up his glasses and revealed that Klein could control the force of friction of two objects' points of contact running parallel to each other. Klein thought it would be useless for Henry to realize it too late, but his thoughts were interrupted when Guile came crashing into the window. He tried to land his kick on the headmaster, but as expected, he dodged it easily. Guile slid to Henry's side, who couldn't believe he had climbed the tall wall. He asked how he knew where they were, but he snickered and said this old villain should be at the top of the noisy place. He paused when he noticed Ark tied up, but Klein was on the way. To save Ark, they had to defeat the headmaster first, so Henry told Guile how Klein uses his skills in a battle. He added that Klein's ability may look plain, but he could completely nullify physical attacks. Klein could also raise the friction to make his attack unavoidable and hit them in full blow, but that could only be effective within a 7-meter radius. Klein chuckled and commended Henry's marvelous observation. He added that he would make them understand that they wouldn't stand a chance against him. Henry knew the best plan against him was to attack with magic from outside his effective range, but he was doubting his magic skills against a special class like him. Guile suddenly had an idea and moved closer to whisper it to him. Henry said they might not be able to take him by surprise, but they decided to finish it before Aniki arrived. Guile activated his sturdy fist while Henry started chanting. The familiar chant made Klein squint his eyes. Henry hopped on Guile's palm and was thrown in the air above the headmaster. He activated the first order magic and released the air shot straight to his face. Luckily, it caught Klein off guard and pushed him back a little. The two were glad their idea worked. It was clever to use a close-range spell as a long-range spell, but that amount of power was not enough to put a scratch on him. The two were starting to get nervous as they watched him lift his sword. In a swift, Klein was already before him, pointing the tip at Henry and saying he had no more time to play around. Henry was caught off guard, and he knew it would be impossible to dodge this one, but a terrifying sight flashed. Guile threw himself and blocked the sword with his own body. Ark and Henry were terrified when Guile fell and bathed with with his own blood. Klein chuckled and acted like he only killed a roach. Henry rushed to him and put pressure on the wound. He was crying as he told him he would immediately take him to Blowstone. Guile suddenly coughed out blood and was losing blood way too much. He looked at him and reminded Henry that he was his first friend, because the friends he had before were only there out of fear of him. He smiled and said that Henry was his first friend. Before he could finish his words, he started coughing, and Klein was already beside this with his weapon in the air. He told them to shut up and continue this on the other side. He swung his sword, but a strong force stopped it. Klein was surprised when he saw Rick apologizing to his friends for being late. He looked at them and told them to leave the rest to him. Klein pulled his arm away from Rick immediately. Rick told Henry that taking Guile to Blowstone in that status would take too much time. Henry was so lost and didn't know what to do. Rick told him to do what he trained for. Henry nodded and faced Guile to tell him to stay still. He told Guile that he couldn't keep up with their physical training, so he trained in support magic, particularly healing magic. Henry wanted to be strong like Yamato, but he thought of doing things he could. Rick had now trusted Guile to Henry, and now it was time to face this old monkey. Klein was still wondering how this man got close to him without realizing it and stopped his attack. Henry told Rick about Klein's inherent skill, so he thanked him. Rick was about to start this battle, but the headmaster suddenly spoke in his low voice, saying he may be old but still a special knight class. Rick asked if that was his surrender statement, but Klein grinned and threatened to do what he said, if he wanted to keep Alma's little brother Ark alive. After hearing that, the two were left silent, so Klein showed them a magic stone that would signal his men inside the hospital to exterminate Ark. The hospital was over 30 kilometers away, so they could not get there now. Rick gritted his teeth and called him a dirty man, but Klein took it as a compliment, as he was a human trafficker. Klein told them not to do anything, including healing Guile. Henry flinched in shock, so Guile told him it was alright, since the bleeding stopped already. The sight of her friends suffering without being able to do anything was tormenting Alma. Klein told Rick not to move and use any techniques to avoid damage. All Rick was instructed was to stand back up as Klein tormented him. Rick did not speak and followed his orders, and in a blink, a fistful blow landed on his abdomen. Rick grunted in pain as he received that fatal blow. He flew away and crashed on the floor. Alma thought that even if Rick was strong, taking that blow from a special class knight without guarding would be fatal. When Rick reached his foot, Klein chuckled and commended him for surviving his attack even if he was only a B rank. Rick was huffing for air, thinking this could end badly if it continued. Klein attacked again, giving him a hard punch that threw him off balance. The old man stepped on his head and pressed it while saying he would be enjoying this moment for a bit. He ordered Rick to stand up because he was not yet finished. Rick followed him and grunted from the kick he took. He slid on the floor as Klein took his sword, saying Rick was sturdier than expected. The headmaster walked to him and pierced his sword through Rick's hand. He grunted in pain, so Henry spoke, telling Klein to do it to him instead. Due to his bravery, Klein got annoyed and slapped his cheek. He told them that everyone who was not being sold would not leave his room alive. He glanced at Guile and grinned. He said that the boy was suffering and thought of relieving him of his pain, so he pulled his sword and faced the unconscious Guile. Alma could still hear the people fighting outside, so the four couldn't get there to help them. She started trembling and thought Guile might perish because of her. She screamed from the bottom of her lungs to stop him, but a bat squeaked and flew inside out of nowhere. Klein got distracted and wondered what this creature was. This bat was Alicet's familiar, and Rick heard a familiar voice through it. Rick was relieved to hear her, so he grinned and said he was glad to hear Angelica's voice. Angelica apologized for making him wait and informed him that the little boy was now safe and sound. Angelica smirked and told him to take her anger to the headmaster. Klein was speechless and thought Angelica had gone missing earlier to get to the hospital when he attacked the teachers. Rick got excited because he could now face him without holding back. Klein snickered and told him not to get carried away because he lost his hostage. He added that a B rank like him would be no match for him. He pointed the sword and said all knights have the kill secret technique, and he maxed out the sword strengthening and reduced the friction to 0. Before he could finish talking, Rick had already landed his fist on his face. Poor villain, he doesn't even get to speak of his attack name before taking that ordinary punch. Finally, Alma was saved, so she thanked them for helping her. She looked for Guile and saw Henry resuming his healing magic on him. Guile, Rick, and Ark thanked and commended him for his hard work. Meanwhile, Klein was on the floor with no tooth left. She asked if he was already dead, but Rick said no because he held back. She thought of ending his life for her mom and dad, but as a knight she decided to keep him alive. Henry suddenly called Rick, asking if he used any magic attack on the headmaster, but he replied, saying he just punched him like he always did. They went silent when they heard Klein groaning in pain. The headmaster suddenly made weird noises, and black liquid came out of his eyeballs and body. They all gasped when that black thing formed into a colossal monster. Henry scanned it and figured it was a demon lord beast from the legends of Yamato. Rick was surprised to see a glowing stone on its head, and knew it was one of the 6 jewels. Their guild wasn't able to find the jewel because it was in the headmaster all along. The demon lord screeched, which echoed around the area. The monster attacked them, so the 4 jumped off. Half of the building was smashed to pieces. Rick and his friends were still alive and kicking. He had decided to order the 3 to stand back and release a full chanted attack on the demon. He told Henry to watch his fully chanted air shot. Henry looked closely as Rick started the incantation. The surrounding force whirled and was compressed into a smaller, more vital force. Henry was in awe to witness the air being condensed around Rick's fist in an instant. Henry told the 2 to move back and take cover, as Rick swung his fist toward the demon lord. sword. He released a powerful airshot that blew the heck out of the monster. The remaining parts of the building got caught and got crushed to bits. That airshot was wide, and it completely blew away the demon. They gasped when they saw the glowing stone in the sky. Since Rick purposely avoided the stone, the demon was using the stone's power to regenerate. It would be hard to make another fully chanted attack with Rick's mana. However, Henry had the courage to pick up the sword and ran towards the demon. Rick tried to stop him, but he did not listen. Ark and Guile followed Henry, and the three were unstoppable. Henry tossed the sword to Ark and told them to do what they had been training for. Guile screamed to increase their morale, and Rick watched them from afar. Henry amplified his magic. Guile applied a strengthening magic, while Ark swung the sword. Their skills were coordinated in a special training Rick didn't know about. Henry suddenly remembered what his dad had told him, that he was proud of Henry, and that he believed that he would be a great man someday. He finally realized that those words were his dad's true feelings, and after all he went through, Henry had become a man who could save his friends, a man who became the best son. The three activated their skills and released the Trinity Saber at the monster's head. The Demon Lord's face was sliced in half in the blink of an eye. The eerie aura banished to thin air. Rick was speechless at their performance because they were only half his age and had already gone this far. Those eyes, you could tell he could feel jealous of them. From a village nearby, a man inside a carriage saw the headquarters state and thought the request for reinforcements wasn't a joke. An older man asked him if they should go there, so the man with dark hair nodded and said he wanted to meet the person who fired the airshot. Going back to the ruined headquarters, Rick picked up the third jewel and figured it was the green ego. He started to wonder how it got to Klein's hand and absorbed it into his body. He thought maybe somebody in the same background as them was pulling strings. Guile and the others had arrived, asking his thoughts about their secret coordinated special move. Rick smiled and said it was impressive. Henry approached him asking if he found what he had been looking for. When Rick said yes, Henry felt sad as the thought of Rick leaving the academy sunk in. Rick smiled bitterly and said he still had more things to do. Henry nodded and said he would also leave since he got expelled. Guile gasped upon remembering it and realized they would be losing them at once. Rick cheered them up and told them they could come to their base sometime to hang out. Since Angelica brought her little brother to their base, they could use this chance to show them how to get there. The sun was peeking out of the mountain when they got to the field. The knights were wiped out, but they are still alive. The three were amazed by how the four managed to hold back while taking this many. The three ran immediately to follow Rick down the mountain. When they got to a river, they noticed a boat. Rick's teachers were on the boat, waving at them. Lynette noticed his bruises, so she asked what happened. Eldwarf checked on everyone before he started the engine. They were shocked when they heard the noise from the ship. It was their first time seeing such a vehicle, so the three wondered how it was moving. Rick continued explaining that the jewel was inside the headmaster's body. He told them a monster that resembled the Demon Lord came out of Klein, and this stone was fused with the monster's body. Blowstone was confused and said he had to check with a person regarding it. Rick asked if it was Reinhardt he was referring to. Blowstone nodded in response. They were sailing out to sea and felt confident no one would come after them. The five flinched as they felt that immense mana behind them. When they turned, they saw a man standing on the water. That's not Jesus though. Well, the man kind of looks like Krallo from HXH, not gonna lie. They felt no magic, but the man was standing on the water like it was all natural. Angelica noticed the familiar uniform. Blowstone gave Alicet a signal, so she cast a vast magic attack towards him. The man drew his sword out and swiftly slashed it in half. The strike from the sword caused the water to move and almost flipped their boat over. Rick was shocked to witness how that man cut Alicet's magic, so before reinforcements arrived, Eldwarf activated the full speed of the boat. The man on the water stared at them and wondered if that magic attack pushed them to the side. An older man called him Mikhail, so he hurried back to the land. The man sighed and told him to pay more attention to his position. Mikhail apologized and said he was still ignorant of the world's ways. He added that a lazy man like Klein wouldn't stand against those people. The older man agreed and said this saved them the effort of punishing Klein because he was only a disgrace to them. When Rick and his friend arrived after over a day, they ran up to the mountain, and the three almost passed out from exhaustion. When they got inside, they were in awe of the huge castle. Angelica welcomed them as they walked inside the castle and said she had been there more than half a day ago. Alma bowed before her and thanked her for saving her little brother. She escorted her to her brother's room, and when they got inside, his brother was sleeping on a bed. Her eyes became warm and watery. She called Ark and started crying. That was when Guile remembered Ark was the name of her brother. It looks like he got used to calling her Ark. Blowstone walked to them and informed them that he would examine him for a second. He said that the poison was still there, and it would take him 10 days to heal fully. She smiled upon hearing it and asked how much it would cost, but Blowstone told her it wouldn't be necessary, since this would be his way of thanking her for helping Rick. She started sobbing and felt really grateful to them. She told them she would return this favor someday, but Blowstone said that wouldn't be necessary. Angelica suggested that I take a break there because it would be a bit before school started again. After 8 days, they received a letter about what happened to the academy. Angelica looked for Ark or Elma. I'm so confused now. Anyway, she read the letter out loud, and it said that the academy would be reopened in the first week of next month with new sets of instructors. The unfairness inside the academy was rinsed off, and the academy started fresh. It also said that Henry Forcefia's expulsion was retracted. When Guile and Henry heard it, they were so happy. Guile was screaming in joy. Angelica told them that Alma Gervais would be allowed to continue in the current term because of how the previous headmaster tried to use her. Angelica tried to tell them this happened because she petitioned for it, but the two rushed towards Ark's room to inform her. They were speechless when they saw the siblings hugging each other tightly. Ark apologizes to her sister for making her worry, but Alma keeps crying and thanking him for being strong. A few days later, it was time for them to return to the academy. Alma thanked them again from the bottom of her heart. Rick thanked them as well for making his mission fun because of them. Guile might be a big man, but he has a soft heart for his friends. Henry smiled and told Rick they should meet again next time. He did not say thank you to Rick because he wanted to thank him someday, wearing a knight uniform. After a few days, when they left, Rick gasped in disbelief upon seeing the Tower of Papers. Blowstone said they managed to incur another debt to Lady Mina, so they had to clean the problems in their territory. The rest of the members agreed with him and said they also wanted to see Mia. Rick picked the papers and said it would be tough for him to sort everything from large cases to small tasks, but Eldwarf ended up being in awe of his skills. Rick suddenly paused when he saw a case about liberating a village in which a group of Black Curse had set up base. Lynette's attention was piqued when she heard it. Alice had asked what it was, so Rick told her that it was the world's largest criminal organization, and one of its members was the one who abducted them from their pool. Rick thought he could handle it because it seemed to be their top priority at the time. Blowstone asked if he would be fine by himself. Rick said yes, but his sentence was cut off when Lynette volunteered to come along. Rick was glad and said they could finish this case easily now, but Lynette remained silent. After prepping, the two head out. It was already winter in this area. This was Rick's first time coming all the way to Restora's northern edge, and it was freezing. When they arrived at the village, they looked around to observe the place and noticed some unsavory-looking guys were there. He suddenly thought he hadn't done anything with Lynette and him alone since the exam. This made him flush a bit. They sneaked to a bush and saw two men pushing a nervous man around for money. The man snickered and said he could sell off his daughter. Rick frowned his brows and figured these criminals were doing whatever they wanted. After a few seconds, the two squeezed the man and got their money. There were about 200 of them, but Lynette said it would not be a problem for them. He sighed and wondered why the knights hadn't done anything to aid this, but Lynette wondered if corrupt knights were involved in this. The two were surprised when a woman said they were being rude. Angelica exclaimed that sending many people on this snowy mountain was difficult. Angelica keeps spawning in every arc, which is very funny. When she realized who the two were, her eyes popped out in shock, asking what the hell they were doing there. Angelica was sweating because they only said their goodbyes a few days ago. She was starting to get creeped out because they always crossed ways. She couldn't believe there were only two of them when over 200 criminals were there. Lynette emotionlessly thanked her for her help, making them wonder if she lost her emotion in the womb. Rick was in disbelief that his alone time with Lynette was ruined. He asked if Angelica wasn't cold with her skirt, but she scoffed, saying mini skirt users are strong against cold, but her body wasn't lying. She was trembling. She asked if she went there for a jewel, but Rick told her they were on a request from Lady Mia. Angelica said she was on scouting because sending large troops there at once while the enemy's guard was up would be hard, so she was deployed to gather information first. But it looks like they already have far more than enough fighting power. The three had decided to work together to finish it as fast as possible. A deafening scream lingered around the alley. Two women were being threatened and told to come to them, but Angelica stopped them. She screamed and said she was placing them all under arrest with the authority granted to her as a knight. The egghead chuckled and mocked her. Angelica ignored him and told them not to resist and to surrender themselves without getting hurt. The men cursed her and charged towards her with their weapons, but before they could get near her, Rick swung his fist and the force threw them off the ground. The remaining men stopped in shock because their 5 members flew in a single blow. The guy holding the girl told them not to move and pointed the knife at her head. Rick and Angelica sighed and thought these villains were boring. In a blink, the guy groaned and left, gushing with his blood. The remaining men were alarmed because an attack came from someone else. Before they could find out who it was, they were already bleeding to death. The bald man started sweating from nervousness when he saw Lynette's fast movements. Angelica told them it would be useless to take hostages now, so the others in their organization ran to them to gang them up. Rick easily wiped the first wave with his physical strength. Lynette swung her attack swiftly while Angelica flashed us her cave. I should go scold this girl and make her wear some pants. The clash went on, and in a matter of minutes the village went silent. They managed to get them all, but Angelica thought everything was pacing too fast for her. A cave was in a nearby part of the mountain, and the egghead who managed to get out alive from that clash went to their boss. The boss asked if they got wiped out. The bald man nodded and said there were 3 people there. The man paused for a moment and said with the likes of them, they wouldn't stand a chance against those people. All that remained was to clean things up. Angelica thought their mission would take a few days, but it was finished in a flash. They stopped when a man called them. The man bowed and thanked them for saving their village. He said he was the village's doctor and the village's representative since the chief was getting older. He added that they wanted to thank them in some way. Rick told them it was only their job, but the doctor insisted. He said their village was famous for its hot springs, so he offered them to use it for free. He kept on insisting, so the 3 had decided to accept it. They were escorted to the inn, and when they got there, it was huge and resembled an Eastern Island country's inn. The 3 were excited and started to look forward to the spring and their food. A woman in a kimono greeted them when they got inside. They went inside a large room to change, but before Angelica and Lynette went to the girls' room, she told Rick not to sneak in because she would pull his eyes out. Rick sighed deeply and thought it would be much better if he was only with Lynette. The 2 had changed into their robes and the water was fresh and warm when they went to the spring. A wall was dividing their tub to Rick's, so Angelica called him and asked how he was doing. Rick, having the tub all by by himself wasn't bad at all. Angelica suddenly realized it was her first time talking alone with Lynette. She stumbled, saying some words, and shyly asked if they were friends. Lynette nodded as she looked at her and said that was what she had thought. Angelica flinched a little, and her cheeks turned red, saying she was glad. She said that the Night Order mostly consisted of men and rarely some old women. This was Angelica's first time having a friend her age since she was a kid. She smiled and said that knowing that they were friends made her happy. Lynette smiled and said she was also happy and having fun with her. The two kept talking in a low voice, and Rick was becoming curious about what they were talking about. This made him realize being alone was not that fun. Lynette said this was the first time making a friend. Angelica was surprised and said she wanted to know everything about her. When she noticed something on her skin, she hesitated to ask about it, but dared to ask about the mysterious mark. She reminded her that she didn't have to do it if it was difficult to speak about. Lynette shook her head and said she would like Angelica to know about it, but her sentence was cut off when a loud noise occurred. They were alarmed by their tormenting aura, so Rick told them to look over the forest. The two hopped out of the water and saw an explosion in the forest. They knew it was from a large-sized monster, and its danger rating would be at least 20. Rick sighed as he climbed on the wall nakedly. He said he sometimes didn't have time to put on clothes like this. Angelica was shocked to see him, and told him to get a towel around him. Rick didn't hear her, so Lynette and Angelica followed him with towels wrapped around their bodies. Angelica handed the towel to Rick. They looked around and saw no monster, so they decided to follow the track. When they came to an end, they were in front of a huge opening in the mountains, surprised to see a monster's nest. Angelica found this place strange, because she couldn't feel any mana from this large nest. The three went in with a torch in Rick's hand. As they were walking down the cave, they halted when they noticed a barrier. They knew it wasn't from a monster, but a human, and something was hiding behind it. Rick tried to dispel it, but he had a little hard time, so they knew humans were quite powerful. When the barrier was shattered, Lynette's eyes widened when she felt the painful mana. Rick and Angelica became worried when she dropped to her knees. When Rick saw her in pain, he realized dragons were inside. Two colossal dragons were growling at them. Angelica was shocked and asked what was happening with Lynette. The dragon slammed its feet, but the three managed to dodge. Rick told Angelica not to fall behind as they had to leave at full speed. In the blink of an eye, Angelica was shocked to see him already outside the cave. When they managed to get out, they returned to the village, bringing Lynette to the hospital. The doctor told them Lynette's life wasn't in danger. Angelica looked at Rick, waiting for an explanation, so he told her Lynette had deep trauma with the dragons, and that he didn't know the details about it. The doctor said an elf's body has a stronger connection with magic than other races, so those two dragons' mana ran amok and caused Lynette to faint. When Lynette opened her eyes upon hearing their voices, the two rushed to her, asking if she was all right. Angelica was relieved because a superhuman like her also has a weakness. Lynette rose up, looking at their faces. When she asked who they were dumbfounded. Rick felt like cold water was dumped into his body. Lynette was still looking at them confusedly, and the two monkeys gasped upon realizing she might have amnesia. Rick stuttered as he asked if she was joking, but Angelica told him Lynette would never make a joke like that. Lynette moved back a little, confused as to how the two knew her name. She asked where her parents and Anne were. She knew her name, but they wondered who Anne was. The doctor was observing her, and said it seemed to be a result of the disturbed mana that her memories had reverted back to when she was a child. He added that these are her memories before her trauma, a brain's natural defense system. Angelica couldn't believe Lynette's trauma was this serious, so she asked if there was a way to treat her. The doctor said yes, and that she had to take some medicine and some rest. Angelica told him to treat Lynette as best he could, but Rick stopped her. Angelica got confused about why he stopped them, but he told them Lynette had just woken up and left her alone as if this would be too much for her to handle as a kid. Angelica nodded and said being confused as a kid would make her uncomfortable. She looked at Lynette, sat on the bed's edge, and introduced herself. Angelica told her that her parents and Anne had gone out to shop. She pointed at Rick and said this middle-aged man was Rick. He felt insulted to call him like that in front of a young Lynette. She seemed to be responding now, so Angelica asked how old she was, and Lynette told her she was 7. The two kept talking, making Rick smile and think of them as siblings. He asked the doctor if having those dragons roamed around was fine, if a human was controlling them. Rick knew those monsters wouldn't go on a rampage, but he had to keep a watch out. The doctor asked if that person was also the one who set up their nest. Rick nodded, but he flinched when Lynette called him a mister. She flashed her genuine smile and told him to come with them outside to play in the snow. Rick felt sharp pains in his heart after being called mister by Lynette. Angelica chuckled and said, "That's right, mister. Let's go." Rick told her to stop and said he might need a doctor. Lynette called him a mister again and suddenly noticed she had big melons. Rick spat out blood and instantly knew Lynette would be attacking his mind in ways he had never imagined. When they changed their clothes, they went to an open area to play their game. Angelica told her they would play a snowball fight, so she allowed Lynette to take the first throw as hard as she could. Lynette rolled the snow into a ball and threw it at her, but it missed. The sharp throw caught her off guard and even sliced a tree behind Angelica in half. Angelica felt a tingling pain on her cheeks and realized her fighting power was still intact. That snowball would almost be painted red if it landed on her. Lynette gasped in shock and asked why she was bleeding, but Angelica was surprised to see her shocked to see something like blood when knowing she had injured many. She chuckled and directed the conversation to make a snowman instead. She told her that Mr. Rick was a strong man who could build the biggest snowman in the world. Our bro was stabbed multiple times. He wondered if the original Lynette also viewed him as an old man. Angelica felt horrible to see Rick so down, so she chuckled awkwardly and told Lynette to call Rick by his name. Lynette was so confused and hesitated to call him by his name that they realized this would be impossible. After a few minutes of molding the snow, Rick placed the head of the snowman, or the gigantic snowman. Lynette was so happy to see the large snowman. She was jumping and so excited like a kid. The two smiled as this was their first time to see her having so much fun, making them also wonder what she went through for her to change so much. After that, there was a moment of silence. But when Lynette told them she was hungry, the three headed back to a nearby restaurant and ordered food. Lynette was so excited and said this was her first time seeing foods like this. This food was famous in that village, so it was their first time tasting it. When Lynette tasted the savory food, she thanked Mr. Rick for letting her eat it. Rick groaned in pain, but Angelica told him to just accept his faith as Mr. Rick. He remembered the original Lynette hoping to taste this food, and they were glad that she could eat it like this. When they were finished eating, they walked back to the hospital. Midway, Lynette kept yawning, tired after eating. Lynette rubbed her eyes and asked Mr. Rick to carry her back to the hospital, but Rick was flustered and said carrying her in a yukata would be bad in various ways. When they arrived at the clinic, the doctor welcomed them and introduced them to his wife and daughter. Rick greeted them, so the doctor called his daughter Ari to greet them. Ari said hello, so Angelica lowered his body, greeted her, and asked her age. Ari showed her 5 fingers, so Angelica commended her for greeting them like that. She told her they would play with her. When they left, Rick talked to the doctor to get things ready, but suddenly, Rick wondered if it was best to turn Lynette to her original self, since the current Lynette seemed so happy that he couldn't even imagine her making all of those expressions. The doctor looked at him and asked what Lynette would usually answer. Rick paused momentarily, trying to think if she wanted those memories back. After a few minutes, he went back to check on her as she cozied up on a bed. She looked at him with her tired eyes and asked if they could meet again. Rick smiled and told her he would always be there. When she slept, she dreamt about her 7th birthday with her family. Speaking of her childhood, Lynette was a jolly and happy kid. That day, when they were planning to prepare their dinner, her dad came home. Their family has a helper, and she follows her around when it's time to cook. That night, the family ate together. Lynette gazed at her parents and asked if they were both elves, and why their skin color was different. Her father was glad she finally asked, so he told her the elves were divided into 2 groups. Her mother was a common elf, and her father was a dark elf. Their races were in a bad relationship. Her mother was a noble, and her father was a royal, so marriage would be impossible for them. They lived far from either of those countries, and Lynette cut her off and asked if they eloped. The two were caught off guard by her question, so her father told her she could have a wealthy life in their country as a royal if it weren't for their selfishness. Lynette sat up straight and told them she didn't want to be a royal since living there was fun. Her father smiled at her response. Her mother showed her her ring and said it was their wedding ring, a gem that could only be found in the dark elf country. She was so excited when her mother told her she would give it to her once she got married. Lynette rested his head on her hands and wondered when she would get married. Her father stood up and told her she wouldn't need to get married. Her mother stopped them, but Lynette asked why her mother got married, but her father kept saying no. The next morning, their maid Anne was hanging the washed clothes with Lynette and her mother. Lynette was amazed at how Anne could do many things and said she also wanted to become a maid someday, so she could do anything. She asked Anne to take her as her student, but her mother told her not to bother Anne too much. Her father suddenly called Anne to get some firewood from the cellar, but Lynette ran, telling them she would get the wood since it's her duty as Anne's student. Lynette's mother chuckled and asked Anne to let her daughter do it until she was satisfied. When Lynette went down to the cellar, she looked around to search for the woods. She picked up the wood and stacked it on her arms. When satisfied, she started to climb the stairs very carefully and slowly, but she froze when a gush of blazing fire dashed above her. Due to shock, she fell and dropped to the floor. Some rocks and wood were knocked down from the impact. When Lynette regained consciousness, her forehead was bleeding. She sat up and felt pain in her head. She suddenly remembered her parents and Anne. She stood up and climbed up the stairs, but the moment when she got out, their house and the whole village were wiped out. She felt cold and fear and started to sweat. Tears were building up as she hyperventilated. She screamed and called for her parents, but no one answered. Lynette was crying as she looked at their ruined house, but when she saw a burnt hand, she rushed to it, as she thought the person was asking for help. But when she saw the person, it was a corpse. She shrieked when she saw that familiar ring. She stuttered as she called her mom, and when her mom's hand shattered to ashes, the ring dropped to the floor. Lynette didn't know what to do, but she heard someone walking and saying that his power had increased by 23.8% compared to 5 months ago. Lynette went silent as she observed the man in a black coat. She cleared her throat and tried to ask who he was. The man was surprised to see her alive after the fire. He looked behind Lynette and figured she was inside the cellar. He wondered what he needed to add if it didn't reach a mere 3 meters below the ground. He completely ignored her and looked like he was talking to someone else. So Lynette asked if he did this, but the man got confused and wondered if she was talking to him. Lynette repeated the question with a brave tone, so the man processed it for a moment and wondered if she was referring to his experiment. He looked back at her and said it was an experiment. Lynette got confused, so the man sighed and said it was a test fire to see the power of his weapon. She was shocked to see him saying those without remorse after ruining their lives. She screamed at him for killing many, just for that. He thought the kid didn't get what he said, so he told her he was testing his weapon to kill a lot of people. She told him those innocent people didn't do anything wrong to deserve this, but the man was distracted by her appearance and said she was a rare half-high-class elf and half-high-class dark elf. The man thought of taking her and decided to let her be free since she was a rare kind, and lifted his scaly arm, suddenly becoming a roaring dragon. Lynette was shocked and couldn't think straight anymore, but when the dragon rushed to her and bit her side, she gritted her teeth in pain and fell to the ground. She cried from the burning sensation coming out of her skin, and in a blink, a mark of a dragon emerged from her skin. The man's arm returned to normal, while Lynette cried in pain. The guy just casually apologized to her for killing her parents, like he was super evil, but he still kept his manners when talking to someone else. He told her to accept what had happened, and told her to survive for him. He added that he is the top of the Black Curse and goes by the name Dragon Lord. Lynette opened her eyes and looked at his face. The Dragon Lord told her to come and find him when she grew and became stronger despite not knowing her name. I am now hoping this man will get punched by our favorite orc. After a few hours, Lynette heard voices talking about her unique appearance. The people had speculated she was a half-elf, and when they noticed the ring, they were shocked. One man asked where they found the girl, and the other man said she was the sole survivor of that wiped-out village. The man asked for the price of the ring, and the young, confused elf. The man chuckled devilishly and told the kid that she was now his property to help with his business. After a few minutes, Lynette found herself inside a carriage along with two other people. They stopped at a salon, and Lynette was brought there to wash up and put on a weird collar. She was thin and looked so fragile in that dress. She looked straight and asked the man what he was doing. The man didn't like how she talked, so he activated the collar, sending Lynette a painful stimulus. The man smirked and told her to talk more politely to her master. He explained that the collar was a slave magic that could end her life if she went against him. The man said he was Walter and asked for her name. Lynette told him her name and called him sir. Walter nodded and said she was smart. Lynette was told to follow him to her first job. After a few minutes, Lynette was left alone behind a huge door, and all she could hear was people's cheer and screaming. When the door opened, her mouth dropped. When she saw numerous people surrounding her, Lynette asked her master where they were, and Walter told her it was an underground arena that offered entertainment to their wealthy clients. She froze when she heard a growling sound nearby, and when another door opened, piercing eyes flashed before her. The huge wild wolf was so angry and trying to get to her. Walter told her this would be her opponent, and her job was to be executed in a flashy way. He left her there alone, and took the mic to start the match officially. Lynette was so confused and shivering in fear that she could hear Walter introducing her and her opponent. Walter kept his energy up and wondered how a 7-year-old rare elf could survive this match. When the wolf was released, it immediately jumped at her. Lynette couldn't run away that fast, so she was caught and slammed on the floor. The people watching were surprised because the match might end quickly since a 7-year-old was no match for this. The only thing she could do was cry and beg for help. She suddenly remembered the man who placed a mark on her skin. Right before the wolf bit her head, Lynette's mark suddenly lit up, and in the blink of an eye, an explosion occurred, and the impact crushed the monster's internal organs. Everyone gasped in shock from the sudden turn of events. The wolf crashed on the ground, making Walter stutter in disbelief. Lynette immediately stood up, and after seconds of silence, the crowd went crazy. The wolf was defeated. Walter had announced the official result of the match, and after that match, he ran to his slave and said he didn't actually think of her winning this match. He told her she had to keep this on, but Lynette did not respond, so Walter activated the collar. He scolded her and told her to respond to him. Lynette groaned and said yes to him. She still couldn't believe that Mark saved her life. She wondered if she could survive and escape that place if she kept using it. She kept silent, but her thoughts were dark because she kept wondering if she could also kill that man with it. Walter felt the eerie aura from her, so he stuttered when he told her to return to her cell. When she went back, she laid his body and curled her body. She knew she had to get revenge on her parents and Anne for ruining their lives. The poor Lynette cried all night, longing and missing those people with whom she used to laugh. After a week inside that arena, she managed to keep her life safe with the dragon mark again, and figured she had to strengthen his physique, so she worked hard for a month. A year had passed, and she figured she needed a way to attack with her speed, so after 2 years of training, she developed and refined her attacking skills every match. And finally, after 5 years of slavery, she was now 15, and this would be her 10,000th match. She had been in first place for the last 8 years, and Walter was at his limit in finding monsters that could match her power. He reminded her that he had prepared a special opponent for her that day, and was expecting a match worthy of his hard work on capturing this. Lynette nodded, and told her master to leave it to her, but inside her thoughts she was already plotting a plan to escape this arena. When Lynette went inside the arena, Walter commanded his men to reveal the monster. When Lynette saw a gigantic dragon similar to the demon lord's magic mana, her body was trembling in fear when she remembered that feeling. From the throbbing pain, she grunted and crouched down. Walter became nervous about what Lynette was doing. Lynette's body was so scared and wouldn't move because her mana was out of control. She was starting to lose hope of moving and defending herself, so she wondered if this would be her end. Out of the blue, a wall nearby crashed, and when Walter glanced at where it occurred, he saw two shadows. The shorter man sighed and said there was a door, and breaking a wall was unnecessary. It was actually Blowstone and someone. The man figured it was an illegal arena, and that it was the right decision to retrace the steps of the people who caught the dragon. Blowstone told him to get the ringleader, and open the barrier to check on Lynette. Right before she lost consciousness, Blowstone caught her, and removed the slave magic on her, but he could still feel another magic inside her. When he dispelled the magic, the dragon tried to attack them, but the man smacked the stubborn dragon in the face. Blowstone told his friend that they had to bring the girl to their castle for for something. Walter cursed in the air because his plan was ruined. When they were about to head out to surrender Walter to the knights, Lynette woke up and told the orc to put her down. Walter turned around, sweating and cold, and asked if she planned to kill him, but Lynette said no and slashed his little finger. Walter screamed in pain as blood dripped down his hand. Lynette took back the ring. She deserves all the hugs and head pats from all the hardship she went through alone. A few days later, when Blowstone, Lynette, and the other man arrived at the castle, Blowstone was checking up on her poor condition Mana because of the dragon-shaped seal. It was familiar to him, so he advised her to stay with them for a while, until he understood how that mark worked. The man smiled and suggested that Lynette become an adventurer and join their party since she didn't have a place to go. Aulist and Mizet were heard agreeing with it, and that was how Lynette got to this party. Lynette followed them up to the hill nearby, close to the sky, to make a gravesite. Mizet and Aulist volunteered to help her, and after a few minutes, they were done. She stood before the grave and thought it had been 8 years since the incident. She apologized for taking so long. Tears built up when she remembered that day. She took out the ring from her mother, placed it on her tomb, and said she would entrust it to her until she married. Now, let us return to the present. Angelica asked how Lynette was doing, so Rick told her she was sleeping already. She brought up the dragons, so Rick figured they might have to exterminate them before they go on a rampage. They heard screams outside the clinic when they were about to head to Lynette's room. Rick couldn't believe the dragons had already come out. While all of this was happening, Lynette was sleeping in tears. The whole village was in chaos upon seeing the two dragons in the sky. Rick and Angelica went out, but the egghead man saw them and showed the boss the way to the two. The man on the dragon smirked as he felt the difference between the two was on a different level. Rick asked who the weird man was, so Angelica said it was a tamer that could control an S-rank dragon, but it was her first time seeing someone controlling two S-rank dragons. The man greeted them by their full names, which caught them off guard. The man said he knew everybody who could pose a threat to the Black Curse, and added that the Orichalcum Fist was on top of his list. Rick asked who he was, and the man said his name was Mercury, also called the Dragon Lord. Angelica gasped in shock because she knew he was the most wanted criminal in the world, and the boss of the Black Curse. It was said that nobody had ever seen his face but that the most wanted man in the world was now before them. Mercury said they saved him from cleaning those useless men away, but suddenly, his aura changed when he said he wouldn't let them interrupt him. Angelica and Rick immediately raised their guard, but Mercury smirked as he could already tell the two were strong, so he brought his pets. He ordered one of his dragons to fly south and burn down every down it came across. Rick dropped his jaw in disbelief. The Dragon Lord told the dragon to go, so Rick asked Angelica if she would be fine on her own. Angelica looked at Mercury and thought she had to take this challenge on. She told him to leave it to her, so Rick rushed to follow the dragon, so now it's just her and them. She already knew this man was smart for making Rick catch the dragon, because he was way faster and stronger than her. Angelica asked why he set up his base in this village, so Mercury said it was to gather dragons and increase his fighting power. Angelica realized that was the reason why there was a huge cave nearby. Angelica sighed and said since he was the boss of the Black Curse, she had to arrest him and become one of his great achievements as a knight. Mercury chuckled and told her to try to catch him. Meanwhile, Rick was running as fast as he could because the dragon was so fast. At this rate, it will reach the neighboring town soon. When he saw the dragon, he increased his speed and rushed to the dragon. The dragon felt his presence. Its eyes widened and almost popped out from its socket upon realizing how fast this human was. Mercury and his dragon were causing damage to the village in the fight. Angelica tried her best to get an open spot, but the dragon protected its master, so it was hard for her. She screamed when the dragon caught her. Mercury told her that his dragons had become stronger and faster than normal. When Mercury commanded his dragon to crush her, the pressure on her body tightened, making him scream in pain, but in a glimpse, the dragon's hand was sliced. Mercury was caught off guard when his dragon went out of control. Angelica couldn't believe that the person who saved her was Lynette. She had recovered fully and got her memories back. Angelica was so glad to see her back, so Lynette said it was all thanks to her. She looked at her and apologized for making her worry. She asked who this man was, and Angelica said it was the Dragon Lord, the boss of the Black Curse, and a dragon tamer. When Lynette said that this man wasn't the real Dragon Lord, Angelica got confused. She added that the real Dragon Lord's appearance, abilities, and mana were much more different. When Mercury remembered who she was, he told her that someone wanted to meet her. The dragon started growling, so Angelica became worried for her and asked if she was all right. Lynette sighed and said she was still scared, and her mana was still disordered. Compared to before, she was alone, but now she has them. When Mercury said he wasn't given the authority to lay a hand on her, he decided to end the first-class knight instead. Before the dragon could release the blow, Lynette slashed through its flesh. He was able to conquer her trauma because she was more scared of losing a friend. Mercury lost balance and fell off the dragon. He smiled and thought that person was keeping an eye on someone this strong. They suddenly heard Rick coming from the sky with the dragoon in his hand. He crashed the dragon on the floor and hopped off it. He was glad to see Lynette back to herself. So when he looked at the man, Mercury started to say his last words, but he disappeared out of nowhere. Rick looked around and wondered where he went, but Lynette told him it was magic that was used. Rick started to wonder if someone did it, but Angelica told them they had to prioritize the wounded. He asked where the doctor was, and Lynette told him the doctor had already gone looking for injured people. Lynette gazed back to where the fight occurred, and thought someday she would settle things with the Dragon Lord. Inside the cave, Mercury was heard sighing, thanking his lord for saving his life. He apologized apologized for losing the 2 dragons he had gathered for him. But a man in the shadow told him it was okay, because acting as a leader was also a pain. It was the doctor. He asked for his name again, so Mercury reminded him of his name. The doctor apologized for his bad memory. Mercury looked at the shelf beside him and said the appearance of trace magic he used was perfect. The doctor nodded and said the wife and child of the man's body he took seemed to be clueless. He knew that with the personality trace, he couldn't do anything he wanted, so he wondered what he had to improve. The doctor shifted back to his original form and thought it had been 12 years since they met, and he was still waiting for the day Lynette would come to see him. When they went back to the castle, the 3 came with Lynette to the gravesite to offer some flowers. She smiled as she called her loved ones and told them she could make other friends. Angelica knelt and placed the flower. She greeted them and introduced herself. Lynette closed her eyes, containing her anger against that man. She knew this feeling wouldn't go away as long as that man was still alive, but now when she remembers that traumatic day, she is so happy that she wasn't shedding any tears. Rick smiled and kept silent as he watched her. Lynette thanked Angelica for coming. Lynette told them they should return to the castle now. On a mountain, a monster was walking down the road when he heard some human footsteps. He turned and noticed the chilling familiar shadow before him. He started shivering and sweating cold and ran off immediately to save his life. Rick sighed and thought that man should have lived a bit closer to human civilization. The 2 were with another adventurer who was pissed off because he was expecting high-level monsters in this place, but not even a single squirrel was there. He asked if they had been there, so Rick said yes. The man was in disbelief because the rumor of black dragons being there was all just a lie. He asked what their ranks were, so Rick spoke and said he was an E ranker. The man smirked and proudly said a B rank like him should protect them from any monsters. But after a few seconds of walking, his eyes widened in shock. Upon hearing a deep growling, he grabbed the handle of his sword and threatened for the monster to come out. The monster sighed and said he was just about to leave the mountain. The man kept pushing the monster's button, so the monster stomped its feet and asked if he was ready to fight him head on. It was the rumored black dragon in the area. The man almost peed his pants in fear. When the dragon blew air out of its nose, the man started panicking from the massive dragon before him. His legs and voice were trembling, and the last thing they knew was the man running away for his life like a chicken. Rick told him to be careful, because monsters would come out on the way back. The monster suddenly noticed the 2. Rick greeted George, and the monster's face lit up, and he was surprised to see them. He apologized for not realizing they were there, while he made threats to that man. Rick told him it was alright, and that Reinhardt always made George scare off editors. Rick asked Lynette if she was alright with George's mana, so she assured him that George's mana was different, and she was alright. George asked if they had any business with Reinhardt. Rick said yes, so the dragon volunteered to fly them to his place to save time. When they hopped on his back after a few minutes, George stopped and screamed at Reinhardt that he had visitors. Rick knocked on the door calling Reinhardt, and when they heard some footsteps, the door opened. Reinhardt came out as one of the legendary 5. Rick was so excited deep inside, because it had been a while since he saw him in a fan meeting. Reinhardt suddenly dropped to the floor, smashed his head, and offered his deepest apologies, begging to extend the deadline. Rick was dumbfounded to see the author of the Legends of Yamato, whom he admires, looking so pathetic and begging to extend a deadline. He tried to stop him, but when Reinhardt heard a different voice, he lifted his head and realized Rick and Lynette were before him. Rick pulled his hair, because the image he built was crumbling, so he didn't want to meet him. Reinhardt stood up upon realizing they were not his enemies, which were the editors. He made a cool face and told them to come inside, but Rick did not buy it when he had already witnessed his pathetic side. When they got inside, Reinhardt told them to watch their steps, and within a split second, Rick was caught in a trap. He started screaming in pain, but Reinhardt only said it was meant for his editors, who might invade his house. Rick wanted to cry because he had so much respect for him when he first met him at a fan meeting event. Lynette told him Reinhardt was an amazing person as an adventurer, but it was cut off when Reinhardt asked what they came there for. While Jorg found a sleeping spot, Rick told him about the knight who had embedded one of the 6 jewels in his body to strengthen his mana. He asked if he had someone in mind who could do it in this current age, so Reinhardt replied saying it was unthinkable because only the 3 among the legendary 5 knew about the details of the jewels, including Reinhardt. He couldn't imagine those people leaking the info, and someone with capabilities like Mazette could do such, but it would be impossible for this current era to make it possible. He added that it was because only Rosetta, the goddess of magic, could do it, and she perished a long time ago. He couldn't imagine that gloomy misanthrope taking on a disciple, so he figured someone like him from Yamato's era was moving behind the scenes. Reinhardt knew somebody knew the way to the goal, but he still avoided giving hints to the young people because he didn't like an old person meddling in the young people's adventures. He told them that he would look into it, but while he was distracted by his thoughts, a banging on the door was heard, asking Reinhardt for the manuscript. He sighed because his enemy had found him. He went to open a door on the floor and told the 2 to tell the editor that he was already dead. Rick tried to convince him to improve his image, but he said no, so Rick opened the door and told the editor he was trying to run away. Reinhardt cursed him and exclaimed he was not trying to run away, while acting like nothing had happened. When they got back to the castle, their party gathered for a meeting, and Mazette activated the earth mapping. An unknown location emerged from the table, so Rick asked if they knew where it was. Mazette suddenly realized that the familiar map was Elphonia, his hometown. He squinted his eyes and said he didn't remember a jewel being in there. He paused for a moment and wondered if that was one of the 6 jewels. Chapters end at 59. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you loved this manga. Have a good day.